pretending to sleep when his own teammate sneaks up on him. The guy lifts his weapon, ready to take him out. He misses. Bjorn was already moving. He stands up like nothing happened. The guy is shocked. He can't believe he dodged that. Bjorn locks eyes on him. His look says it all. This guy is done for. Our protagonist rushes straight at the guy at full speed. One hit lands, and it sends the guy flying. The guy can barely stand. He just found out the hard way what barbarians are. He tries to beg for mercy, but it's way too late for that. Bjorn smashes him with everything he's got. You see, this guy isn't just some random barbarian. He's actually a gamer who got stuck inside this body. This is a story about a guy who loved games ever since he was a kid. He was always stuck in the hospital, so gaming became his entire world. He took it seriously, always completely focused. But lately, the games were just frustrating. He lost again, yelling at the screen about how stupid the AI was. The thing is, you can get tired of anything if you do it for too long. He was just done with it. One day, he realized that games just weren't fun anymore. It didn't matter what kind he tried to play. The real problem was that every new game that came out each year was complete garbage. They all had the same stories and the same kinds of characters. It felt like every new game was just a copy of the last one. The systems were shallow, with no real challenge. He just wanted to find something original to play. And that's when he found it. A game called Dungeon and Stone. The description said it was a sequel to an old school game that forced players to do everything themselves. It was an indie RPG, a throwback to a much older style of gaming. The graphics were just 2D pixels, and it was only available in English. It didn't really look like his kind of game at all, but it was free, so he figured he might as well try it out. He started it up and was surprised to see a lot of different classes to choose from. He wasn't planning on playing for long, so he just picked one without thinking, the Barbarian. It was an old school kind of game, the kind he hadn't played in a long time. He started exploring the dungeon, slowly figuring out how everything worked. At first, he was just casually playing, thinking the art was nice, but pretty soon, he was completely focused on the screen. He finally looked up at the clock and was shocked. He had no idea it had gotten so late. He was completely obsessed with Dungeon and Stone. He thought the game was the most fun he'd had in years. The game had some weird rules that were either cool or just plain awful. For starters, you were forced to have a computer-controlled teammate with you at all times. And the other big thing was, when you died in the game, you had to start all over from the very beginning. At first, he thought the challenge was fun, but after dying right near the end, he completely lost it and screamed in frustration. Turns out, he was in a hospital room, and a nurse had to rush over and tell him to be quiet. He quickly apologized, feeling a little embarrassed, but a second later, he was right back at it, already mapping out the dungeon in his head to avoid the traps. He was just too stubborn to quit. The game was a total failure, so there were no tutorials or guides online to help him. So he decided he'd just have to beat it on his own, no matter how long it took. His mind was made up. His obsession with the game started all the way back in the hospital, and it followed him through everything, public service, college, and even after he got a regular job. Through all those years, he just kept playing. No matter what, he just kept playing Dungeon and Stone. The game was unbelievably hard. He kept dying over and over, getting more and more frustrated each time. It didn't matter what level he was, or what items he had. The result was always the same. 9 years passed, and after all that time, he finally did it. He'd finally reached the final boss room. There it was, the Gate of the Abyss. He threw his hands up, yelling at the screen. He was probably the only person on Earth who had ever made it this far. He was completely overwhelmed. He'd spent 9 years, his entire 20s, just to get to this one moment. The game asked him if he was ready to enter. There was no hesitation. Of course he was. But then a second message popped up. This one felt different. It warned him that if he went in, he might never come back. He just smirked. He figured the game was just being dramatic because it was the final boss. After everything he'd been through, there was no way he was turning back now. He clicked yes, and the screen started to load. He leaned back, already thinking about his strategy. He knew he probably wouldn't win on the first try. The real goal was to learn the boss's attack patterns and figure out its weaknesses. He laughed to himself, wondering what it would be like to just beat the boss in one go. That's when he noticed the loading was finished, but something felt off. The screen went black. A message appeared. It finally hit him. The 9 years he spent playing. That was just the tutorial. He stared at the screen, completely lost. Tutorial. What was that supposed to mean? Then he shot back from his desk. The text had switched to Korean. He couldn't believe it. He was sure Dungeon and Stone only supported English. He was furious. He'd spent almost a decade working so hard just to understand the English version. Suddenly, a new message flashed on the screen. User check complete. Before he could react, a blinding blue light shot out from his monitors. The light was everywhere, and an intense pain burned through his entire body. He screamed out as another message appeared, announcing the start of the transmission. And just like that, his chair was empty. And then, everything went black. He was out cold. When he came to, the first thing he heard was a loud voice. It was congratulating a group of young warriors. He slowly came to, his head fuzzy. A loud voice was booming somewhere, talking about leaving a sacred place. He couldn't figure out who was being so loud. When he finally opened his eyes, he saw it. A massive crowd of warriors was gathered, and their leader was shouting that they would all become proper warriors today. He was completely stunned. He realized he'd been thrown into an unbelievable situation. He looked around, taking everything in. The place was lit by torches, not light bulbs, and he was surrounded by huge, muscular barbarians. At the front, an old warrior was giving a speech, telling everyone to pick a weapon that fit them. His mind was racing. He'd never heard this language before, so how could he understand it? And more importantly, why was he even here? He forced himself to calm down. Panicking wouldn't solve anything. He started thinking like a gamer. If this was the start of a really hard game, what was the first thing he should do? The answer was obvious. He needed to understand what was going on and get information. He started by checking his own body. It seemed fine at first, but then he looked at his hand and froze. These weren't his hands. They were rough, with thick muscles and strange tattoos he'd never seen before. He looked down and saw a body that was not his. He was a giant, built like a mountain. His mind was screaming. This couldn't be his body. He was still trying to figure out what was happening. But before he could, the old warrior's voice boomed out, calling for the chosen ones to come forward. He watched as another young man, a warrior named Karak, was called forward. Karak stood before the old warrior, who was in charge of the ceremony. He reached out and took hold of a weapon. It was a huge, double-headed axe. The old warrior smiled, praising it as a great choice. He declared Karak an official warrior and then called out the next name, Einar. That's when it clicked. He knew the ceremony. It was the event from the game where young warriors chose their first weapons. He watched as Einar chose a sword and another young man picked up a spear. The old warrior praised them both for their choices. The old warrior finished the ceremony, officially acknowledging all the new young warriors. He gave them a final blessing for the path ahead. Suddenly, an image of a huge city flashed in his mind. His eyes shot open. He knew exactly what this was. It was the title screen for the game he'd been playing, Dungeon and Stone. He remembered the character selection screen. He had picked the Barbarian, and this ceremony was the game's opening scene. This wasn't just a character anymore. He was now the Barbarian he had been playing just moments ago. The reality of it all was crushing. He had no idea how any of this was possible. He couldn't believe it. This just wasn't possible. But then, he heard someone else muttering in fear. Another warrior was staring around, completely terrified, recognizing this place as the game, Dungeon and Stone. The man was shaking, completely losing it as he tried to understand what was happening. Bjorn watched him carefully. The way he was acting, he was different from the other barbarians. And then it hit him. He wasn't the only one who had been pulled into the game. That warrior was another player. But his relief turned to ice when he realized someone had just spoken those thoughts out loud. Suddenly, a huge, older warrior was standing right over them. His eyes were glowing with a dangerous light. He stared down at the new recruits, his voice low and threatening. He demanded to know who it was that just spoke. Bjorn immediately shouted back, denying it was him. He had to act fast to make sure no one suspected a thing. Bjorn was furious. This whole mess was because the other guy couldn't keep his mouth shut. The old warrior's attention shifted. He stared right at the panicking warrior, who could only stammer in fear. The old warrior pointed, his voice like thunder. He knew who had spoken. But the terrified man made a huge mistake. He asked if this place was really Dungeon and Stone. The old warrior started to ask what he meant by that, but he didn't need an answer. He swung his weapon with incredible speed. It was over in an instant. Bjorn could only watch in shock as the other player was just gone. He couldn't believe what he'd just seen. The old warrior stood over the body without a hint of emotion. Bjorn had to force himself to stay calm. He realized that if he showed any kind of reaction, he'd be next. The old warrior addressed the group. He announced that the man he just killed, Orm, had been possessed by an evil spirit. He ordered everyone to forget what the spirit had said. As the warrior announced the ceremony would continue, everything clicked for Bjorn. He finally understood the situation. The first rule was clear. People like him, players from another world, were considered evil spirits here. And the second rule was even simpler. If anyone found out, he would die. The third piece of information was the most important one. That could have easily been his head on the ground. He knew what he had to do. Get through this without anyone finding out who he really was. But there was a small problem. The old warrior called the next person forward, a man named Sarum. Bjorn stood silently in the line, watching. The warrior kept calling out names, one after another. That's when the terrible truth hit him. He didn't know his own name. This was bad. How was he supposed to answer when he was called? He frantically tried to think of a way to find it. Maybe a stat window or something. He knew the chances were low, but he had to try. It was the only idea he had. He came up with a crazy plan. He'd wait for a name to be called, and if no one moved for 2 seconds, he'd just claim it. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. Just then, the old warrior roared out the next name, Jandel's son, Bjorn. The countdown began. 1 second passed. He scanned the crowd. 2 seconds. Nobody moved an inch. The warrior looked over the silent group, his patience wearing thin. The time was up. That was his cue. He took a step forward. He decided right then and there. That was his name now, or at least he really hoped it was. He walked forward, stopping right in front of the old warrior. The old man's eyes seemed to glow as he stared down at him. Bjorn didn't flinch. He'd made his decision, and there was no turning back. After a long moment, the old warrior finally spoke, calling him young warrior. Then his voice boomed across the area. He told Bjorn to pick his weapon, shouting that he'd hit the jackpot. It worked. The gamble paid off. The name echoed in his mind. Jandel's son, Bjorn. A grin spread across his face. He'd survived the first test. That was his name now, but the relief didn't last long. He knew he had another huge decision to make right away. He thought about the Barbarian class. They had no magic, but their physical strength was incredible. Back when he was just playing the game, his plan was to make a character that did a ton of damage. But this wasn't a game anymore. He stepped forward, his mind made up. He knew exactly what he needed to survive. The old warrior watched him, a questioning look on his face. Instead of a weapon for attacking, Bjorn picked up a shield. For his situation, he knew it was the best possible decision he could make. The old warrior's voice boomed, announcing that Bjorn, son of Jandel, had now officially become a warrior. Suddenly, a message appeared in his mind. The synchronization was complete. For a second, he saw an image of the empty desk where he used to play. The system confirmed his character information had been recorded. His new item level was 24. He was only level 1. But his stats were already solid. With his new gear, his overall combat power got a nice starting boost. He thought back to his time playing the game, specifically about the Barbarian class. When he first started, he picked a greatsword. He didn't have a strategy. He just thought it looked cool. The only problem was, that choice got him killed. A lot. He kept dying over and over again, getting more and more frustrated. He knew he had to figure out a better way to build his character if he wanted to survive. So he tried everything else. Dual axes, giant hammers, flails. But no matter what weapon he used, every fight was a close call. He was always barely surviving, and his strategy just wasn't reliable. And then, one day, an idea hit him. He'd been so focused on attacking, but barbarians had naturally high health and strength. He started to wonder, why did he have to play as a damage dealer at all? He knew that while a barbarian wasn't the best tank like a dwarf, the class still had the right stats for it. He didn't love the idea, since this fighting style needed a lot of training, but he figured it would be a shame to waste all his research. So he decided to give it a go. The results were immediate. He stood his ground against a huge monster, shield up, ready to take whatever it could throw at him. He was stunned. He'd actually cleared it. The combat log showed exactly what happened. The monster's attack just bounced off his shield and hit it back. He realized this build wasn't just good. It was completely broken. He smirked. This was the most logical choice he could make right now, and he knew he wouldn't regret it. A booming voice gave the order to open the gates. Huge chains groaned as they lifted, revealing a dark fortress. The new warriors could only stare up at it. The old warrior's voice echoed, explaining that every barbarian who passed the ceremony now had to enter the labyrinth. He told them they were being sent to a city that contained one of these labyrinths. He announced the name of the city was Rafdonia. With that, he ordered the warriors to depart. He roared that their fate would be decided in that place. And with that, the entire group charged forward, a massive wave of warriors heading for the gate. Bjorn ran with them, but his mind was working. For now, his plan was simple. Just follow the crowd. As Bjorn ran, a thought crossed his mind. Did any of these people actually know where they were going? Suddenly, a voice roared for everyone to stop. The entire group of warriors skidded to a halt. One of the warriors yelled out what everyone was starting to fear. He thought they were lost. He pointed at their leader, a man named Karak, and accused him of leading them in the wrong direction. He shouted that Karak wasn't fit to lead and had to take responsibility. Bjorn just watched, thinking they were all idiots for following him blindly anyway. Karak couldn't argue. He admitted he wasn't qualified and agreed to step down as the leader. That's when a blonde warrior woman stepped forward. She announced that she would be the one to lead them now. The others immediately started cheering for her. They shouted that Einar was wise and would lead them down the right path. Bjorn just stared at her. A moment later, Einar turned to him and quietly admitted she was lost too. Einar stared at him, completely shocked. His confession hit her hard. The other warriors started freaking out. They knew they were running out of time to get to the labyrinth. Immediately, the group turned on Einar. They started shouting that she wasn't fit to lead and began arguing over who should take her place. Bjorn watched the chaos unfold, thinking they were all acting like idiots. If this kept up, they'd never make it. He knew he could solve this, but he didn't want to draw any attention to himself just yet. But he knew he had to do something. He walked up to Einar and got her attention. Einar looked up at him, expecting the worst. She asked if he was just there to blame her, like everyone else. Bjorn shook his head. He told her he wasn't there to blame her. He was there to tell her how to get to the labyrinth. He put a finger to his lips, signaling for her to keep it quiet. This information was just for her. Einar was stunned. She couldn't believe he actually knew the way and asked him how it was possible. Bjorn just pointed down the street at a group of fully armed adventurers. He told her all they had to do was follow those guys. Turns out, the adventurers were complaining about all the barbarians nearby, calling them foolish savages. They were sure a bunch of brutes wouldn't be able to get anywhere this late at night. The plan clicked for Einar. Her eyes went wide as she realized what he meant, and she agreed to give it a try. She immediately ran back to the group and announced that she'd found the way to the labyrinth. The other barbarians erupted in cheers, calling her wise. Bjorn just watched as someone wondered if barbarians were really as brainless as everyone said. With Einar shouting for everyone to follow her, the whole group of barbarians charged through the city, and there it was, a massive, crackling portal of purple energy. energy. It was the entrance to the labyrinth. The warriors stared in awe, calling it the sacred dimension of battle. For Bjorn, seeing it with his own eyes made everything feel terrifyingly real. But standing before the portal, a wave of doubt hit Bjorn. Was going in really the right choice? He figured he could probably just leave right now. With everyone celebrating, no one would even notice he was gone. The thing is, back in his old life, he'd been sick. He spent most of his time in a hospital bed. He was just a normal person who'd never even punched anyone. How was he supposed to fight actual monsters and win? He wondered if there was any other way to pay the city's tax. That stupid tax was the whole reason he was in this mess. He remembered it from the game. It was one of the most brutal systems. Every citizen had to pay, and if you couldn't, you were killed. There were a few ways to get the money. The most common was to go into the labyrinth and hunt monsters. The other option was to get a normal job, like working in a village bar. The problem was simple. He was a barbarian, and in this world, nobody hired barbarians for regular work. They were seen as nothing more than destructive savages. He realized it was a built-in part of the game. Barbarians were the only class that got a weapon right away because they had no other way to survive. He was being pushed into fighting monsters, and he was running out of time. The entrance was about to close, but that wasn't even the biggest problem. Turns out, the labyrinth only opened once a month. If he didn't go in now, he'd have to somehow survive for a whole month. With no job and only the food he was given, he'd be in serious trouble after just a week. He knew that even if he managed to survive, he'd be in the worst possible shape for the next opening. The smart move was to go in now, but his feet were frozen to the ground. He was completely frozen. This wasn't a game anymore. His life was actually on the line. Suddenly, a hand landed on his shoulder. A voice called out his name, Bjorn, son of Jandel. He turned to see a woman, another barbarian. She introduced herself as Einar. She quickly corrected herself, saying she was the second daughter, not the third. She explained that all the other warriors had already gone in. They were the last ones left and had to hurry. She was right. The portal was already getting smaller. A warning stated they only had 5 minutes left before it closed for good. Bjorn told her to go in first and that he'd be right behind her. She simply nodded and ran for it. Right before she stepped through, she turned back and thanked him for his help. He just brushed it off, telling her there was no need for thanks. Then Einar asked him a question that put him on edge. She wanted to know how to become wise like him, admitting she'd never seen a barbarian so clever. Bjorn knew the real answer. For a barbarian to be like him, she'd have to be completely reborn. But he couldn't say that. He just gave her a vague piece of advice. Always think before you act. She seemed to accept it. Einar smiled, thanking him for the advice. She promised to repay him for his help if she made it back from the labyrinth alive. That phrase stuck with him. In the game, he knew barbarians were supposed to be fearless, but she didn't sound fearless at all. So he looked right at her and asked a direct question. Was she also afraid of dying? She didn't answer right away. Then she looked at him and simply asked if being afraid wasn't natural. Einar admitted she was afraid of dying, but she explained that she was born a warrior, and that was her reality. She told him that if she didn't fight, she would die for sure. She looked at him and asked if it was the same for him. He agreed with her. It hit him that all the other warriors were in the same boat. They had no choice but to fight. If they didn't kill monsters, they wouldn't be able to survive in the city. It was that simple. Einar clenched her fist, full of new energy. She said they should try to survive and meet again. She thought barbarians were amazing for learning how to overcome their fear. Her words hit him. He gripped his shield, feeling a strange sense of pride. He too was a barbarian. Just then, a voice boomed out. There was only 1 minute left until the labyrinth closed. He could feel the sweat on his face. He was scared, but there was no turning back now. The portal to the labyrinth began to close. With no time left, Bjorn was sucked right in. As he fell, he thought about his two biggest advantages. He had the powerful body of a barbarian, but he also had the knowledge from playing this game for years. He was absolutely sure he was going to make it through this. A system window popped up. He had officially entered the level 1 crystal cave. The world around him was pitch black. He couldn't see a thing. Something was wrong. This wasn't the crystal cave he knew from the game. He had no idea where he was. He knew he had an edge because he was an expert at this game, Dungeon and Stone. And that expertise led him to a simple conclusion. If he could just combine the tough body of a barbarian with all his knowledge from the game, he was sure he could survive. At least that's what he thought before all this started. But now, he was completely blind. He couldn't see a thing in the dark. He wasn't like the other barbarians, who would just charge in without thinking. He had to rely on his knowledge of the game's design. He remembered that on level 1, the walls were supposed to be covered in glowing crystals. You didn't even need a torch. Then, a terrible thought hit him. He might be in the darkness region. It was a super rare area on the very edge of the first level, a place with absolutely no light. But that didn't make sense. In the game, you never started here. Then he remembered this wasn't the game anymore. This was real, and the starting points were random. Anything could happen. He decided to check his status window to get some information. He tried to pull up his equipment, his inventory, his skills, anything. Nothing worked. None of the systems were responding like they should. Standing around wasn't going to help. He had to pick a direction and start moving. He moved carefully through the darkness, using his shield to feel his way forward. He worried he was going too slow, but decided it was better to be cautious. That's when he felt a sharp, sudden pain in his leg. He bit back a scream, his eyes wide with shock. Looking down, he saw it. A goblin trap had snapped shut on his ankle. The metal teeth dug deep into his leg. The system confirmed it. He had walked right into a goblin trap. The pain was almost unbearable. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to calm down. He knew he couldn't make a sound. If he did, whatever set this trap would be on him in an instant. He knew exactly what this was. Goblins were the ones who used traps on level 1. That meant the creature that said it had to be somewhere close, watching. He stayed completely still, listening for any sound in the darkness. A small part of him wondered if maybe, just maybe, the goblin wasn't around. Maybe he was lucky. Maybe it had just wandered off for a bit. But he immediately pushed that thought away. Hope was dangerous in a place like this. He had to assume the worst possible situation was the real one, and his logic was simple. Where there's a trap, there's a goblin. If it heard him scream, it would spot him immediately, helpless and caught. The creature wouldn't attack right away. It would just wait in the dark, watching him slowly lose his strength. Bjorn knew he couldn't make a sound. That's just how this world worked. He decided to deal with the problem himself, right now. He realized the trap was laced with a paralyzing poison. He cursed his bad luck. If he'd had proper boots instead of these useless sandals, this never would have happened. But he quickly got angry with himself. Complaining was pointless. He had to get moving. He figured if a fight was coming anyway, it was better to get it over with fast. So he stood up, challenging whatever was hiding in the dark to show itself. He could already feel the poison spreading. His right foot was going completely numb. He called out, telling the creature he knew it was hiding. Strangely, the poison was also numbing his fear, which he figured was probably a good thing. But the silence was getting to him. He finally lost his patience and screamed, demanding the creature come out and fight. A thought crossed his mind. What if he was just being paranoid? Maybe there wasn't a goblin here at all. But even if he was making a fool of himself, he decided to try a different tactic. He told the creature to stay hidden, claiming he was just going to leave. He didn't care about looking stupid. He just wanted to survive. So he started taunting it, using the oldest trick in the book. He insulted its mother. Then he insulted its father and siblings. The blood loss was getting bad, making his head feel fuzzy. He kept rambling, calling the creature itself a goblin. And that's when it finally appeared. A massive goblin stepped out of the darkness, towering over him. He heard the heavy footsteps. His bluff had worked. The taunts worked. The creature in the dark finally moved. A smirk spread across his face. The insults had hit their mark. He could hear the footsteps behind him, which meant the goblin was getting closer. The problem was, he still couldn't see it. Knowing it was there wasn't enough. He decided to pick up the pace and start running. He took off, leaving a trail of blood from his injured foot. And right behind him, the goblin gave chase. The creature followed him through the dark, keeping its distance. He stopped to catch his breath and realized the goblin had stopped too. It was just watching him, maintaining a perfect distance. That's when it hit him. The goblin wasn't just chasing him. It was enjoying this, waiting for him to bleed out and collapse from fear. It was playing with its food. The goblin was way smarter than he expected. His current plan wasn't going to work. He had to try something else. So he put his new plan into action. He pretended to stumble, then collapsed to the ground. He lay perfectly still, making it look like he'd finally passed out from the pain and blood loss. He lay there, baiting the creature in his mind, hoping it would think it had finally won. But the goblin just watched from the darkness. It was cautious, not falling for the trap just yet. He silently urged it to come closer, but the creature just stared back, looking confused. Then, the goblin did something he never expected. It picked up a small rock and threw it right at his back. He couldn't believe it. The goblin was testing him, checking to see if he was actually dead. This thing was incredibly smart. He had to admit, this thing was smart. Maybe even smarter than most barbarians he knew. He just had to wait for it to make a move. And then, he heard it. The goblin was finally coming closer. The creature crept forward, thinking it had won. It raised its weapon, ready to finish the job. But just as its hand reached for him, Bjorn's eyes shot open. The goblin froze, realizing its mistake. He lunged forward with a twisted grin. The trap was sprung. The creature shrieked, knowing it was too late. Bjorn didn't hesitate. He swung his fist with everything he had, but he misjudged the distance. His fist missed, his reach just a little too short. He missed, but then something strange happened. His hand started glowing with a red energy. He had no idea what was going on. It wasn't him. His body was moving on its own. His arm shot out and grabbed onto something in the dark. He yanked the goblin right off its feet, pulling it straight towards him. Suddenly, he could feel everything. He knew exactly where the goblin was, and a surge of strength filled him. This wasn't the weak, sick body he'd had his whole life. He roared, telling the goblin that the roles were reversed. The goblin was the prey now. He was finally realizing the true power of a barbarian's body. He didn't stop. He just kept smashing his fist down again and again until the goblin stopped moving. He just kept punching, breathing hard with every single hit. He didn't let up for a second. He just kept hitting it over and over. Finally, he stopped. He looked down at what he'd done, his face grim. One last hit, and it was completely over. The goblin lay motionless. A message appeared, confirming he'd defeated it and gained 1 experience point. But then, something weird started to happen. The goblin's body began to glow and turn into dust. He stared in disbelief, realizing the corpse was just disappearing right in front of him. He scoffed at himself. He was acting like this was still just a game. Where the goblin's body had been, a small red crystal was left behind. He picked it up. He knew exactly what it was. The currency from Dungeon and Stone. It was a grade 9 magic crystal, the lowest possible rank. Its value was equal to a single piece of bread. A small, bitter laugh escaped him. He had just fought for his life, and this was all he had to show for it. He leaned against the wall, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. This place, it was a world filled with labyrinths and monsters. When they died, they left items behind and just disappeared. And outside, in the city, were the same buildings and different races he recognized. There was no doubt about it. This was the world from the game he knew. He swore to himself he would never make the mistake of thinking this was just a game. The pain was real. With that thought, he pushed himself forward, deeper into the darkness. A system message popped up, a cold reminder of his problem. The message wouldn't go away. He was losing a lot of blood. Bjorn was on the ground, dragging himself forward through the dark. He was furious. He knew he was bleeding, but he refused to let it stop him. Crawling like this was humiliating, but it was working. It didn't hurt as much, and he was actually moving faster. But the biggest advantage was that being this low to the ground meant he wouldn't step on any more traps. And just like that, he spotted another one right in front of him. Crawling was starting to hurt the rest of his body, but he knew he could handle it if it meant surviving. The system, however, kept reminding him that time was running out. The system messages just kept repeating themselves. The bleeding wasn't stopping. He knew this was bad. He had to find someone, anyone, who could help him. His only plan was to keep moving in one direction. He figured if he just kept going, he'd eventually get out of the dark. As he crawled, his mind drifted to the other guy he'd seen earlier. He wondered if the man had died for real, or if he just woke up back in his original body. In moments like this, he was starting to understand why people turned to religion. The system warnings became more urgent, flashing over and over. Then, a new message appeared. His vitality had dropped below 5%. It was a final warning. If he didn't get treatment soon, he was going to die. The thought was familiar. It was just like his old life, always on the edge of breaking down. He just kept dragging himself forward, leaving a long trail of blood behind him in the dark. He was breathing hard, but then he saw a faint light up ahead. He knew the whole floor couldn't be dark. All he had to do was get to that light. For a second, he thought maybe he could find someone to help him, but he immediately knew that was a joke. That's when he started seeing things. An image of himself, healthy and strong, appeared right in front of him. The illusion mocked him, asking why anyone would ever help a dying barbarian. He wasn't beautiful or smart, just a brute. He knew he was losing his mind, but the illusion was right. He had to do something, anything, besides just lying there. He finally admitted it to himself. He was hallucinating. He figured he'd run into a monster long before he found a person. His mind was starting to break apart from the pain, his thoughts getting blurry and confused. He knew he was going crazy from the blood loss, but he had to survive. That other voice in his head just laughed, asking how he could possibly make it. He was so desperate he started begging for anyone to find him. The voice told him to just give up, that it would be easier to just die. But even as he lay there, completely broken, he refused. He screamed back in his mind that he would never give up. And then he saw it, a light. A system window popped up with a warning. He had less than 4% of his life left. He was literally moments from dying. He let out one last desperate plea, and someone answered. A group of adventurers stood in the light, looking down. One of them pointed down, telling his leader, Drouse, that there was a dying barbarian on the ground. The man just looked surprised. The system's warnings kept flashing. His life dropped below 4%, then below 2%. But then, a strange message appeared. He'd unlocked an achievement for being so close to death, and his mental stat was actually increasing. The man in armor, Drouse, looked down and noted that he was just a novice. Inside his head, Bjorn was screaming. If they knew he was a beginner, why weren't they helping him? Another member of the group immediately found the situation suspicious. They wondered how a complete beginner could have possibly gotten this deep into the labyrinth faster than their experienced party. Bjorn tried to call out for help, but his body was failing him. He couldn't even talk. All that came out was a low growl, but his eyes were filled with a desperate fire. He silently begged them to stop staring and just do something, but the man just kept looking down, unmoving. Then, a small, cold smile spread across his face. These people weren't here to save him. The man in armor, Drouse, turned to the priestess in their group and asked if she could treat Bjorn. Hearing this, Bjorn's mind raced. A priestess? That meant he might actually be saved. His hope surged. A party with a priestess had to be strong, but just as he thought he was safe, the woman, Ursina, shut him down completely. She refused. Drouse didn't seem surprised at all. He just gave a small, knowing smile. He turned to another man in the group, Patsran, and asked for a potion instead. He promised to pay him back later, even though Patsran pointed out they were for emergencies. Patsran handed over a vial filled with red liquid. Drouse knelt down and warned Bjorn that this kind of healing would hurt. Bjorn didn't care. He just needed him to get on with it. Without another word, he poured the potion directly onto the wounds. A message from the system popped up. His vitality was quickly recovering. He could feel the change instantly. But this wasn't healing. It was pure agony. He screamed. The pain was unbelievable, tearing through his entire body. It felt like he was melting from the inside out. He finally understood why you couldn't use these potions during a fight. The pain from the potion was worse than any injury. The empty bottle lay on the ground. He just lay there, trying to catch his breath. Slowly, the pain started to fade, and he pushed himself up. He let out a shaky breath. For a moment, he really thought that was the end. Suddenly, a voice cut through the darkness. It wanted to know how a novice managed to get here before them. Bjorn looked up. A man in shining armor was standing over him, a smug grin on his face. The knight offered to buy any information Bjorn had on a secret passage. So that was it. They weren't helping him out of kindness. He knew he had to be careful. He told them he didn't know anything. As soon as he'd stepped into the labyrinth, he was just here. The knight actually seemed to believe him. He said he'd read about something like this, a dimensional instability that could teleport people, but he added that it was so rare it only happened once every 100 years. Bjorn was stunned. Once every 100 years? He glanced at the others in the group. They had a mage and a priestess with them. This meant they were at least a mid to high-level party. And somehow, on his very first trip, he'd managed to experience it. He couldn't believe it. He'd stumbled into an once-in-a-century event on his very first day. The knight just smirked, thanking him for that interesting story. It was clear he was done talking. He told Bjorn he could leave and not to worry about the cost of the potion. Bjorn watched him, understanding perfectly. In the labyrinth, time was more valuable than gold. He watched them walk away. He knew it was a miracle they'd even stopped for him at all. He told himself he should just be happy he survived, but he couldn't shake the feeling. Being looked down on like that, it felt disgusting. And just like that, they were gone, continuing on their own path. The blonde knight, Draus, commented that the barbarian was really lucky, but the other warrior, Patsran, disagreed, saying Bjorn would have died from any simple trap. Draus just clarified that he meant Bjorn was lucky to have met them. The female archer with them jumped in, telling Patsran that Bjorn was lucky he met Draus, not him. She called him out for being too cheap to use a potion. Patsran just scoffed and tried to get the priestess to agree with him. The priestess, Ursina, didn't say a word. She just stared ahead with a cold expression. The archer got angry, defending the priestess. She claimed Ursina would have healed Bjorn herself if it weren't for the temple's strict rules. Patsran wasn't convinced, muttering that he'd met plenty of two-faced people. She told Patsran he should learn from Draus's example. She explained that asking about a secret passage was a clever way to offer help without hurting a barbarian's pride. Draus just gave a humble smile, telling them they were being too kind. As they kept walking, Patsran noticed the trail of blood Bjorn was leaving. He wondered aloud when it was going to stop. He figured that, judging by the barbarian's stubborn attitude, maybe he wasn't so lucky after all. He was pretty sure the trail had to end somewhere nearby. Draus pointed ahead, telling everyone that the shortcut was this way. It was a relief to have someone who actually knew the path. The archer was amazed, telling Ursina how incredible it was that Draus had the entire first floor memorized. But the priestess just gave a cold, simple reply. Draus seemed to notice something, his expression turning serious. They reached a huge, empty stone area. Patsran looked around, relieved that they were the first ones to make it. Draus stepped forward and placed his hand on the cold stone slab. Suddenly, the slab lit up, and a swirling blue portal appeared right in front of him. He turned back to the others with a grin. He announced that this was their ride to the second floor, and told them it was time to move. Without hesitating, the archer started walking toward the glowing portal. Just as they were about to step through the portal, Archer suddenly told everyone to wait. She pointed to the ground. There was a brutal bear trap, and next to it, a single sandal. She realized it belonged to the barbarian they'd seen earlier. Draus looked down and agreed with her. Then he raised his hand, and a bright light began to glow from his palm. The light shot down the long, dark passage, revealing a trail of blood that stretched far into the darkness. The entire group just stared, completely stunned by what they were seeing. Patsran turned to Draus, his face serious. He asked how far it was to the spot where they first found the barbarian, guessing it was about 15 kilometers without the shortcut. A strange smile spread across Draus's face. He let out a dark laugh, realizing the barbarian had crawled that entire distance in the pitch black. He called him a monster for pulling it off. The archer looked horrified, whispering that the barbarian must be completely insane. She tried to get Patsran's attention, but he just kept staring into the darkness. Patsran wondered if he would have had the strength to crawl for hours like that, with no guarantee of being found. Then, something clicked. He told the others he just remembered the barbarian was holding out his right hand when they found him. He was showing them the magic crystal. Even after crawling all that way, he hadn't forgotten the one item he had to trade. Patsran realized it was because he had nothing else to offer. He admitted he was wrong about him. He then asked Draus for the barbarian's name. Draus scoffed at the idea that he was just lucky, or that people like that die early. He knew that kind of lunatic determination was special. He believed that no matter how much pain they face, people like that will always find a way to survive. They don't just fight. They tear through their enemies with pure, raw force. Draus knew that for people like that, death is never an escape route. The system confirmed his kill. After nearly dying, he was thrown right back into the fight. The system just kept confirming his kills, one after another. He was smashing through goblins left and right. They just kept coming. He just powered through them with his shield and raw strength. The kill notifications kept popping up. He admitted he was nervous at first, but now that he could see properly, the goblins were no threat at all. It wasn't just the monsters. The traps were a joke, too. They were just left out in the open, not even covered with dirt. Even their ambushes were pathetic. He could see their hiding places from a mile away. He didn't let a single one escape, hunting down any that tried to run. He had cleared out all the enemies. But there was one big problem. He was starving. He remembered the food the deputy chief had given him, but when he pulled out the pouch, his heart sank. He started to wonder if crawling all that way had been a huge mistake. Out of a week's worth of food, 5 days worth was already gone. He knew he had to make what was left last as long as possible. He popped a piece of the dry bread into his mouth. To someone this hungry, even something so simple tasted incredibly sweet. After eating, a new problem hit him. He was getting thirsty, but this was a dungeon. Where was he supposed to find water? It was always one thing after another. He remembered the game. Dungeon in Stone had a hunger system. It only kicked in when you were in the labyrinth. Back then, he never bothered carrying water because food was enough. But this wasn't a game anymore. The game was already known for being incredibly hard. Now that it was real, the difficulty was on a whole different level. He had had to stop thinking of it as the game he knew. This was a real place, with real rules. He started looking around carefully. Then he realized something. The deputy chief hadn't given him any water, which could only mean one thing. There had to be a water source somewhere in the labyrinth. And just like that, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of running water. He followed the sound and found a stream. But he wasn't alone. Another person was already there. The man turned and gave Bjorn a cold look. This was the first time he'd run into someone else since that party with the blonde girl. But they didn't speak to each other. Not a single word. The man just filled up his water and walked away. He realized there was an unwritten rule down here. You don't talk to other adventurers unless you absolutely have to. With the water situation handled, he sat down to count the magic crystals he'd gathered. He had 44 so far. It was a good haul. He was beaten up and covered in blood, but he had something to show for it. He'd managed to survive, which was great, but that just led to another problem. After hunting all those goblins, he was completely exhausted. He was so tired, he could barely keep his eyes open. He knew there were only two ways to sleep in the labyrinth. The first was to just lie down and pray nothing finds you. The second option was to find allies who could watch your back. So he walked up to a group of adventurers and offered to team up. The adventurers were completely terrified by his sudden appearance. One of them nervously started to apologize. He quickly explained that their party was already full and they didn't have room for anyone else. The others agreed. They weren't interested in having a barbarian on their team, especially one covered in blood. He stood there silently as they walked away, leaving him completely alone again. He couldn't believe it. Every single person had rejected him. He was furious. These guys were unbelievable. All he wanted was to find someone to watch his back for one night. That's when a voice called out from the darkness. The man started to ask him a question. He asked if Bjorn was looking for an overnight companion. Bjorn stared at him, completely suspicious. He had no idea who this guy was. The man just smiled, pretending to be disappointed. He said he'd hoped to get some sleep next to a reliable-looking barbarian, but figured he was mistaken. Bjorn finally understood what the man was asking. He wished he'd just been more direct. So he confirmed it. He was looking for an overnight companion. In the game, the official term was a night companion. The man was relieved and introduced himself as Hans. He admitted he thought it just meant an ally, but hearing it said out loud made it sound really weird. Bjorn agreed and gave his full name, Bjorn, the son of Jandel. Hans shook his hand, saying he'd just call him Bjorn. He added that while 3 people would be better, it was a waste of time to search for anyone else. He then suggested that just the 2 of them should spend the night together. Bjorn's mind raced. What the hell was this guy talking about? Something felt very wrong. The way Hans was talking made Bjorn extremely uneasy. To decide who would get to sleep first, Hans suggested a game of rock, paper, scissors. And just like that, they had a plan for their first night together in the labyrinth. Bjorn couldn't help but think how weird that sounded. Hans won. He grinned and asked if that meant he could sleep first. Bjorn reluctantly agreed. He muttered that he knew he was going to lose, since he never had any luck. Hans then held something out to him. It was a pocket watch. He explained that Bjorn should wake him up when the shorthand reached a specific spot. Bjorn immediately understood. Hans thought barbarians couldn't read time. He even asked if Bjorn understood, offering to explain it all again. The whole thing was incredibly frustrating, but Bjorn knew this was just how it was. This was how most people in Dungeon and Stone looked at barbarians. Bjorn looked down at the expensive pocket watch. He hated being treated like a simpleton, but he knew he could use it to his advantage later. Hans was already fast asleep, looking completely comfortable. Bjorn wondered if this was what an experienced adventurer was like. He even had a quick thought about asking to borrow the sleeping bag. The night dragged on. With no goblins or other people around, it was safe, but incredibly boring. He just stared at the watch, wishing time would hurry up. Slowly, the hands ticked forward. Finally, it was time. Bjorn woke Hans up. Hans sat up and asked if anything had happened. Bjorn told him it had been a quiet night. Hans told Bjorn to get some sleep, promising to wake him in 2 hours. Bjorn agreed, and it was his turn to rest. But Hans had no intention of actually sleeping. There was no way he could let his guard down. How could he possibly trust someone he just met in a place like this? Meanwhile, Bjorn was already putting on a show. He started snoring loudly, pretending to be fast asleep. He lay there, looking like he didn't have a single care in the world. He was playing the part of a tired savage perfectly, but he wasn't asleep at all. He was watching Hans, hoping his act was convincing enough. Hans watched the barbarian, thinking his act was working perfectly. He figured it was easy to read people's intentions when they assumed barbarians were just simpletons. He was completely convinced the dumb barbarian was sleeping like a log. Hans believed that by acting so open, he would force the barbarian to show his true colors if he had any bad intentions. He waited, mentally screaming for him to just make a move. But when the 2 hours were up, it was Bjorn who sat up. Turns out he hadn't slept a wink either. He was furious. For 2 straight hours, Hans had done absolutely nothing. Bjorn regretted it immediately. He should have just slept. What a complete waste of time. But he understood why Hans did it. There was no way he would let his guard down around a complete stranger. Hans couldn't sleep until he decided Bjorn was trustworthy. Now, it was Bjorn's turn to watch over him. He was furious with himself. He should have just slept. That's when Hans spoke up, smiling. He told Bjorn he looked tired and that he should sleep, while Hans stood guard. Bjorn just gave a short thanks, his eyes still cold. But as Hans watched him lie down, he started thinking. He introduced himself, wondering if he'd finally found a decent companion. He ran through the facts. Bjorn had approached him first when he was in a tough spot. He didn't even blame Hans for falling asleep on watch. Hans even remembered how Bjorn had brushed it off, saying it was fine since nothing happened. He'd refused to be paid for the mistake. He thought about the game he knew, Dungeon and Stone. In that world, there was no one that kind. And just like that, something clicked in his head. This was all wrong. Hans kept thinking about it. In a world like this, no one was ever that nice. Just then, Bjorn's eyes opened. Hans smiled down at him, asking if he was awake. He casually asked why Bjorn didn't get more rest. And then, with a twisted grin, he brought the hammer down with all his strength. But Bjorn's grip was like iron. With a single shove, he sent Hans and his weapon flying backwards. The difference in their strength was just too big. Hans was stunned. He couldn't believe Bjorn had moved, stammering that he'd somehow dodged the attack. In an instant, Bjorn was on his feet with his shield up. The look on his face said everything. He was done playing games. Hans started begging, telling him to wait and listen. But Bjorn already knew what was coming. The guy was just trying to make an excuse. He backed away, completely terrified. He was finally realizing just how stupid he'd been. Without a word, Bjorn charged. He slammed his shield right into Hans's chest. The impact was devastating. Hans coughed up blood as he flew backwards. Bjorn was furious. He couldn't believe how easily people underestimated barbarians. Hans started begging, trying to explain himself. But Bjorn just stood over him, his face like stone. He realized the man was tougher than a goblin. One hit wasn't going to be enough. Without hesitation, he swung his shield with all his might. The blow sent Hans flying through the air. He crashed to the ground, completely broken. Bjorn slowly walked over to him. Looking up in terror, Hans started apologizing over and over. He reached out, begging Bjorn to let him live. Bjorn looked down at him, his voice cold. He just wanted to know why he did it. Hans finally broke. He screamed that he was after the magic crystals, and that he only meant to knock Bjorn out. Bjorn questioned if he'd really kill a barbarian for a few crystals. Hans quickly added that he wanted the shield too, since barbarian equipment sold for a good price. He looked up with a sliver of hope, asking if Bjorn would let him go now. But Bjorn knew he was still hiding something. He slammed his fist down again. He stood over the man and gave him one last chance to be honest. Bjorn knew killing another adventurer was a huge crime in this world. The risk didn't make sense for just some gear. He realized there had to be another reason. Hans was after his heart. Bjorn stared down at him, waiting for the answer. The man's face twisted in fear. He admitted it was true. Barbarian hearts were being sold for a lot of money. The man confessed that barbarian hearts were being used as ingredients for some kind of new spell. And just like that, everything clicked for Bjorn. He realized that to this man, he wasn't a person. He was just a monster, like a goblin. A monster that was tough to hunt, but one that dropped a huge reward. Bjorn asked him why he waited so long to attack. The man admitted it was because he needed to sleep too. Even now, he was thinking of Bjorn as just a pest. He begged for his life, saying he told him everything. Bjorn just looked down at him, saying nothing at all. A twisted smile spread across Bjorn's face. He looked down at the man and asked him about forgiveness. He knew this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to kill him just for being a barbarian. He wondered if the man really thought he was going to forgive every single person who tried to kill him. The man stammered in terror, trying to agree with whatever Bjorn said. He started begging, insisting he wasn't like the others, and promising to give Bjorn everything he owned. He promised riches back in the city, pleading for just one more chance. But his pleas were cut short. It had only been one day since Bjorn entered this world. And just like that, it was over. He stood over the body, the reality of it sinking in. He had killed a man. The system immediately registered it as an achievement. For his first murder, his mental stat would permanently increase by 1. 2 days passed. He'd taken the dead man's gear, starting with a new shoulder pad that boosted his item level. He also equipped a backpack, a heavy hammer, and a pair of leather boots. He was finally starting to look like a real adventurer. He felt like he'd finally stopped living like a wild animal. When he was thirsty, he had a bottle to drink from. He could use a compass for direction, a watch for time, and even treat his own injuries with bandages and potions. But the strange part was, all of this only happened after he killed another person. He thought about the strange twist of it all. It took killing another person for him to finally start living like a human being. The system confirmed his progress. Thanks to the new gear and the achievement, his item level and overall combat power had shot way up, and that new power was immediately put to the test. With one swing of the hammer, the goblin was gone. He wondered if he should have picked a weapon from the start. It was strange. During a fight, it felt like he was in someone else's body, a natural-born warrior. He didn't have much time to think about it. More enemies were already in front of him. He noticed a pattern. Now that it was the second day, the goblins were starting to appear in pairs. But with his new weapon and higher stats, he wasn't worried. The goblins charged forward, mindlessly. He met their attack head-on, his hammer crashing down on both of them. Things were going smoothly. He just kept swinging, taking down one goblin after another. After the fight, he knelt down to catch his breath. The ground was covered in loot from the goblins he'd taken out, but the non-stop fighting was catching up to him. He was completely exhausted and knew he couldn't last much longer without sleep. He thought about what happened with Hans. Maybe it was better to be alone. After all, he figured he had a better chance of surviving a goblin's knife than another person's betrayal. Just as he was thinking that, he heard something. He was not happy. Of course, the second he started to relax, more goblins showed up. He hadn't even had 10 minutes to himself. He was completely fed up. He finally found a moment to rest, but the dungeon wasn't going to make it easy for him. He'd just finished a huge fight, taking down every goblin he could see. He was sure he'd gotten all of them. He was so tired. All he wanted was a little bit of sleep before the next wave came. But just as he drifted off, a system message popped up. A goblin was attacking him in his sleep. His eyes shot open. He was furious with himself for not sensing it. With a roar of pure frustration, he retaliated instantly. The goblin was completely stunned, caught off guard by the sheer force of the barbarian's attack. He took a sharp breath, his eyes already scanning for the next enemy. He was done playing around. The goblin that had ambushed him was now on the ground, scrambling backwards in pure terror. He just watched it run. He told himself he didn't even have the energy to give chase. He looked down at the wound on his shoulder and winced. He realized if the goblin had jumped just a little higher, the blade would have gone straight through his throat. He was furious with himself for not sensing the attack. It was a clear sign he needed to rest. But first, he had to treat the wound. He poured the potion over the cut, gritting his teeth. He couldn't help but think the healing process somehow hurt more than getting stabbed in the first place. He'd been walking for 14 hours since leaving Hans. He knew people would be looking for companions to survive the night, but he couldn't trust anyone, not now that he knew how valuable a barbarian's heart was. But then, an idea hit him. There was one group of people he might be able to trust, other barbarians. He had a new plan. He was going to find another barbarian. He didn't have to look far. A couple of adventurers walked up and asked if he needed a group for the night. A moment later, another group approached him with the same offer. It kept happening. One guy even said they could trust him because he was a barbarian. Bjorn couldn't believe it. Just yesterday, no one would even look at him, and now everyone wanted him on their team. He turned them all down, explaining that he was looking for another barbarian. He figured he looked a lot more trustworthy now that he wasn't covered in blood and missing a shoe. One of the adventurers seemed surprised. He told Bjorn that finding another barbarian would be tough. Bjorn didn't understand why. The man explained that barbarians are so strong, they usually leave the first floor within a few months. There were probably less than 100 of them left down here. That's when it hit Bjorn. He realized how it must look. A giant barbarian, built for power, still struggling on the very first floor. It had to be a joke. The adventurer wished him luck and left. Bjorn stood there, wondering if he'd have to give up on finding another barbarian completely. He decided to be realistic. It didn't have to be a barbarian. He just needed to find a companion for the night. But he had one rule. As long as it wasn't a human, it had to be another species. He figured an elf who keeps their promises, or a dwarf who's spirited like a barbarian, would be best. Basically, he believed other species had special traits that made them more trustworthy. Unlike humans, they wouldn't betray someone for a little bit of money. With his mind made up, he started searching. He walked through the dark cave for about an hour, and that's when he saw her. An elf, sitting all alone with her bow beside her. She was exactly what he'd been looking for. The elf, Erwin, jumped. She wasn't alone anymore. Bjorn knew he'd found her. Erwin stared back, her eyes wide with fear. Then a message from the system appeared, confirming it. She wasn't just an elf. He took a step closer and asked if she was alone. The elf immediately went on guard. Bjorn understood her fear. A giant barbarian showing up when she was injured and alone would intimidate anyone. He looked closer and saw the wound on her stomach. It didn't look like it was made by a goblin's dagger. He asked her directly if a human was the one who hurt her. She slowly got to her feet. He took one step forward. Then, her entire attitude changed. She dropped to her knees and started begging him for help. Bjorn just stared, confused. The elf pleaded with the barbarian to let her go, explaining that she had a little brother at home to take care of. This completely threw him off. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. In the game, elves were always cold and proud, and based on her looks, he'd expected her to be the same. He realized he'd handled this all wrong. He decided to try and clear up the misunderstanding with a simple smile. He started to tell her not to worry, and gave her what he thought was a friendly smile. Her eyes widened, but not in the way he expected. He told her he had no intention of killing her, but to her, his smile looked like a monster's grin. She was convinced he was lying. She started crying, begging him to just let her live this one time. Bjorn was completely lost. He couldn't understand what he'd done wrong, and started wondering what kind of horrible things other barbarians must do. He couldn't believe how one simple sentence could scare her so much. The reputation of his people was clearly a huge problem. He decided to try a different approach. He tossed her a bandage and told her to treat her wound first, saying they could talk later. The elf looked up, completely surprised. She recognized the lyco leaves immediately. She'd been worried they were poisonous, but now she knew they were safe to use. Still, she was suspicious. She looked up at him and asked why he was giving them to her. Bjorn answered her directly. He said there didn't need to be a reason to help someone, but admitted that this time there was. He told her to treat her wound first, promising to stand guard. Inside, he knew what he wanted, to become overnight companions. He knew it sounded a little sketchy, but he also knew it wasn't a bad deal for her. After all, she was injured and completely exhausted. On top of that, her appearance made her a target. He realized she was in a much worse situation than he was. A few moments later, she was done. The wound was treated. He saw she was already done. She was surprisingly quick. Seeing her guard drop just a little, he decided this was the right time to properly introduce himself. He introduced himself with his full name, Bjorn, the son of Jandel. She hesitated for a moment before quietly telling him her name was Erwin. She then asked why he wasn't afraid of her, pointing out that she was an elf and he was a barbarian. Bjorn had no idea what she was talking about. She started to explain the long history between their people. Barbarians and elves, she said, were enemies. And just like that, Bjorn finally understood her fear. He grimaced. Okay, so maybe their history was a pretty big deal after all. The thing is, this was the first time he'd ever heard about it. Back in the game he knew. He was sure that barbarians and elves were on good terms. Erwin quickly tried to calm things down. She insisted the war between their people had ended 10 years ago, and that she held no anger towards barbarians. She pleaded with him, saying she didn't want to fight. Bjorn listened, but her words caught him off guard. A 10-year gap was a big deal. Still, he didn't have time to find anyone else. Bjorn told her he didn't have any problem with her either. Her face immediately lit up with relief. So, he got straight to the point. He asked Erwin if she would be his companion for the night. He explained that they were both completely exhausted. It just made sense to team up until morning. Erwin was hesitant, clearly thinking it over. Then, an idea seemed to pop into her head. She remembered hearing that barbarians take their warrior's honor very seriously. So she asked him to swear on that honor that he wouldn't hurt her, an oath. Internally, Bjorn thought the whole warrior's honor thing was a joke, but he knew it was the perfect way to get her to trust him. So he agreed to swear on the name of his tribe. Bjorn agreed, but he wanted to make one thing clear before they went any further. Erwin looked a little surprised by his serious tone. He corrected her, puffing out his chest. He wasn't some Mr. He was Bjorn, and the son of Jandel. He even added that Bjorn was only 20 years old, talking about himself like he was someone else. It was all part of the act. With that settled, he placed a hand over his chest. He, Bjorn, son of Jandel, swore upon his warrior's honor. Erwin followed his lead, clasping her hands together. She introduced herself as Erwin Fornaci de Tercia and swore upon the name of her tribe. They both vowed not to harm each other for the night. The relief on Erwin's face was obvious. She thought she could finally get some real sleep. Bjorn offered to sleep first, figuring she'd feel safer that way. Erwin seemed a little surprised by the offer, but agreed to it. Then he did something unexpected. He handed her a pocket watch, warning her that it was expensive and that she should handle it with care. Bjorn knew he couldn't just fall asleep. He decided to pretend for 10 minutes, just to be safe. But before he knew it, a voice was shouting at him. He sat up, completely confused. Erwin told him his 2 hours were up and handed back the watch. He couldn't believe it. He hadn't just faked it. He'd passed out completely. The blanket and backpack were so comfortable, it was almost dangerous. So, he decided to share. He offered her the blanket and told her she could use the bag as a pillow. Erwin looked surprised by the gesture. She gratefully accepted, wrapping herself in the blanket. The moment her head hit the bag, she was out cold. Bjorn watched her, thinking she must have been just as exhausted as he was. It had been a long day for both of them. It had only been 3 days, but it felt like 5. The fact that he was having these random thoughts meant he was finally feeling better. His mind drifted back to his real life. He wondered if anyone had reported him missing, but then he remembered there was no one to even notice he was gone. He shook his head. He had to stop thinking about that. There was nothing for him back there anyway. Thinking about it would just break his spirit. After a few more turns standing guard, it was time to move. He checked the watch. Only 10 minutes left. A thought crossed his mind. He looked over at the sleeping elf. He wondered if he should ask her to team up again. After all, being an elf, she'd definitely be able to hold her own in a fight. He had a choice to make. If they became allies, he'd have to split the rewards, which meant less money for him. But lately, goblins had been appearing in huge groups. He knew he could take down 3 or 4 goblins by himself. So, what was the smarter move? Guaranteed safety or more treasure? Before he could decide, he heard footsteps. 2 adventurers were walking down the path. They stopped and started whispering to each other. One of them recognized the elf, sleeping nearby. Then, the man turned to Bjorn and asked him what he was doing with the elf. Bjorn told him they were just companions for the night. The adventurer seemed amused by the idea of a barbarian and an elf working together, and then asked how much time they had left. Bjorn's expression hardened. He told the man he didn't have to answer that. The adventurers flinched back, clearly not expecting such a hostile response. The man just gave him a creepy smile. He seemed to understand something Bjorn didn't. With that, the 2 men turned and walked away into the darkness. But Bjorn had a bad feeling. He was pretty sure they weren't just passing by. They were looking for Erwin. He knew they had to move. He reached over and started shaking her shoulder to wake her up, but she just mumbled something about wanting 5 more minutes and pulled the blanket over her head. Bjorn's patience was wearing thin. She had no idea how much trouble they were about to be in. He shook her again, telling her to get up. They didn't have time for this, but she just mumbled, pulling the blanket tighter. That's when Bjorn realized she was just pretending. The blanket, which was loose before, was now pulled completely over her head. He'd had enough. He ripped the blanket right off of her, and she screamed in surprise. He leaned in close and demanded to know why she was pretending. She stammered, trying to explain that if she got up, he was just going to desert her. So that's what this was about. He got it. They weren't official allies, just temporary companions who agreed to watch each other's backs for one night. And now that she was awake, their deal was technically over. He let out a breath and raised his shield, wondering what happened to those two guys from before. She quickly insisted that nothing had happened, looking really flustered. Bjorn didn't buy it and asked how they knew her. She explained they were probably from the same group as the guy who attacked her earlier. She remembered seeing the same symbol on their clothes. They were part of a group called the Crystal Union. This was bad. It wasn't just a couple of guys, but an entire group. Bjorn's first thought was to just leave her and get out of there. But then he looked at her. She seemed so young and scared. He couldn't just abandon her. He let out a breath. He told her they could talk while they were moving. She was surprised and asked if that meant he was going to help. As they started running, Bjorn made it clear he'd listen to her story first before making any promises. That was enough for her. She looked completely relieved, happy that he was at least giving her a chance. As they ran, Erwin started her story. She said she met the men from the Crystal Union on her first day in the labyrinth. They were just temporary companions for the night. But while she was sleeping, she felt like something was off. So she opened her eyes. A man was standing right over her. He noticed she was awake and said something about it. He had this awful grin and told her she could go back to sleep. It was clear he meant trouble. She explained that she found out later he was the manager of a clan that basically ran the first floor. She somehow managed to escape, but his union members kept attacking her. That's how she got hurt. Bjorn didn't get it. He asked how they were able to keep finding her. She said they were probably using message stones to track her. That stopped Bjorn in his tracks. Message stones? That item never existed in the game he played. He knew he needed more details, fast. Erwin explained that message stones were basically magic walkie-talkies. They let people communicate from up to 300 meters away, as long as they were synced up first. Bjorn processed this new information. The Union had tons of people, and now he knew they could coordinate instantly. They had nowhere to run. He realized that if he left her behind, she would definitely be caught. As they ran, he asked her why the Union was so obsessed with catching her. It just didn't add up. He wondered if they were just trying to shut her up. She looked away, admitting it wasn't just that. She started to explain nervously. When she was first escaping, she just flung her knife wildly without looking, and it just so happened to hit the guy somewhere really bad. Bjorn's face went pale. He had to ask what, exactly, she meant by somewhere bad. She stammered, trying to explain exactly where she'd hit the guy. Turns out, she'd cut it clean off. She added that even potions couldn't reattach it, and she seemed weirdly happy about that. Bjorn was horrified. He yelled at her that of course they were chasing her. That was more than enough reason. He couldn't believe she was laughing. She apologized with a little giggle, saying it felt like karma. Bjorn did not look amused. Just then, her expression changed. She whispered that someone was following them and warned him not to look back. She focused for a second, then told him the pursuer was about 150 meters away. Bjorn couldn't sense a thing at that distance. He realized this had to be one of those special elven abilities. He had to trust her. He told her they had to speed up. She agreed, even though she was clearly getting tired. As they ran, Bjorn noticed Erwin's wound had opened up again, but she didn't say a single word about the pain. He had to admit, she was tough. Erwin called out an update. The chaser was still holding steady at 150 meters. Bjorn gritted his teeth. Even though they'd picked up the pace, they weren't getting away. He knew the chaser wasn't just following. He was probably telling his friends exactly where they were, and that was going to be a huge problem. They had to get rid of him. If he were the one hunting them, that's exactly the choice he would have made. But attacking one of them was a line they couldn't uncross. He had to be sure it was worth the risk. Erwin stopped him, demanding to know what the benefit was. She told him that if he wanted her to make a sound decision, she needed more information. Instead of answering, Bjorn cut straight to the point. He asked her what she was good at. She completely misunderstood. She proudly announced she was good at laundry and cleaning, though she admitted she was a bad cook. He snapped back, asking what she could do in a fight. Erwin flushed, realizing her mistake. She quickly recovered and told him she was good at archery. And not just that, she could also use spirit magic with the flame element. Bjorn realized she was the perfect example of an elf archer, and flame magic was the rarest element there was. He had one last question for her, and it was the most important one. He asked if she'd ever killed anyone before. Erwin admitted that she had never killed anyone before, but her expression was dead serious. She insisted that she was ready to do what was necessary. Bjorn took a moment to think about her answer. Then, he officially asked her to be his comrade. He started laying out the terms, a 90-10 split of the rewards, until they got out of the labyrinth. But before he could even finish, Erwin screamed that she accepted the deal. With that settled, Bjorn asked how far away their pursuers were. She yelled back that they were only 100 meters behind them. His face hardened, even running as fast as they could. The enemy was still closing in. Bjorn knew they couldn't just keep running. He had a different idea. He yelled at Erwin to follow him off the main path and summon her spirit. She didn't hesitate. A small fire spirit appeared and flew right beside them. They stopped inside a dark passage, using the spirit as bait. Erwin whispered that their enemies were getting closer. On Bjorn's signal, she dismissed the spirit. The cave went pitch black. A moment later, a figure stepped into the darkness, unable to see a thing, but the plan didn't work. The pursuer walked right up to their hiding spot. He realized this wasn't some random group. These guys had a way to track them, even in the dark. Bjorn didn't hesitate. He called out Erwin's name, his voice low and urgent. Her eyes narrowed. She knew what he was going to ask of her. He gave the order. She let the arrow fly. It cut through the darkness, glowing with power. The shot was perfect. It hit the pursuer right in the head. The man dropped without a sound. Erwin stood there, trembling. She couldn't believe what she'd just done. Bjorn put a hand on her shoulder. He told her she did well, explaining that if she had hesitated for even a second, they both would have been in serious trouble. The other pursuer knelt beside his fallen friend. He picked up a glowing green stone from the dead man's hand. He tried to use it, yelling for Serdin to respond. When he got no answer, he sent out a message to everyone else. He told them Serdin had been taken out while chasing the elf and the barbarian. He gave them all a location to meet up, the Goblin District. Bjorn went through the fallen man's things. He was hoping for some decent loot, but there wasn't much. All he found was a pouch of magic crystals, 2 daggers, and a single potion. He also took the man's clothes. Erwin put them on, admitting it felt a little strange. Bjorn told her the leather armor was much better than the rags she'd been wearing. He thought to himself that the new clothes gave her a whole different vibe, in a good way. She then asked how to use the message stone they'd found. Bjorn guessed there was probably a button on the side. He found it and pressed it. A voice came from the stone, repeating the message the other pursuer had sent out. It announced that Serdin had been defeated by an elf and a barbarian with a hammer and shield. Worst of all, it gave away their exact location, the Goblin District. The message wasn't done. It also announced a bounty of 10,000 gold for them. Erwin was completely terrified, but Bjorn wasn't fazed. He told Erwin to summon her spirit, explaining they would stick to the edges of the area to stay hidden. Then he dropped the real plan on her. They were going to the second floor. Erwin couldn't believe what she was hearing. Without another word, he started moving. Erwin's voice was full of doubt. She asked if he was serious about them going to the second floor all alone. He didn't even turn around. He just confirmed that was exactly what they were doing. She tried to explain the danger, reminding him that the second floor was on a whole other level compared to the first. He just said he already knew. He told her it would be fine as long as they stayed near the entrance. He was confident that together they were a good team. Erwin seemed a little flustered by his confidence in them, but she agreed. In his mind, it was simple math. A melee tank and a long-range archer was a perfect combo, but if they were going to team up, the first floor just wouldn't make them enough money. But Erwin was still hesitant. She argued that it was their first time together. Going to the second floor felt like jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. Just then, they overheard the voices of their pursuers nearby. The men were shouting about the bounty, offering a sick bonus to whoever found Erwin first. Her face went pale. She immediately turned to Bjorn, her voice trembling as she promised not to leave his side. The men's voices carried through the darkness. They laughed and made disgusting jokes about what they would do to her if she put up a fight. That was it. Hearing them, her fear turned into grim determination. She looked straight ahead and told him she would go to the second floor. Bjorn didn't even react. He just thought to himself that the timing was perfect. Now he didn't have to waste any more time trying to convince her. Bjorn had a simple rule he lived by. He liked helping people in need, but only when it helped him too. He figured if he could take down disgusting trash like their pursuers and get the satisfaction of doing something good at the same time, then it was the best of both worlds. There was no reason not to help. As they made their way through the dungeon, Erwin asked if he even knew how to get to the second floor. Bjorn told her he didn't know the exact path, but heading north would eventually get them there. But he knew a secret. The dungeon was designed so that if you just kept following the darkness, you'd always find a portal to the upper floors. Suddenly, Erwin shouted for him to wait. She had spotted a goblin trap hidden on the path, right in front of them. Bjorn realized something was off. He'd only taken a few steps before hitting the trap, which felt way too late. A thought hit him. Maybe goblins didn't come out much when it was light. He couldn't believe how unlucky he was. Seeing her chance, Erwin told him she'd handle it, and that he could take a break. She was already summoning her fire spirit, but Bjorn stopped her. He told her not to use it. She needed to save her strength for later. She looked a little flustered, but quickly agreed. But Bjorn could tell she didn't mean it. She was clearly disappointed, and he wondered how he knew that so easily. Just then, 2 wolf-like creatures leaped out of the darkness. Erwin stood her ground, ready for a fight. One of them lunged, but she was faster, dodging the attack with ease. She let an arrow fly, and it shot through the air with serious power. But she didn't just use her bow. She kicked the other creature right in the face. The creature looked stunned. His partner was already taken down. It let out a growl and charged forward, furious. But Erwin was already waiting for it. She had her next arrow ready, and just like that, it was over. She took them both out without breaking a sweat. She turned back to Bjorn, smiling proudly, and asked him how she did. Bjorn admitted she did well, saying her archery was exactly what you'd expect from an elf. But inside, he was actually surprised. She was way more skilled and quick than he had expected. Bjorn held out the magic crystals they'd collected from the creatures. Erwin smiled, confirming her 10% cut of the reward. Her eyes lit up as she explained that with this money, she could finally buy something for her younger sibling. Bjorn just told her to work hard, but inside, he was completely thrown off by her excitement, wondering if she was somehow trying to insult insult him. Suddenly, a message came through from their pursuers. The bounty on Erwin's head had just been doubled to 20,000 gold. The bounty was for her, dead or alive. Bjorn tried to reassure her, saying their enemies seemed disorganized and wouldn't follow them into the darkness. And he was right. Their pursuers were already splitting up, with some deciding to hunt wolves instead. Bjorn pointed out that many of them weren't even interested anymore. Still, Bjorn felt uneasy. Everything was going way too smoothly. His gut told him that with his kind of luck, something bad was about to happen. Just as he thought that, Erwin screamed. A group of ghouls was shuffling toward them out of the darkness. Bjorn was just as confused. This made no sense. In the game, ghouls were only supposed to appear in the south. He wondered if they'd wandered too far and accidentally crossed into a different territory. Erwin looked over at him, asking if she was supposed to fight them by herself. Bjorn shook his head. He explained that the experience system here was strange. You only got rewarded the very first time you defeated a new type of monster. That meant to level up, you had to hunt down as many different species as possible. So this was actually a great situation for them. He laid out the plan. He would take the lead, and she would pick off the ones in the back with her bow. He remembered how they worked in the game. The ghouls wouldn't attack until they got within a certain range. The ghouls lunged forward, their eyes glowing in the dark. But Bjorn wasn't worried. He knew exactly how these things fought. Everything was going according to his plan. He met the first one head on, slamming his shield into it while yelling a challenge. He pushed forward, his eyes locked on the horde. He swung his mace in a huge arc. He knew ghouls were stronger and faster than goblins, but they were still just low-rank monsters with simple attack patterns. One of them tried to grab him from behind, but an arrow shot out of the darkness and hit its arm, stopping it cold. Bjorn smiled. With a trustworthy partner watching his back, this fight was going to be easy. The system confirmed the kill. Another ghoul was down. They kept moving north. 3 days passed just like that. Suddenly, Erwin stopped and called out to him. She'd spotted something on the ground. It was blood. She pointed out that it didn't look like it came from goblins. The trail was leading exactly where they needed to go. Bjorn stared at the blood, a sudden thought hitting him. He hoped he was wrong, but a bad feeling started to grow. The trail of blood led them right to a hunter's trap, and standing right there in the darkness was another person, waiting. He recognized this place. It was the very first spot he'd arrived at in the labyrinth, and right behind that spot was the portal they had been searching for this whole time. He remembered crawling out of the darkness, completely lost. He had struggled so much back then, feeling completely hopeless, cursing his terrible luck. All that remembered frustration came boiling out at once. He let out a huge roar, and Erwin jumped back, thinking she was in trouble. He was furious. The portal had been less than 10 meters away from his starting point the entire time. If he had just gone in the other direction, he could have avoided all this. Erwin was completely confused, asking if she'd done something wrong. He quickly told her it wasn't her fault, but she was still confused, asking him why he was so upset. Erwin watched him, trying to figure out what that look on his face meant. Her expression softened with pity. She told him she understood now, that he must have gone through so much. Bjorn was stunned, wondering if she had actually figured out the truth. Turns out, she was completely wrong. She assumed he must have lost a dear friend here. Bjorn realized she had no idea what was actually going on. She changed the subject, asking if he was ready to go up. She admitted she was scared, but said she felt safe as long as she was with him. He just noted to himself that she had a strange way of drawing out her sentences. Without another word, he told her it was time to go. As they stepped into the light, he added that he didn't plan on dying that easily. A message appeared in front of them. They had arrived on the second floor, the Goblin Forest. The teleportation wasn't a gentle transition. It felt more like being thrown out of a moving car, tumbling through the darkness. He slammed into the ground, using his shield to break the fall. Erwin landed gracefully behind him and immediately rushed over, asking if he was okay. He tried to play it cool, saying he was just curious about what the portal felt like. But honestly, he felt terrible. He described the feeling as being chewed up by a giant frog and then spat back out. He was completely surprised, since he'd never been through a portal that just dropped you from the sky. Erwin, on the other hand, had landed perfectly. He couldn't help but feel a little jealous of the kind of agility that barbarians just don't have. Shaking off the feeling, he turned his attention to their new surroundings. It was time to figure out exactly where they were. Erwin scanned the area. She reported that the portal back to the first floor was still active behind them, and there were no creatures within a 50-meter radius. Thanks to the stars, they could see surprisingly well, but he knew this was as bright as it was ever going to get. Inside the labyrinth, the sun never rises. Erwin looked around, completely confused. She'd never heard of the second floor being a forest. He told her that was because this wasn't the only one. He explained that the first floor has 4 portals, each leading to a different region. The north portal brought them here, to the Goblin Forest. The east portal led to the Beast's Lair. The west portal opened into the land of the dead, and the south portal went to the dark, rocky mountains. It all clicked for Erwin. She asked if all 4 paths eventually connected to the third floor. He confirmed she was right. That's when Erwin asked the big question. What do they do now? Did he know the way back to the city from here? Then she remembered the rule. They get sent back automatically once the labyrinth closes. He confirmed she was right and gave her the exact numbers. The first floor closes after 168 hours, but the second floor stays open for 240. That was their deadline. He explained that once the time limit is up, the labyrinth just sends everyone back to the city. Since other groups like the Crystal Union can't even work together, they were completely alone up here. So he laid out the plan. They would stay on the second floor until just before the first floor's 168 hours were up, then head back down. But he knew they couldn't just stand around by the portal all day. It was time to explore. He told Erwin to take the lead, and she agreed. They headed into the dark woods together. As they walked, Erwin mentioned that being in a forest felt familiar, almost nostalgic. She smiled, saying that even though she knew monsters were everywhere, it reminded her of the fairy shrine back home. Bjorn suddenly cut in, warning her to be careful. He told her there were traps and that she should follow his footsteps exactly. He pointed to the ground, showing her one of the hidden traps right in their path. Bjorn stared into the woods, but couldn't see a thing. He told her he didn't see anything, but Erwin just smiled, completely confident. She pointed to a spot under the leaves and just told him to watch. A rock flew through the air and hit the ground, and a trap instantly went off. Bjorn was shocked. She was right. He wondered if this was the special detection ability of fairies. Erwin stood there proudly and asked him what he thought. He had to admit, she was suddenly looking pretty dependable, but all he said out loud was a simple grunt. He told her she was good at throwing rocks, but he reminded himself there was no reason to praise her. Erwin couldn't believe it. She yelled at him, asking if that was really all he had to say, since finding traps was supposed to be his job in the first place. He told her not to get so excited over something so small. Then, he called her a proper explorer. Erwin's face lit up. She was completely taken by the compliment. She was so flustered she could only manage a quiet agreement. Bjorn watched her, thinking to himself that she was surprisingly easy to control. But as they moved, something felt off. He noticed traps, but couldn't sense any goblins nearby. He remembered that on the second floor, traps were just part of the terrain, not always a sign of enemies. He told her to stop talking and focus. With that, he had her walk ahead of him as they pushed deeper into the woods. He knew this place well from the game. It was called the Goblin Forest. And besides the traps, he remembered another key detail about this place. The goblins here always moved around in big groups. He knew that some of the goblins here were different, mutants that could be warriors or archers. The deeper they went into the forest, the more dangerous the enemies would become. But he wasn't worried. Their plan was simple: stick close to the portal and avoid the high-ranking monsters altogether. He told Erwin their first move was to clear out all the traps nearby. That way, they could expand their search area safely. He made it clear, if anything went wrong, they were to run back to the first floor immediately, no questions asked. So they started clearing the area, using rocks to set off the traps from a distance. It was tedious work, but necessary. The last thing they needed was to step on one while running for their lives. Erwin looked over, eager for his approval. He clapped and told her she was doing great, calling her a proper explorer. The praise clearly meant a lot to her. She paused for a moment, just taking it in. Suddenly, Erwin's eyes went wide. She quietly warned him that a group of goblins was nearby. He asked how many. She wasn't sure, but she counted more than 10 of them, about 50 meters away. The good news was, the goblins hadn't spotted them yet. She asked him what they should do. His answer was simple. They were going to fight. Bjorn started forming a plan. He asked her how close she could get without being noticed. She told him she could get within 30 meters. That was all he needed to hear. He told her to stick to the plan. He watched as she moved through the tall grass without making a single sound. He figured that must be a fairy thing. Just as she said, she got into position, looking down at the goblins, who had no idea she was there. From his hiding spot, Bjorn watched as Erwin gave the signal. She was ready. She took a deep breath, lining up her shot on the goblin patrol, and then she let the arrow fly. That was his cue. Bjorn exploded from his cover. He sprinted towards the goblins, unable to tell if her arrow had hit its mark. They were just too far away. As he closed the distance, he yelled for Erwin to get behind him. She immediately moved to follow his command. He crashed into the group of goblins, his shield and mace ready. He gritted his teeth. The goblins on the second floor were on a completely different level. He realized there were 3 times as many goblins as he'd seen on the first floor. Among them was a goblin warrior. It was the kind of sight that should have been terrifying. But surprisingly, he didn't feel scared at all. Instead, he could feel the warrior's heart inside him starting to stir. It was practically buzzing with excitement for the fight. With a massive roar, he charged straight into the horde. The goblins were completely overwhelmed by the sudden attack. He easily blocked the first swing with his shield, but before he could strike back, 2 more leaped at him from both sides. The goblins slammed into him from both sides, trying to pin him down, but Bjorn was a wall of muscle. He just shoved them right back. He swung his massive shield like a club, sending one of the goblins flying. He wasn't just defending anymore. He was going on the attack. With a roar, he brought his hammer down with all his strength. The hit crushed the goblin instantly, but out of nowhere, a blade shot right past his face. It was the goblin warrior, and it was fast. He threw himself backward just in time. The blade missed his head by inches. He caught his breath, realizing just how dangerous that was. If he'd been a second slower, it would have been over. He was completely surrounded. The goblins weren't giving him a single moment to catch his breath. He knew that taking on more than 5 of them at once was a huge problem. If he was by himself, he'd just have to accept getting hurt to win this fight. But he wasn't alone. Suddenly, a glowing arrow shot through the darkness, hitting one of the goblins right in front of him. It was Erwin. She let out a quiet breath, her shot having hit its mark. He saw that she was back in position, ready to cover him. That was all he needed. It was time to end this. His eyes started to glow with power. He glared at the remaining goblins, calling them out. He roared, challenging all of them to come at him at once. The system confirmed the goblin warrior was down, giving him 1 experience point. From that fight alone, he'd earned 11 magic crystals. Bjorn was satisfied. This was way more than he'd earned on the first floor. The only downside was that the warrior's armor and weapons disappeared right along with its body. Erwin held out her share of the crystals. She explained that since his came from a swordsman, they were more valuable, so she was giving him a bigger cut. He was surprised, but thanked her. With the loot sorted, Bjorn told her it was time to move on. He was already thinking about how much they could make over the next 4 days. They pushed deeper into the labyrinth. The farther they went, the more dangerous it got. Soon, they were running into goblin patrols every few minutes. This time, there was an archer in the group. Suddenly, Erwin yelled out that the archer was disappearing. It was using some kind of stealth magic. Bjorn immediately told her to focus up. He braced himself for an attack from an enemy he couldn't see. The goblin archers were making things a lot harder. While he was distracted, the rest of the goblins charged straight at him. But Bjorn was confident they weren't going to lose. He brought his hammer down, crushing the first goblin that got close. He kept swinging, clearing out the ones in front. In the back, the invisible archer was finally taking its shot. Bjorn knew that with his barbarian body, all he had to do was concentrate. He saw the arrow coming straight for his head. He just needed to focus on dodging the arrows flying toward him. His grip tightened on his hammer. The goblin looked on, furious. With a final, brutal swing of his shield, Bjorn took out the goblin archer. The fight was over. A message popped up, confirming he'd defeated the goblin archer and gained some experience. With the immediate danger gone, Bjorn announced it was time for them to take a break. Erwin collapsed, completely drained. She asked how long they'd been going, and Bjorn told her it had been about 15 hours. He offered to let her sleep first. She was so relieved, she could barely believe it. He told her he'd get the sleeping bag and blanket ready. They finally settled down for a much-needed rest. As Erwin slept, Bjorn kept watch. He thought to himself that she must have been completely exhausted, because he'd never heard her make a sound while sleeping before. He figured it was because, for the first time, she actually felt safe. As he kept watch, Bjorn thought about how long they'd been going. It had been 15 hours straight. The rewards were way better than on the first floor. But the deeper they went, the more they started running into other explorers. They were always in groups of 3 or more, and some of them weren't even human. They always just passed by each other without a word, but even seeing them was draining. In a place like this, other people were way scarier than goblins, and now he had a very specific reason to be worried. He looked down at her, thinking that her being so pretty was a real problem. That's when her eyes shot open. She looked at him with a little smile and asked if he really thought she was that pretty, and told him to go to sleep. Bjorn couldn't believe it. He was sure she'd been snoring just a second ago. She just gave a happy little hum and snuggled back into her blanket. He thought to himself that Erwin wasn't like any of the fairies he knew from the game. She was completely different. The 4th day came, and they were still fighting. They moved together like a well-oiled machine, taking down goblin after goblin. By the 5th day, they finally took a moment to rest. The 6th day passed, and then it was the 7th. They had been in the labyrinth for a full week. Finally, Bjorn announced it was time to leave. The system confirmed they had less than 3 hours until the first floor closed for good. Erwin was completely drained. She mumbled that all she wanted to do was get back and sleep. Bjorn agreed. He said it was better to head back now and be early, rather than risk being late. But Erwin warned him to be careful. The path back wouldn't be safe. New traps had been laid out, and the goblin groups had probably respawned by now. Erwin spotted another group of goblins up ahead. She counted 8 regular ones, 2 archers, and 2 warriors. Even after everything, she was ready to fight. Bjorn didn't hesitate. He simply said they would fight. The goblins were just sitting there, completely clueless. Suddenly, an arrow flew out of the darkness and hit one of the archers. That was the signal. Bjorn charged straight into the middle of them. His eyes glowed with a red light as he swung his shield, ready to clear a path. He yelled out the plan. Erwin would take care of the archers. That meant he could focus on the warriors. And with a massive crash, he slammed his shield right into the first one. After so many fights, he was really getting the hang of this. He felt like he could see and block every attack coming his way. And it wasn't just him. He could tell Erwin was getting used to it too. She knew exactly which targets to take out first. He remembered her saying there were 2 archers in this group, but not a single arrow was flying at him. Because of her, the time it took to clear out these goblins was getting shorter and shorter. He looked over at her and praised her for the good work, but he also asked her to let him know for sure when the archers were all gone. He didn't want to be worrying about them mid-fight. He quickly apologized in case he sounded too demanding. She explained that she hadn't said anything because she wasn't totally sure if her last arrow had hit its mark. Bjorn looked a little confused, but then he got it. Giving him information she wasn't sure about could be more dangerous than saying nothing. Erwin just gave him a little smile. He was really proud of her. She'd grown so much in just a few days. Suddenly, Erwin shouted and pointed. There was something glowing on one of the dead goblins. He recognized it immediately. It was an essence, specifically from a goblin archer. He couldn't believe it. Of all the places to find something this rare, it had to be here. He knew exactly what this meant. In the game, essences were basically cheat items that gave you new skills. You could only take 1 per level, which made them more valuable than any treasure. But there was a catch. You could only absorb a limited number, and their powers were random. Picking the right ones could make or break a character. The drop rate for these things was almost 0. He never expected to see one here. Erwin just stared at it, completely amazed. But Bjorn wasn't excited. This felt way too lucky. He had a really bad feeling about this whole thing. Erwin nervously asked if eating the essence would turn her into a goblin. Bjorn sighed, explaining that it just grants you some of the creature's abilities. He reminded her of the guy who chased them on the first floor. That hunter had used a wolf's essence to track them down purely by scent. With the explanation over, he asked if she wanted it. Erwin seemed surprised and said she didn't really want it. But a second later, she completely changed her mind, eagerly saying she'd take it if he wasn't going to. She gave him a confident thumbs up. Bjorn just watched her, thinking to himself that she was definitely getting bolder. He didn't mind giving it away. He already knew exactly what essence he wanted for himself. He knew that just taking any random essence now would be a huge mistake later on. A goblin archer's power just wasn't a good fit for a barbarian. With that decided, he turned back to Erwin. He told her she could have it, but only if she promised him one thing. Erwin immediately got annoyed, realizing he was using this to get his way on something they were supposed to discuss earlier. Just as Erwin was about to take the essence, they realized they weren't alone. Another hunter was standing right over them. A voice boomed through the clearing, telling them not to move. Turns out, it wasn't just one hunter, but a whole group. Their leader pointed and yelled, demanding to know what a barbarian and a fairy were doing there. Erwin was completely caught off guard. She stammered, trying to explain that they were just hunting. But Bjorn knew this was trouble. He thought to himself that their luck had been too good. He quietly told Erwin not to answer them. She looked back at him, totally confused by his command. Before she could ask why, Bjorn shoved her hard from behind. The push made her clench her fist, crushing the essence. It exploded with a bright flash of light. The other hunter completely lost it. He screamed, furious that Erwin had just consumed the essence right in front of them. As the light from the essence faded, the group yelled that it belonged to them. The hunters were thrown back by the burst of energy, but Bjorn just stood there, completely unfazed by it all. Erwin quietly thanked him, still shaken, but Bjorn wasn't surprised. He had been expecting a fight like this. He figured they must have seen the glowing essence from a distance and came running for it. The leader shot him a nasty grin, but Bjorn wasn't worried. He knew they had no real power here, so he stepped forward and laid it out for them. He told them the essence was gone, and if they wanted to fight, they should just come at him. His thinking was simple. They were at a disadvantage, and that's exactly why they had to be the ones to push forward and act bold. The hunters were taken aback. Their leader knew that if they let their guard down for even a second, they'd be underestimated. But Bjorn cut them off before they could decide. He roared that he was ready to fight, telling them to come at him or get lost. There was no more talking. Bjorn and Erwin turned and ran. Bjorn yelled at Erwin not to slow down until they saw the portal. As they ran, Erwin asked if he really thought the other hunters would chase them all the way to the first floor. Bjorn explained that it didn't matter. He was sure they were all headed the same way. He laid it out for her. A party of 4 was strong enough to go deeper, but they were hanging out near the exit. That meant they were planning to leave soon. He figured they were just killing time near the portal, exactly like they had been. Erwin was amazed by his thinking, but then she suddenly froze. She yelled that there was a group of goblins just ahead. They had to find another way around. Erwin yelled that they couldn't go around. The goblins were already running straight for them. Bjorn was shocked. He knew her detection ability always let them spot goblins first. Something wasn't right. He knew this couldn't be a coincidence. He yelled for her to follow him and immediately changed direction. Erwin started to follow, but then a bright flash of light shot past her face. Bjorn grabbed her and yanked her to the ground just as the projectile flew by. He knew instantly that shot wasn't from a goblin archer. He caught his breath and told her it was the hunters from before. Erwin couldn't believe it. He laid out the whole plan for her. The hunters had lured the goblins this way on purpose. Now they were waiting on the other side to ambush them. Bjorn saw right through their plan. The hunters were using the goblins to wear them down before attacking. He yelled at Erwin, telling her to use the special ability she just got. Erwin had no idea what he was talking about. Bjorn had to remind her about the monster essence she had just consumed. Turns out, each essence gives the user a special ability from the monster it came from. The goblin essence didn't just boost her stats like agility and stealth. It also gave her 2 new skills, one that adds poison to her arrows, and another called Thief Step, which lets her move unseen. Erwin started to panic, saying she didn't even know how to use it. But as Bjorn glanced over, something happened. Suddenly, a blue aura wrapped around her. The system announced that her Thief Step skill was now active. Bjorn was surprised. She hadn't done anything, which meant the skill must activate just by thinking about it. Even Erwin was amazed at her new power. Without wasting a second, he shoved his pack at her. He told her he would take care of the goblins by himself. Her mission was to use her new stealth skill to find the crossbowman who had fired at them. Erwin was worried. She asked if he was sure about going alone, warning him that it was too dangerous. Bjorn told her they had no time. He laid out the plan. Stay hidden, wait for his signal, and kill the crossbowman with 1 shot. He made it clear there would be no second chance. He told her to stay hidden until then. But before she could even ask what the signal was, he was already gone. He stopped in a clearing. This was the place. Just ahead, a group of goblins was waiting for him. He knew the crossbowman was still hiding after that first shot, so he charged right at the goblins to draw him out. His thinking was simple. Once he wiped out their front line, and the real threat would have no choice but to show himself. He counted about 15 of them. The barbarian was completely surrounded. He blocked 2 sword strikes at once with his shield. He figured since no arrows were flying, there were no archers in the group. He spoke too soon. An arrow slammed right into his shield. Suddenly, he had to watch for arrows from a distance, while a goblin tried to stab him up close. The attacks just kept coming, one after another, and he couldn't forget the adventurer with the crossbow, who could fire at any moment. Bjorn had to do all of this completely on his own. He was getting hit. The damage was starting to build up. He slammed his hammer into the ground, trying to catch his breath. He dropped to one knee, panting hard. This wasn't good. He was losing stamina fast. Just as he was trying to recover, he realized 2 shots were flying straight for him at the same time. One was an arrow, the other a heavy crossbow bolt. He knew exactly who fired them, the goblin archer and the adventurer with the crossbow. There was no way to stop both of them. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it now. He decided to block the crossbow bolt, putting all his effort into stopping the bigger threat. But while his shield stopped the bolt, the goblin's arrow slammed right into his elbow. He immediately knew it was poisoned. He could feel his entire arm going numb. His left arm was useless. He had to choose between his hammer and his shield. Without a second thought, he let the hammer drop to the ground. With his left arm completely numb, he made his choice. The shield was the only thing that mattered now. He knew the real enemies weren't these goblins. It was the other adventurers hiding in the distance. The warhammer would have crushed the goblins faster, but it couldn't stop the crossbow bolts, so he used his shield as a weapon instead. He bashed his way through the crowd, always keeping an eye out for the real danger. Just as he expected, another bolt came flying in, and he blocked it perfectly, but the goblins just kept coming. He was getting worn down, wondering how many more there could possibly be. Before he could even catch his breath, another wave charged straight at him. Finally, it was over. The last of the goblins scattered and ran, and he let them go. He had survived, but he wasn't alone. From the bushes, one of the adventurers watched in disbelief, shocked that the barbarian had taken care of all those goblins by himself. The adventurers finally stepped out from their hiding spot. Their leader looked down at Bjorn, admitting he was tougher than they had expected. Bjorn wasn't surprised at all. He told them he knew they were there the whole time and demanded to know where the crossbowman was hiding. The leader just smirked. He confirmed it was them, then asked what happened to the elf. Bjorn had no time for their questions. He told them to stop talking and just fight him. The leader seemed a little nervous. He admitted that barbarians shouldn't be taken lightly, especially after watching Bjorn take down all those goblins alone. But then he got a nasty look in his eye. He pointed out how badly hurt Bjorn was and offered him a deal. Give up the elf and they'd let him walk away. Bjorn just chuckled to himself. He couldn't believe they really thought he was stupid enough to fall for such an obvious trap. Seeing Bjorn's reaction, the adventurer got furious. He accused Bjorn of losing his mind and ordered his men to attack, deciding to beat the answers out of him instead. The leader warned his men not to let their guard down. He told them to treat Bjorn like a giant monster that needed to be hunted. With that, the entire group charged straight at him. Bjorn stood his ground, knowing his left arm was still useless. He needed to send a signal to Erwin, but it had to be something the people of this world would find strange. Suddenly, an idea came to him. He raised his hand, forming a gesture they would never understand. He grinned. This was the perfect signal. The adventurers froze, completely confused by the strange hand sign. Their leader yelled out, demanding to know what he was doing. Inside, Bjorn was worried. He had no idea if Erwin even recognized the signal, and she was too far away for him to hear a response. He had no choice but to trust her. With that, he let out a roar and charged straight into the enemy line. He met the first attacker head on, stopping the sword with a brutal shield bash. Seeing his man in trouble, the leader screamed for someone named Elias to get in there. Suddenly, a man in a straw hat leapt in, bringing his blade down with incredible force. Bjorn blocked the strike, but he could tell this guy, Elias, was on a different level. The power behind the attack was huge, but Bjorn knew he couldn't back off. His only job was to distract them. He just had to create an opening for Erwin to make her move. He held the line against Elias, but his mind was somewhere else. He was worried about Erwin. What if the crossbowman had already gotten to her? That's when it happened. A glowing arrow shot out of nowhere. Everyone on the enemy side froze, completely caught off guard by the sudden attack. The arrow slammed into an adventurer's shield, stopping him cold. The leader was confused. He couldn't tell who had fired it. Then it exploded with force. The leader realized it had to be her. It was Erwin. The leader started barking orders. He told his men to keep attacking the barbarian while he took care of the arrows himself. He grabbed 2 shields and formed a wall, taunting the unseen archer. Bjorn watched the enemy leader. He realized the man was planning to block all of Erwin's arrows by himself. With the leader tied up, the other 2 adventurers charged straight at him. The first attacker swung his sword, and Bjorn deflected it with his shield. He knew he couldn't take them both on at once. While he was busy with one, the swordsman in the hat moved in from the side. The blade sliced deep into his left arm. In that moment, Bjorn decided he had to give something up to win. His left arm was completely numb anyway. It was useless to him. So he came up with an idea. He would trade his unusable arm to take out the red-headed attacker. Ignoring the blade still in his arm, he smashed his shield into the other man's face. To him, it was a good trade. The man could only stare in horror, calling Bjorn a monster. But Bjorn's face was pure ice. The blow sent him flying, and he crashed to the ground hard. Bjorn hit the ground, the sword still embedded in his arm, but he was already looking for his next target. The swordsman who'd stabbed him just stood there, completely stunned by what he'd just seen. Their leader yelled at him to focus. He raised his shield, shouting that he would block the arrows himself. A moment later, a flaming arrow slammed into his shield. Bjorn's signal had worked perfectly. Bjorn mocked the leader, asking if he really thought he could block them all. Another arrow flew past, hitting the swordsman in the shoulder. The leader looked down. An arrow had gone straight through him. In his last moment, he finally understood. Erwin wasn't just some archer. She was a spirit archer. With their leader down, Bjorn turned on the others. He smashed his shield into the next man, who crumpled from the blow. The remaining adventurer started to panic. He realized this fight was a huge mistake. One of them decided to change his plan. He yelled that he was going after Erwin and took off into the woods. Bjorn knew chasing him would be a waste of time. The last man standing screamed at Bjorn to give up. He decided to trust that Erwin could handle the archer while he finished this fight himself. But Bjorn wasn't just defending. He dug his feet into the ground, getting ready. The swordsman with the straw hat charged forward, blade ready. He lunged, putting everything he had into one last strike. Bjorn didn't even bother with his shield. He just met the charge with a single, brutal punch that sent the man flying. The leader watched as his last man was sent flying. He was furious, screaming. He swung his massive sword with everything he had. Bjorn blocked the strike. He realized this guy was actually powerful, much stronger than the others. It didn't make sense why he was teamed up with such weaklings. The two of them clashed again. The leader was confident, thinking Bjorn had made a huge mistake. He mocked Bjorn for backing away, guessing he was just trying to stall for time. He promised that wasn't going to happen. He had a plan. He would fake a swing to throw Bjorn off balance, but instead of swinging, he let the massive blade fly right out of his hands. The sword spun through the air, heading straight for Bjorn. It was a surprise attack he might not be able to block. But Bjorn didn't just block the sword. He lunged forward and grabbed the leader by the collar. The man's eyes went wide, completely stunned. Bjorn was breathing hard, but he wasn't done yet. He pulled the man in close and drove his fist straight into his jaw. He was furious, refusing to believe he could die in a place like this. He grabbed the leader's head and just kept punching, screaming for him to die. When it was finally over, Bjorn was the only one left standing. He was beaten and bruised, but he had won. Just then, Erwin came running out from the trees, calling out to him. She looked terrified, asking if he was all right. She quickly added that she had won her battle too. She pointed out how bad his injuries were and handed him a potion, telling him to drink it quickly. She insisted he drink it, explaining it was the only way to deal with the poison. Bjorn reluctantly agreed, but in his weakened state, the potion slipped from his grasp and spilled onto the ground. Immediately, the poison surged through him. He felt like his insides were boiling. An unbearable pain shot through every vein, and his skin felt like it was on fire. Erwin tried to encourage him, but Bjorn's mind was already on something else. Through the pain, he managed to ask her what time it was. Erwin told him they only had 40 minutes left before the floor closed. They didn't even have time to rest. That's when Bjorn suddenly told her to strip. Her face went bright red, completely stunned by his words. She tried to rationalize it, but Bjorn quickly clarified he meant the dead explorers' bodies, not her. She let out a quiet of relief. With the clock ticking, Bjorn said they'd just take the equipment and backpacks. Erwin agreed to grab the gear from the other bodies, and they got to work. They scrambled to loot the bodies, and then ran as fast as they could. The minutes flew by, and the deadline was getting dangerously close. With less than a minute left, they finally saw it. A glowing portal, their only way out. Bjorn grabbed Erwin and yelled that they were going for it. They charged straight into the light. Just as the timer was about to run out, they leaped through the portal and disappeared. They made it. A message confirmed their success in entering the first floor. They were basically thrown out of the portal, with Bjorn landing in a heap. Erwin, on the other hand, landed perfectly and was already celebrating. She turned to him with a huge, happy smile, telling him he did a great job. Bjorn agreed, but he was more focused on how close they had cut it. He figured they only had about 30 seconds left to spare. That's when Erwin suddenly remembered something. She brought up the essence and reminded him that he'd promised her something earlier. He remembered, but he told her they didn't have time to talk about it right now. He said they could discuss it once they were out. Suddenly, a new timer appeared, showing only 10 seconds remaining. Bjorn started to panic, trying desperately to remember the name of a tavern. He was completely blanking, grunting in frustration as the seconds disappeared. Erwin just watched, confused. With just 1 second left, he finally remembered. He yelled out the name Black Whale and told her to meet him there. She agreed, just as they were both engulfed in light. A system message appeared. The labyrinth was closing. Everyone inside was being transported back to the city of Rafdonia. Bjorn let out a huge of relief. He took a moment to get his bearings. He was back, standing in a huge crowd of explorers who had also just returned from the labyrinth. The place was packed. It made sense, since every explorer who left the labyrinth was sent to the same spot. Still, the sheer number of people was overwhelming. He pulled out his watch. Time worked differently here. No matter how many days passed inside the labyrinth, you always came back to the city at noon the next day. He had to reset his clock. Suddenly, a loud voice cut through the noise. Tattooed Barbarian was yelling for him, calling him Jandel's son, Bjorn. But before he could reach Bjorn, the man got distracted, greeting another warrior named Karak. He mistakenly called him Vanon's second son, but Karak quickly corrected him. He was the third. More barbarians started gathering around them. They were all shouting greetings, happy to see that their friends had made it back alive. Karak was clearly popular. When asked how the labyrinth was, he just laughed and boasted that the monsters were nothing to him. The others cheered, praising his fighting skills. Bjorn watched from the side, annoyed by the whole scene. That's when one of the warriors challenged Karak to a duel of bravery right there at the checkpoint. Karak accepted instantly. The whole group roared in excitement and started running towards the checkpoint, with Karak yelling that he probably earned the most magic crystals anyway. One of the barbarians yelled for Bjorn to join them. He let out a heavy, but said he was on his way. At the checkpoint, warriors were cashing in their magic crystals. The first guy's total came out to just over 24,000 stones. The clerk kept counting for the others. Then Karak stepped up, and his total was almost 42,000 stones. The crowd went crazy. Everyone started cheering for Karak, calling him the best warrior there. Then it was Bjorn's turn. He dropped several huge bags on the counter. The clerk asked if they were all magic crystals, and he confirmed they were. She told him she'd calculate them. Her hands moved in a blur, sorting through the crystals so fast it surprised even him. In just a moment, she finished. The total was over 182,000 stones. The entire place went silent. Then someone yelled out that Bjorn had earned over 180,000 stones. It was the highest record of all time. Then the crowd realized it wasn't just the magic crystals. He came back with an axe, shoes, and a bag. A full set of gear. They couldn't believe it. People started yelling that Jandel's son, Bjorn, was the best warrior. The other warriors swarmed him, chanting his name over and over. The energy was insane, and he knew exactly why they were so excited. He was the first barbarian to ever go into the labyrinth with nothing and come back looking like a proper, civilized man. He played right into it, raising his weapon and roaring that he was the best warrior there. The warriors got so hyped, they lifted him onto their shoulders. A guard tried to tell everyone to quiet down, but it was no use. The guard just let out Anne and gave up. From a distance, you could hear people complaining about the loud barbarians at the checkpoint again. The city was buzzing with explorers who had just returned from the labyrinth. Bjorn decided to just stick with the other barbarians for now. He was still new to this world and figured it was the safest way to learn what to do next. But then he saw someone familiar across the square. It was Erwin. She was with a group of other elves, happily telling them that she thought she'd finally figured out how to work with spirits. Bjorn watched her with her elegant friends and then looked at the loud barbarians around him. He couldn't help but feel a little jealous. Just then, she looked over and saw him. She gave him a small, friendly wave. He mouthed to her that they should meet up tonight. She looked surprised for a moment, then nodded that she would. Over in the elf camp, one of Erwin's friends noticed her looking and suspiciously asked if she knew that barbarian. Erwin immediately panicked and denied it. At the exact same time, one of the barbarians with Bjorn asked him the same thing, if he knew that fairy. Just like Erwin, Bjorn quickly said no. The other barbarian was relieved. He shouted that he knew it, saying there was no way a great warrior like Bjorn would ever be friends with those cowardly elves. The elf woman heard every word of that insult. She was furious. Bjorn just stood there, completely annoyed with the whole situation. He couldn't believe this was happening. The two groups were just staring at each other across the square. He thought it was ridiculous, like some kind of bad play. Just then, a couple more barbarians walked up, and Bjorn hoped this meant they were finally done here. One of them slapped him on the back and yelled that everyone was here. It was time to get going. Bjorn realized it was impossible to talk to Erwin with all this tension in the air. He decided he'd have to find her later that night. Just then, a kid's voice cut through the noise, yelling for their dad. The explorer scooped his kid into a tight hug, both of them just relieved to see each other again. Bjorn remembered scenes like this from the game, families and friends, overjoyed to be reunited. But for every happy reunion, there was also heartbreak. A woman screamed for her husband, only to be met with an apology. A little kid called out for their brother, but he wasn't there. It was a scene of pure agony. People were on the ground, blaming themselves for not being able to save their friends. All around him, people were crying out the names of the ones they'd lost. He'd seen this countless times in the game, but seeing these faces, this pain in real life, it just felt weird. But that sad moment didn't last long. Soon, the entire place was filled with shouts for drinks. The barbarians, especially, were going all out, chugging their drinks like it was nothing. They weren't even sipping anymore, just pouring the stuff straight down. Bjorn just sat there, watching them. He thought they were all completely insane. He'd only stuck around because he thought there was some necessary step he had to complete with the other barbarians after returning. But it was clear there was no process. They were just getting wasted. He decided staying here was a complete waste of his time, so he stood up and said he had to go. But another barbarian grabbed him, completely shocked that he was trying to leave. Suddenly, the whole group was yelling. They were calling him the hero of the day and couldn't understand why he'd leave. Bjorn started to worry, wondering if they were actually going to try and stop him. Seeing that he was really leaving, the other barbarian gave up and just wished him luck, shouting his name. Bjorn didn't look back. He walked out into the streets, leaving the loud party behind him. Someone called out for him to wait, but he just kept going. He took a deep breath. It was peaceful here. There were no monsters trying to kill him, just people living their lives, talking about what to do for the evening. This place had laws and rules. It felt calm, predictable. He just stood there for a moment, taking it all in. He realized that if he fell down here, someone would probably offer a hand to help him up. It was a completely different world. This place might be another world, and way more brutal than his old one, but it wasn't all bad. But despite all that, he finally made it back to his room. He washed off all the dirt and blood from the labyrinth. For a moment, it felt peaceful. He thought that maybe living in the city wouldn't be so bad. He stepped out, feeling refreshed for the first time in a while. Completely drained, he just collapsed onto the bed. He stared at the ceiling for a second, then covered his eyes. But the quiet just made him face the truth. To be honest, all he wanted was to go home. He missed it terribly, even if there was no one there waiting for him. He finally woke up. It was late into the night. He figured he must have slept for about 4 or 5 hours straight. With his energy back, he remembered what he had to do. He needed to get to the Black Whale Tavern to meet Erwin. But when he asked for directions, the answer he got was not what he expected. The person told him that place had disappeared 10 years ago. The man looked at him, confused by the question. He explained that the original owner's son got into gambling, so both the name and the owner had changed. It was a shame, since it had been a popular spot for generations. Bjorn wasn't entirely surprised. This just confirmed that the world he was in was years ahead of the game he remembered. He asked for the new name, trying to recall it himself, and then it hit him. The tavern was now called Python Puth. He found the building and stood outside, ready to go in. He realized this was the place, but it looked completely different from how he remembered it in the game. At least he could read the language here, which was a relief. He made a mental note to visit a library later. He stepped inside. The tavern was loud and packed with people. He started scanning the crowd, trying to find Erwin. That's when he heard someone call out. It was Erwin, waving him over to her table. But she wasn't alone. The woman sitting with Erwin stared at him with a cold expression. She recognized him as the Barbarian from before. Bjorn walked up and introduced himself as Jandel's son. The woman didn't seem impressed. She just said she was Erwin's older sister. He asked if her older sister was her actual name. She told him to call her Teresia. That's when Bjorn realized Erwin's full name must be Erwin Fornaci de Teresia, and she just hadn't told him. Bjorn started to ask Teresia why she was there, but she cut him off. She slammed her hand on the table and said she had a question for him. She looked him right in the eye and demanded to know why he had asked to meet with a girl as young as her sister. Her stare was intense. She demanded to know why he would meet with Erwin so late at night, especially in a place like this. It laid into him. She accused him of calling Erwin to a place like this last night, only to stand her up and make her stay out all night. She called him a shameless barbarian for daring to show his face. Erwin just looked on, clearly worried. Bjorn was completely lost. He asked her what she meant by last night. Teresia didn't buy it for a second. She thought he was just playing dumb. Trying to clear things up, Bjorn turned to Erwin and asked how long it had been since they left the labyrinth. She quietly told him it had been about 30 hours. 30 hours. The number hit him hard. He had thought he'd slept for maybe 4 hours, not 30. He was completely shocked. Suddenly, it all made sense. He felt so refreshed because he hadn't just slept well. He'd slept for over a full day. Bjorn suddenly shouted an apology directly to Erwin. She just looked at him, a little confused by the outburst. He explained that he was sorry. He'd just been asleep the entire time. Both Erwin and her sister stared, completely stunned. Erwin whispered to Bjorn that her sister was in shock, questioning if she'd ever seen a barbarian apologize before. Teresia quickly recovered. She said she didn't expect a barbarian to be on time anyway. Then she got straight to the point, demanding to know why he wanted to meet with Erwin. Bjorn didn't back down. He told her he had his reasons, but he didn't have to explain them to her. If she was that curious, she could just ask Erwin herself. Teresia's expression twisted. She seemed to find his nerve interesting, especially coming from a beginner. He shot back, telling her that her attitude was the real problem. He said she should stop acting that way, unless she planned to take care of Erwin forever. Then, to cut the argument short, he slammed a huge bag of money on the table. He told them to take it. It was 350,000 stones. He explained that this was the amount Erwin had earned for the essences. For a second, he thought this felt just like a scene out of some TV drama, the kind where someone tries to pay you to stay away from their family member. Teresia's expression was cold. She asked him why he wasn't taking it. She accused him of having some other purpose, just like she'd thought. Bjorn ignored her completely and looked straight at Erwin. He asked if she actually agreed with her sister. He reminded her that their deal was simple. He'd help until she earned the amount of money she wanted. Erwin looked surprised, asking if that was really all there was to it. Bjorn confirmed it, adding that they'd also split everything 50-50. Erwin's face lit up. She looked like she was about to happily agree with him. But a moment later, her expression completely fell. She quietly apologized. Bjorn was confused, asking why she was sorry when they worked so well together. That's when Teresia stepped in. She announced that from now on, she would be the one going into the labyrinth with Erwin. She explained that letting her sister go alone was just a tradition for her first time. It was never going to happen again. Bjorn finally got it. He scoffed, realizing Erwin already had someone else to carry her. He hated that it all came down to personal connections. Teresia pushed the bag of money towards him again, telling him to just take it now that he understood. But Bjorn stopped her. He asked if the 350,000 stones was based on a 50-50 split of the loot. When she confirmed it was, he called her out. He told her they were short 280,000 stones because their promise deal was actually 90-10. Teresia just smiled, pretending she'd simply forgotten about the rest of the money. She pushed the rest of the 280,000 stones across the table. Bjorn was furious, realizing she had absolutely tried to scam him. He was completely disgusted. Now he understood why barbarians hated elves so much. He told her to get out, saying he still had things to discuss with Erwin. Teresia seemed shocked that he was dismissing her like that. That's when Erwin spoke up. She told her sister that she appreciated her worrying, but it was time for her to go. She still needed to say a proper goodbye to Bjorn. Teresia stared at her for a moment, then finally seemed to back down. She admitted that Erwin wasn't a kid anymore, but she wasn't done yet. She pointed right at Bjorn and demanded that he swear an oath. He had no idea what she was talking about. She yelled at him to swear that he wouldn't sleep with Erwin. If he promised, she would leave immediately. Erwin was completely flustered by her sister's demand. Bjorn, on the other hand, was just trying to understand the rules. He wondered if only sleeping with her was off the table. Teresia wasn't playing around. She screamed at him to swear it right then and there. So he did. Bjorn promised on his warrior's honor, even though he didn't really care about things like that. Erwin was just stunned by the whole thing. With that settled, Teresia smiled and said she was leaving. Erwin called out to her, still looking worried. But before she left, she stopped. She said she'd almost forgotten something important. She turned back to Bjorn with a little smile. She thanked him for saving her sister's life. After her sister was gone, Erwin just collapsed onto the table, completely drained from the stress. She looked up at Bjorn, worried. She explained that she'd never talked to her sister like that before, and asked if he thought Teresia was mad at her now. Bjorn told her not to worry. He pointed out that her sister was smiling when she left, so she couldn't be that mad. Relieved, Erwin started to say something else, but then she remembered. She looked down and apologized. She thanked him for the offer to team up, but explained that she had decided to work with her sister a long time ago. Bjorn told her she didn't need to apologize. He said he completely understood, joking that he'd also jump at the chance to be carried by a high-level player. With that settled, she handed him a bag of money. She explained it was exactly 63,000 stones from the magic crystals and the crossbow, and that she'd already taken her own share. She also mentioned that the other two adventurers' backpacks were at her place, and that he could look through them tomorrow. Bjorn was impressed. She knew exactly what he was going to ask without him saying a word. It was a shame she wouldn't be his teammate. Then, Erwin asked how she could possibly repay him for saving her life. The question caught Bjorn completely off guard. She insisted, reminding him of her promise to pay him back, and that's when it finally clicked for Bjorn. He realized this was why her sister made him swear not to sleep with her. She was worried he'd demand something weird as payment. He thought about her offer, trying to decide what to do. Bjorn couldn't think of anything he wanted from her right then, so he just changed the subject and asked if she was hungry. Erwin said she wasn't hungry. Bjorn just shrugged and said he'd go ahead and order for himself. She was quiet for a second, but then it looked like she'd made up her mind. Suddenly she shot up and excitedly said she wanted a drink. She explained that she had purposely avoided alcohol yesterday, just for this. She told him she wanted to share her first return drink with him. The phrase clicked for Bjorn. He remembered it being a tradition in the game. She explained that for fairies who live in shrines their whole lives, the first return drink is a really big deal. When he just stared at her, she told him he was supposed to say thanks. So, he awkwardly thanked her. She beamed, saying it was only right. After everything they'd been through together in the labyrinth, she felt they should share this. She added that, of course, this probably wasn't his first return drink. But Bjorn surprised her by saying it was his first one, too. Erwin was completely stunned. She asked if he was really only 20 years old, too, and not just joking around. Bjorn just smiled and admitted that it was his first time in the labyrinth too. With that settled, their food arrived. It was a huge meal, enough for both of them. Erwin raised her mug with a huge smile. She told Bjorn he did a great job. He returned the compliment, saying she did great too. They clinked their mugs together in a toast. A little while later, the plates were empty. Erwin playfully pointed out that he was wearing a shirt for once. Bjorn just shot back that she was wearing a skirt. Bjorn decided that was enough small talk, and it was time to get to the important stuff. He took a huge drink from his mug as Erwin watched. Impressed, Bjorn leaned forward, his tone suddenly serious. He reminded Erwin that she'd offered to repay him earlier. He told her he'd thought of a way. Erwin looked a little taken aback. She asked him what he had in mind. He leaned in close and whispered that they couldn't talk about it here. He warned her that security would get involved if they did. Her eyes widened. She was clearly trying to figure out what he meant. Then a sly smile spread across her face. She asked if they should just go to her room, quickly deciding that it sounded like a good idea. Behind the closed door of Erwin's room, Bjorn's voice could be heard telling her to spread wider. Erwin's voice came back, full of effort, saying she couldn't. Turns out, he was just stretching her arm. Erwin screamed that he was dislocating her shoulder. Bjorn grunted, admitting it was hard to control his strength and that her arm had never bent back this far before. As she cried out, Bjorn just asked if she was sure. She screamed that she was positive, even swearing on her family. Hearing that, Bjorn finally let go and told her to rest. Erwin was just relieved to be alive and still have her arm. Bjorn, on the other hand, was already analyzing the results. He noted to himself that a +4 flexibility stat didn't seem to do much in real life. She looked at him, finally understanding. She asked if he brought her to her room just to check his abilities. Bjorn admitted it was true. He explained that since using abilities is banned in the city, this was the only place he could test things. He just wanted to see how different the game mechanics were from real life. Bjorn thought about how complicated the game was. It wasn't user-friendly at all, and the stats were the biggest proof. Everything boiled down to 3 main categories: body, mind, and ability. But under those 3, there were thousands of smaller, more detailed stats. Things like height, weight, muscle, and bone strength were all tracked separately. Each one had a real effect. For example, higher stamina meant you could carry more gear and hit harder in a fight. This complexity was why 2 characters with the same overall stats could be totally different. It took him thousands of hours of playing just to understand the basics. In fact, even after playing for 9 years, there were still some stats whose effects were a complete mystery to him. He silently cursed the game developers for it. And one of those mystery stats was obsession. It was a stat that came from the monster essence Erwin had eaten. All he knew was that it was part of the mind stat. He turned to Erwin and asked if she'd felt any different since they got back. He tried to be more specific. asking if she'd been overthinking things or getting impatient. Erwin paused to think, then admitted she wasn't sure. She finally had an answer for him. She said that she'd been eating a ton of cookies since they got back, which was really weird for her. That clicked for Bjorn. He figured the obsession stat must increase desire, which would explain why it seems so useless in the game. He started thinking about all the other new stats he didn't know about, but Erwin grabbed his sleeve, pulling him out of his thoughts. She told him she was getting sleepy. Bjorn still had more he wanted to check, but he decided to let it go for the night. He agreed it was time to sleep, and they put out the candle. He was just about to fall asleep when his eyes shot open. He'd just remembered something. He remembered Erwin's sister telling him not to sleep with her. He figured it didn't matter. She probably meant the other kind of sleeping together. The next morning, they laid out all the loot they'd gathered from the labyrinth. Erwin was amazed by how much there was. She asked if he planned on selling it all, and he told her he'd sell everything, except for a few key items. She immediately spotted a leather outfit and a belt she wanted. Bjorn agreed, but told her the cost would come out of her share of the money. She was more than happy with that deal. They took the rest to the market. The merchants were practically throwing money at them, offering hundreds of thousands of stones for the gear. As the clerk added everything up, the numbers just kept climbing higher and higher. The final total was insane. They had earned 1,450,000 stones. Erwin couldn't believe her eyes, asking if this was even real. After subtracting her share, Bjorn realized he'd made 1,400,000 stones, way more than he ever made his first time in the game. He just smirked. It was a very nice start. With their business concluded, Bjorn told Erwin it was time for them to part ways. He didn't understand why she looked so surprised. He figured there was nothing left for them to do together. Erwin looked disappointed. She pointed out that they were heading the same way, so they might as well walk to the central square together. Secretly, she just wanted to be with him a little longer, so they walked on together. As they approached the square, they noticed a huge crowd had gathered for some reason. They stopped, trying to figure out what was going on. That's when Bjorn saw it. A city guard was shouting at everyone to stay back. It was a public execution. A terrified man was locked in a guillotine, waiting for the blade to drop. An official announced to the crowd that these people hadn't committed any serious crimes, like murder or arson. Their only crime was failing to pay their taxes. With the announcement made, the executioner pulled the lever. This city, Rafdonia, is the last one standing in a world destroyed by a witch's curse. The only way for anyone to get resources is by going into the dangerous labyrinth. The ground is littered with the gear of those who never made it back, and that's the city's simple, brutal rule. If you can't pay your taxes, you're executed. It's just their way of getting rid of another mouth to feed. The second the blade fell, the crowd surged forward, screaming and fighting to get to the front. They were dipping bread into the blood on the ground and then eating it. Erwin was completely disgusted. Bjorn explained there was a local legend that you'd get financial luck if you drank the blood of the executed. Then he turned to her and asked how much the taxes were for the first year. She told him it was 700,000 stones for non-humans. Bjorn noted that it was a bit different from the game, but close enough. He then asked what the tax was from the second year on. She said it jumps to 800,000 stones, plus fees for exchanging money. It was exactly like the game. Bjorn knew the taxes would only get higher each year. He had to get a lot stronger, and he had to do it fast. If he couldn't go back to his old life, and he wasted his time here, he'd end up just like the guy who was executed. His blood would be the one on the ground. To avoid that fate, he had to save money. He needed to become strong enough to reach at least the 6th floor of the labyrinth. That was the only way to survive in this world and avoid execution. So, he went to the library. It was huge, way bigger than he expected. In the game, this place was always under construction. People were staring, and he figured it was probably weird to see a barbarian in a library. That's when he noticed someone else at a nearby table. He recognized her. It was Einar, the daughter of some important person. He couldn't believe it. He wondered what she was doing here. He reached out and poked her head to wake her up. Einar's eyes slowly opened. She looked up, a bit confused. Her expression changed when she recognized him. She called him by his full name and said she was glad to see he was okay. She shot up from her seat and yelled the greeting right back at him, just as loudly. Her shout echoed through the quiet library, turning heads. Bjorn quickly told her to keep her voice down. Einar apologized, explaining she was just surprised to see another barbarian in a place like this. After a moment, Bjorn just sighed and asked what she was doing here. She explained that his advice from before, think before she acts, had stuck with her. She figured that to think properly, she needed to learn more things first. Bjorn was impressed. He realized she was definitely different from the other barbarians he knew. Einar continued, saying her time in the labyrinth taught her that monsters weren't the only enemies. Bjorn listened carefully. He knew that most barbarians would just brag about their fights, but she was actually thinking about what happened. Something must have gone wrong for her down there. She admitted that she decided to study, but the book wasn't making any sense. Reading was way harder than she thought it would be. So, she decided she was going to visit the shrine and have the elders teach her how to read and write. Bjorn asked if she was leaving right then. She said yes, explaining that if she waited, she'd probably forget all about it. As they walked, she sighed, saying that barbarians were a sad species. Then she stopped, suddenly remembering the promise she'd made to repay him. She told him that if he ever needed help, he should come find her at the Angry Bull Inn. She promised she'd do her best to help him out. Bjorn just looked at her for a moment, then calmly agreed. He thought to himself that he hoped she wouldn't forget that promise in a couple of days. And with that, Einar turned and walked away. As she left, Bjorn started thinking about what he needed to do next. He had a feeling he'd be taking her up on that offer sooner rather than later. His next stop was the library. The place was huge, and he had no idea how he was going to find the one book he needed. Then he spotted someone sitting at the main desk. He figured she must be the librarian. Turns out she was sleeping on the job. He cleared his throat to get her attention. She slowly stirred from her nap. She looked up at him and asked what he wanted. He told her he was looking for a book and asked where he could find ones related to history. Instead of answering, she just closed her eyes and started casting some kind of spell. A purple light began to glow around her. The magic shot out and wrapped around Bjorn. He was completely caught off guard, wondering what she just did to him. He asked her what the spell even did, but she just yawned. She explained that if he walked around now, he'd be able to find the books he wanted, but he couldn't borrow any. Before he could even ask another question, she was already nodding off again. He just stared at her, completely confused. She was already fast asleep. He couldn't believe it. He decided to just walk around like she said. It didn't take long for him to figure out how her magic worked. A book on one of the shelves started glowing brightly. He picked it up and realized what was happening. The spell was highlighting any book related to the topic he was thinking about. It was like a magical search engine. He finally understood. With magic like that, this huge library only needed one person to run it. He opened the book, ready to get some answers. The first book was called Fallen World. It told a story from thousands of years ago about a land so cursed that no one could live there. A powerful witch was behind the curse. Only one place, a fortress called Rafdonia, managed to survive the disaster. To save their starving people, the royal family opened a path to another dimension. That's how the labyrinth was created. Bjorn realized it was almost exactly the same as the game's introduction. The second book was about alchemy. It explained how magic crystals from monsters could be turned into everyday things like bread, water, and even steel. He couldn't make sense of the complicated science behind it, so he decided to just memorize everything for now. He breezed through a third book about the war between barbarians and fairies, but it was the fourth book that really got his attention. This was the one he had been looking for. It was called Evil Spirits of the Abyss. The book explained that an evil spirit was someone from another dimension who takes over someone else's body. He thought to himself, well, that was a perfect description of him. The book didn't explain why it happened, but it was clear that both the royal family and the temple were ruthless when it came to hunting down evil spirits. Bjorn smirked. So, as long as he didn't say certain banned words, he'd be fine. It was a useful tip, considering he was exactly what they were hunting. He moved on to the fifth book. It was about the death of the first king, Levigen III. The book said he died 150 years ago. That's when it all clicked. The game he played started the day after the king died. This world was 150 years ahead of the game's timeline, which explained why his knowledge was so outdated. The next book was called Dimensions Instability Observation Records. He frowned, wondering if this was the same book the blonde guy who saved him had been reading. He remembered the knight telling him that what he went through was extremely rare, but the book had a theory. It said that entering a portal at the exact moment it was closing might be the cause of the instability. So it was his own fault. The thought was so depressing. He decided he was done thinking about it for now. He decided he'd read enough for one night. It was already dark outside. Lying in bed, he thought about how much time had passed. It had already been 3 days since he left the labyrinth. A month in this world was 30 days. Since the labyrinth opened on the 1st, that meant he only had 27 days left to prepare. His mind was made up. Tomorrow, he would start looking for a new party member. Suddenly, his eyes shot open. Someone was pounding on his door, yelling for him to wake up. He recognized the voice. It was Erwin. He got up and opened the door, asking what she was doing there so early in the morning. But before he could even finish his sentence, a wave of green energy hit him square in the face. Erwin was ecstatic. She explained that after 10 tries with a spirit stone her sister bought, she had finally succeeded in making a contract. She held up the little green creature, proudly adding that it was a wind spirit, which would work great with fire magic. Bjorn just stared back. He simply told her she was lucky. A spirit stone was an item that let you contract a spirit, but the chance of it working was only 10%. Bjorn realized how much money that must have cost. If she really tried 10 times, her family had to be rich. He'd seen enough and told her to get rid of it, but Erwin protested, saying she hadn't even shown him everything it could do. The little spirit was already trashing the place. Bjorn glared at her and asked just how much more of a mess she planned on making in his house. His angry tone snapped her back to reality. She panicked and immediately apologized, promising to clean everything up right away. The little wind spirit got right to work, zipping around the room and cleaning up the mess. In just a moment, the place was spotless. Erwin announced she was all done, and Bjorn had to admit she was a lot faster than he'd expected. Bjorn congratulated her on the spirit contract. She was so happy she was practically glowing, but then he got serious. He told her she shouldn't have wasted her time coming to him, and that she should be preparing for her next trip into the labyrinth. His words caught her completely off guard. She stammered, admitting that he was right. But she explained that she had come running straight to him because she wanted him to be the first person to know. Bjorn realized what was happening. Because he was her first ever teammate, she felt some kind of special bond with him. He decided that kind of emotional connection was a problem, and and their relationship should be kept strictly business. But then he changed his mind. He put on a friendly face, figuring it was smarter to stay on her good side. He told her he planned on staying in town permanently, so she could always find him if she ran into any trouble. His words hit her hard. He had called them comrades. Her expression completely changed. She happily agreed. Bjorn thought to himself that it was always good to have connections. With that settled, a new countdown began. He had 26 days until he had to go back into the labyrinth. He knew exactly how he was going to use that time. His first stop was the Angry Bull Inn, the place where all the barbarians stayed. He stepped inside, taking a quick look around. The moment he was spotted, the whole place erupted. Everyone started shouting his name, calling him the strongest warrior. He just stood there, thinking they were as loud as ever. One of them caught up to him and asked what he was doing there. He offered Bjorn a place to stay for just 300 stones a night. Bjorn immediately wondered why it was so cheap. The man explained that 10 warriors were crammed into a single room, sharing 5 beds. He said they could make room for one more, but Bjorn already knew the answer to that. Bjorn told the man he wasn't looking for a room. He was there to see Einar. The barbarian corrected him, explaining that Einar was Fenelon's second daughter, not the third. Just then, the barbarian spotted her. He yelled out that Jandel's son, Bjorn, was here to see her. Einar walked over, looking confused. She asked why he was looking for her. Bjorn didn't waste any time. He told her he had a favor to ask. He wanted to fight her for training. Einar thought about it. She knew she wouldn't be able to survive a real duel based on pure skill alone. She pointed out that this didn't really sound like a favor. She was right. They could just go to the training field where plenty of people were sparring. Bjorn realized he probably didn't need to ask her for this after all. But then, Einar spoke up. She agreed to fight him anytime, as long as it wasn't in the mornings. That was all he needed to hear. Bjorn told her they would begin right away. A crowd gathered quickly, buzzing with excitement. Einar and Bjorn were going to fight. Bjorn got into his stance. He was here to learn, but he had no intention of losing. Einar didn't waste a second. She brought her huge sword down with incredible force. Her eyes were filled with focus. The strike was perfect. And just like that, it was over. Bjorn was on the ground, completely beaten. The crowd roared, cheering for Einar as the new best warrior. Einar looked down at him and asked if he was okay. He admitted she was really good and that this was a good way to spend his time. He wasn't done yet. Wiping the blood from his mouth, he told her he wanted to go again. The second round started instantly. This time, Bjorn was ready for her attack. They fought again and again. Every time he lost, Bjorn just got back up and demanded another round. By the time they finally stopped, it was late into the night. Bjorn was on the ground, completely out of breath. Einar was tired too. She asked if he wanted to keep going, but admitted she needed a break. Even on the ground, Bjorn knew she was incredibly strong. He finally called it a day and praised her for her hard work. He was thinking that she was different, smarter than other barbarians, and probably someone he could trust. Bjorn asked her if she was planning on going into the labyrinth alone again. She said she probably would, since she didn't have the money to form a party. That was exactly what he wanted to hear. He realized this was his best option and extended his hand, asking her to be his teammate. Einar was shocked. Bjorn started explaining the deal. He would take 80% of the profits, but he'd pay for all the party fees. But before he could even finish his sentence, she cut him off. She told him there was no need to explain any further. For a second, Bjorn panicked, thinking she didn't like the conditions. He quickly started talking again, offering to pay for her equipment too. But before he could say another word, she grabbed his hand. She told him he didn't need to explain. She wouldn't understand it all anyway, but she trusted him. Bjorn smiled, relieved. He shook her hand and said he was looking forward to working with her. He finally had a friend. The next day, they headed to the Barbarian shrine. Einar was going to learn to read and write, and Bjorn had come along with her. An old barbarian greeted them, calling them by their family names. Bjorn didn't want to be here, especially because of this man, but he knew he had no choice. The elder mentioned it was rare for a warrior to return after leaving the shrine. He asked if Bjorn was there to learn how to read and write, just like Einar. Bjorn's answer was a simple no. The elder asked him what he was there for. Bjorn looked him dead in the eye and said he wanted the spirit seal. He then corrected himself, saying he wanted the undead's seal. Specifically, this wasn't just some random request. He knew this skill was incredibly powerful, and it was the key. So, in this world, every species has its own special thing and unique trait that sets them apart. Fairies, for example, can borrow power from spirits. Dwarves get a special blessing that makes their equipment better. And beast-like people can team up with ancient spirit animals. And finally, there are the barbarians. Their unique trait is something called the spirit seal. The elder looked surprised, then suspicious. He got right in Bjorn's face and asked how he knew about it. He pointed out that it wasn't something a young warrior should know. This was exactly what Bjorn was afraid of. The elder was getting suspicious again, but it didn't matter. Bjorn had already prepared for this. He'd gone to the library specifically to find information on the spirit seal, just in case. He looked the elder right in the eye and calmly said he read about it in a book. The elder's suspicion vanished instantly. He started laughing and slapped Bjorn on the back, completely impressed. He said he'd heard the seals were used in the war against the fairies and thought it was amazing that Bjorn learned about it just by reading a book. The elder was beaming with pride. He told them he was proud of both of them and that there was no sin to deny a warrior who asked for a spirit seal. But then came the catch. The elder explained that getting a spirit seal required a massive payment of 800,000 stones. He looked at Bjorn with a challenging grin, asking if he really thought he could afford something like that. Without skipping a beat, Bjorn said he'd pay for it. Einar couldn't believe what she was hearing. Bjorn remembered this part from the game. The price was the main reason it was so hard to get early on. He knew that the higher your rank, the more rare items you needed on top of the money. Getting it now was the only smart move. So, he pulled out several large bags of coins. He told the elder he had one bag of 500,000 stones, and 3 more with 100,000 each. He had the money. The elder was completely stunned. He grabbed Bjorn and demanded to know where he got so much money. This was the exact question Bjorn had been waiting for. He already had his excuse ready. A smirk spread across his face. He actually would have been disappointed if the old man hadn't asked. Bjorn explained that he got lucky and found a hurt fairy on the first floor of the labyrinth. He told the elder he used her like a slave to get magic crystals, and after feeding her an essence, he got a huge payment from her sister. The elder roared with laughter. He thought the story about the helpless fairies was the funniest thing he'd heard in a long time. He called Bjorn amazing for ripping off the earheads, as he called them. He said Bjorn was probably the first to ever do it. The other barbarians crowded around, all cheering. Turns out, they really didn't like fairies. The elder was so impressed, he told Bjorn he was giving him a gift for showing such great potential. Bjorn looked down at his hand. He couldn't believe it. The elder had given him back 200,000 stones. He had just earned a fortune simply by telling a story. To keep the act going, Bjorn roared that he would continue to rip off the fairies to become an even greater warrior. The other barbarians loved it, but inside, he couldn't help but smile. He was actually starting to like these guys more than he thought. With the celebration over, it was time for the ritual. The elder explained that a spirit seal was a strengthening technique. With the celebration over, it was time for the ritual. The elder explained that a spirit seal was a strengthening technique. It worked by making the body absorb the power of magical items. He said that's why all barbarians are tattooed as babies, to mark the pathways for that power. He gave Bjorn one last chance to back out, warning him that this choice was permanent. Bjorn sat before him, completely calm. He told the elder he was ready. He knew this immortal seal was the key to becoming the perfect tank. The elder announced he would begin, holding a sharp tool over Bjorn's shoulder. Bjorn just watched, thinking that any experienced gamer would have made the same choice. The tool lit up, shooting beams of energy onto a magic circle on the floor. Bjorn gritted his teeth as the power surged, but something wasn't right. He realized with a shock that he'd have to go through this every single time he leveled up the seal. The pain was absolutely brutal. He screamed as the magic burned into his skin, but it was worth it. The system confirmed the first level of the immortal seal was active. His natural regeneration and physical stats had both increased by a lot. Once it was over, Bjorn turned and thanked the elder. The old man just let out a strange, quiet laugh. Bjorn was confused. He couldn't figure out why the elder was laughing. Turns out, the elder was just surprised. He'd never seen a warrior thank a witch doctor before. That's when Bjorn realized his mistake. He'd acted too polite. He decided to get out of there fast before the elder got any more suspicious. He left the shrine and disappeared into the night. The next morning, Bjorn headed to the commercial district to buy the equipment he needed. His training with Einar had made one thing very clear. He was not a swordsman. He decided to focus entirely on shield techniques, so practicing with a sword would just be a waste of time. He walked into a shop and told the owner he was looking for a one-handed blunt weapon. The shopkeeper led him to a section full of huge, intimidating weapons, explaining that these were the kind barbarians usually preferred. But Bjorn wasn't interested. He explained that he wanted something more normal. A weapon that big was unnecessary for the weak monsters on the first floor. The shopkeeper offered him a different option. It was a simple, standard-sized mace. It was perfect. It cost him 220,000 stones. The moment he equipped it, the system confirmed his total item level had increased by 85. He also had to get a helmet custom made since none of the regular ones fit his head. He finished off with a half armor that fit perfectly. After spending a fortune, his new set of gear was complete. After buying all the gear he needed, he was left with only 50,000 stones. A lot of time had passed since he left the labyrinth. He had settled into a steady, daily routine. Every morning at 7, he'd wake up and have breakfast with Erwin. She always insisted on coming to his side of town, claiming the food was cheap and delicious. After that, he'd head to the library and read until 4 in the afternoon, trying to learn everything he could about this world. Then he'd eat dinner at a new place every night. It was the best way to overhear conversations and gather intel he couldn't find in books. This place was expensive and the food was terrible, but he didn't care. The information was what mattered. At about 5, he'd go to where the other barbarians lived for the last part of his day, and he would train, pushing his body to its absolute limit every single day. By the 7th day, he was dueling other barbarians, one after another. There were no real combat skills to learn, but fighting purely on instinct was exactly the kind of practice he needed, and the results were showing. The system notified him that his repeated training had improved his reflexes, flexibility, and eyesight, bumping his physical stats up by 1. All that effort meant he was now strong enough to sometimes win his duels against Einar. After one such victory, the other barbarians cheered his name. Even Einar gave him a friendly pat, thanking him for the match. She looked at him with a grin, admitting that he'd gotten a lot stronger. He knew she was skilled, but her fighting style had a predictable pattern. He'd mentioned it to her, but it was a hard habit for her to break. At 9, he'd head home to wash up, and like clockwork, Erwin would show up, calling for him to go eat dinner. He asked her if it wasn't tiring to travel an hour just to see him every day. She just laughed, telling him it wasn't a problem at all as she pulled him along. By the time they finished dinner, it was around 11. After that, Erwin would head back to her place for the night. She waved goodbye, cheerfully wishing him luck in the labyrinth tomorrow. He watched her go, thinking about how fast time had flown by. The day was finally here. He stuck to that same routine every single day, and a month went by in a flash. Now, there were only 24 hours left. All that training paid off. His physical stats and item level had shot up, making him way stronger than before. With the labyrinth about to open, he headed to the Explorer Guild. He wasn't alone. Einar walked in right beside him. He walked up to the counter and told the receptionist they were there to get Unity magic. The receptionist looked them over and asked if it was just the two of them. After they confirmed, she told them to place their hands on the crystal orb. The receptionist looked at the glowing orb and told them the price for 2 rank 9 explorers would be 15,000 stones. Einar was shocked by the price, but Bjorn knew it was necessary. Without this magic, they could end up on opposite sides of the labyrinth when they entered. Bjorn asked her how ranks were decided. She explained that it was based on the amount of essence in a person's soul, and that the price did go up for higher ranked explorers. A moment later, the process was done. The receptionist handed the orb back and warned them the magic would only be valid for the next 24 hours. With their business at the guild finished, Bjorn decided it was time to eat. When they arrived at the tavern, Einar was completely speechless. A huge feast was laid out on the table in front of her. Bjorn explained that he'd ordered the most expensive meal they had as a last celebration before entering the labyrinth. She couldn't believe it cost 800 stones and stammered, asking if she was dreaming. Bjorn just grinned, happy to treat his new partner. Bjorn encouraged her to try the food. She hesitated for a second, then took a big bite. The taste completely blew her away. Her eyes went wide as she shouted that it felt like she was dreaming. She started eating like there was no tomorrow, declaring she would work hard just so she could eat this meal again. Watching her, Bjorn couldn't help but wonder what her life had been like up until now. After their meal, they headed to the labyrinth. A massive purple portal swirled in front of a crowd of explorers. A message appeared, stating the entrance would open in 10 minutes. Bjorn looked up at the portal. Now that things weren't so hectic, he realized just how huge it really was. Suddenly, a group of young barbarians came running up, shouting with excitement. Their leader proudly announced they had made it just in time, praising himself for his great timing. Bjorn watched them with a tired expression. He figured they must have just finished their coming-of-age ceremony and wondered how rookies like them always managed to find their way here. Einar smiled, saying the sight reminded her of the good old days. Bjorn just thought to himself that for them, it had only been about a month. A loud announcement echoed through the area. The labyrinth was now open. The massive purple portal crackled with energy as a crowd of explorers prepared to enter. Einar was ready to charge right in, but Bjorn quickly stopped her, telling her to wait. He started to explain that he wanted to test a theory about entering the portal while it was unstable. Einar just smiled and cut him off. She said she probably wouldn't get it anyway and would just follow his lead. Suddenly, a guard shouted that there was only 1 minute left. Einar started to panic, asking if they should go in now before it was too late. But Bjorn was perfectly calm. He was just watching the portal, thinking to himself that it was getting a lot smaller. It was about the same size as when he'd entered last time. He was waiting for the perfect moment. As the guard gave the final warning that the gate would close soon, Bjorn's eyes narrowed. That was his signal. He yelled for Einar to go, and they both sprinted towards the shrinking vortex. The guard yelled for them to wait, warning them that it was too dangerous, but it was too late. They leaped straight into the crackling energy, just as it was about to disappear. He knew it. His gamble had paid off. They landed in total darkness. Einar started to panic, yelling that she couldn't see. Bjorn just told her to calm down, explaining they were in the dark region, but Bjorn was ready. He pulled out a torch and lit it, saying he'd brought them this time. Einar looked at him, confused by what he meant. The light revealed a strange stone monument on the floor. Einar pointed at it, asking what it was, but Bjorn just smiled. It was exactly where he expected it to be. He explained that the monument was a portal. It could take them straight to the second floor, and that's exactly what they were going to do. He grinned, thinking to himself that any expert gamer knows how to use bugs to their advantage. Bjorn reached out and placed his hand on the monument. A huge wave of energy exploded from the stone, surrounding them both. Einar's jaw dropped in disbelief. Bjorn just grinned, telling her it was time to go. A message from the system appeared. It said he was the first to open the portal and gave him bonus experience. That small bonus was just enough to push him over the edge. He leveled up, and his maximum essence capacity increased by 1. They stepped out onto dark, squishy earth. Einar was completely stunned, asking how he'd managed to do that. She said the chief told everyone it would take at least 3 days to reach the second floor. She just couldn't get over how amazing his trick was. Bjorn held up his torch, looking at the dead trees all around them. Faint crying sounds echoed in the distance. They had arrived in the land of the dead. Bjorn asked Einar if she could feel it too. She had no idea what he was talking about. He tried to explain the feeling, like something was filling him up from the inside. Einar's eyes lit up. She told him his spirit status must have increased and congratulated him. He finally understood. This was what leveling up felt like. Just like in the game, leveling up in this world came with a status screen. His combat index had already increased. Leveling up also meant his MP went up, and more importantly, so did the number of essences he could consume. Now that he was level 2, he could handle 2 of them. But Einar thought it was weird. They hadn't killed a single monster, So how did they get stronger? Bjorn explained that opening the portal counted as a special accomplishment, and he had done it on purpose. In this world, these were called accomplishments. You could only get the bonus once for each type of monster, so eventually it became really hard to level up this way. But there was a trick to break past that wall. It was called a speed run, and that's exactly what he had just pulled off. He realized the EXP from opening the portal wasn't in one-time bonus. If he used this trick right, it was an easy way to level up over and over again. He knew he had to keep this trick to himself. He had to take full advantage of it before other people caught on. He turned to Einar and told her their method was a secret. If anyone asked, she was to tell them it took 2 full days to get here. She looked a little confused, but agreed, and he knew he could trust her. He knew that experienced explorers would be arriving soon. They'd definitely get suspicious if they saw 2 rookies already on the 2nd floor, so it was best if they just stayed out of sight. He told Einar they needed to leave immediately. At this point, he was more worried about running into other explorers than any monsters, so he came up with a solution. He tied the torch to his helmet with a rope, calling it Barbarian Candle Mode. He knew other explorers did the same thing, but that didn't make it feel any less ridiculous. Einar was amazed that the torch wasn't hot at all. He explained that it was a magic tool that would stay lit for 3 whole days once it was turned on. This new area, the Land of the Dead, was filled with monsters that were way stronger than the ones in the Goblin Forest. But there was a big upside. No traps. For 2 barbarians who just wanted to fight, this place was perfect. They moved forward together, ready for whatever was coming. Suddenly, Einar's eyes widened. She saw something. She yelled out his name, warning him. Ghouls were crawling out of the darkness. He wasn't worried. He figured there were only 3 because it was the first day. By the 3rd day, there would probably be 3 times as many. Einar was actually excited. She said she was getting bored and went to take care of them herself. She moved like a blur, cutting through the ghouls in an instant. With a huge yell, she tore right through them. She was having the time of her life. She didn't even break a sweat. She bragged about how easy it was going to be. But then her face went pale and she screamed his name. A terrifying scream echoed through the chamber. Einar hid behind him, completely shaken. Bjorn calmly explained it was just a banshee and that they should ignore it since they don't usually attack first. She was still nervous, asking if it was really okay to just leave it alone. He told her their attacks wouldn't even work on it. Plus, if they started the fight, they'd get cursed, and that curse would stick with them, making the banshee hunt them all the way out of the labyrinth. The thought of being cursed terrified her. She looked at Bjorn, completely impressed, and said he was a wise warrior. She knew she'd made the right choice coming with him. Suddenly, Einar grabbed Bjorn and started screaming his name. She was completely freaking out about something she saw. He just struggled, telling her to let him go. Turns out, she was panicking over a group of skeletons that had just appeared in front of them. She froze, probably realizing she'd made a big deal out of nothing. Bjorn cleared his throat, trying to give her some advice. He started to tell her to aim for the core between their ribs, but she didn't need it. She was already tearing right through them. She turned back and asked if he'd said something. Bjorn just played it cool and said it was nothing, thinking to himself that he'd worried for no reason. A system message popped up, confirming they'd earned 1 experience point for the kill. After that, they traveled north for almost 8 hours straight. As they traveled, they started running into new kinds of monsters. First were the Elder Ghouls, which were twice the size of the normal ones. They also came across skeleton warriors, and even skeleton archers. But honestly, it wasn't that difficult. Since it was only their first day in, there weren't many of them, and Bjorn's fighting ability had grown a lot. For one thing, his new mace was the perfect size and weight. It let him crush skulls much more easily than his old hammer. The impact was just devastating. His new armor also made a huge difference. It was shaped like a vest, so he didn't have to protect as much with his shield, letting him fight more aggressively. And while his new steel helmet probably wouldn't stop a crossbow, it easily stopped arrows from these half-broken bows. The skeletons were nothing more than practice. Bjorn just casually swatted them aside. He knew he was great at destroying enemies, but he had to admit there was one other barbarian who was just as good. Einar was a storm of pure destruction on the battlefield. Every swing from her was just as brutal as his. Watching her fight, Bjorn thought about the barbarian's ancestral goddess. He had to admit, Einar was really good. He remembered at first. He didn't get why she shouted every time they were fighting, but now he was starting to understand. Turns out, it just rolls off the tongue. Einar was having the time of her life. She yelled out that this was so much more refreshing than fighting with Erwin. This was what a real barbarian party felt like. System messages started popping up one after another. They had defeated an elder ghoul and a skeleton warrior. Another notification confirmed they'd taken down a skeleton archer too. They were clearing the floor with ease. That's when Einar noticed the deep gash on Bjorn's arm. She called out to him, pointing out that he was injured. But Bjorn wasn't worried. He told her it would heal soon. As he spoke, the wound was already closing up, steam rising from his skin. Einar's eyes went wide with excitement. She asked if this was the effect of that spirit seal he got, and he just confirmed it was. The undead seal gave him incredible natural regeneration. It could heal a wound like that in about a minute, and it even helped his stamina recover faster. He thought back to getting the tattoo. It was incredibly painful, but there was no denying how effective it was. As they moved forward, Bjorn noticed the ground was no longer longer wet. The terrain was different here. He could hear a banshee's howling getting louder in the distance. He told Einar to get ready. He warned her that 8th rank monsters would be coming out soon. Suddenly, a horrifying sound echoed through the trees, and Einar panicked. But Bjorn was ready. He told her to get into position. It was a death fiend, a massive creature with 3 glowing red eyes. Einar remembered hearing stories about it. The creature supposedly eats light, which is why they never saw it coming. She admitted to herself that it was way scarier than she ever imagined. Bjorn reminded her of the plan, aim for the head. He told her there was no point in attacking anywhere else. Einar agreed, telling him she trusted him completely. The death fiend let out a furious roar and lunged straight at them. Without hesitation, Einar used Bjorn's shoulder as a springboard, launching herself into the air. She brought her sword down with everything she had, aiming right for its head, but the blade just bounced off. It barely left a scratch. He couldn't believe it. He thought to himself that it was like hitting solid rock. The death fiend wasn't hurt at all. It just got angrier. The creature swung its huge fist down, and Bjorn raised his shield just in time to block the blow. The force of the impact was incredible, sending Einar flying backward, but it worked. Bjorn knew he had the creature's full attention now. Einar's eyes shot open in disbelief. Her blade was just grinding against its skin, unable to cut through. The creature's red eye glared as it swatted her away like she was nothing. Her greatsword went skidding across the rocky floor. She scrambled back to her feet and yelled to Bjorn, warning him that this thing was incredibly tough. Bjorn knew this monster from the game. It was famous for its defense, but he never expected it to be this hard. The tiny scratch Einar's sword had left was already healing just a few seconds later. That's when he remembered. It was the Death Fiend's passive skill, body preservation. Just when things couldn't get worse, the Death Fiend started gathering dark energy. Einar stared in horror, asking Bjorn what was happening. Bjorn explained it was the Death Fiend's active skill. All around them, dead hands started clawing their way out of the ground. The skill was called Hall of the Dead. An entire army of ghouls was rising from the earth, ready to attack. They were completely surrounded. Einar looked at the horde closing in, realizing just how much trouble they were in. The Death Fiend let out a powerful roar as the ghouls clawed their way out of the ground. Its active skill was in full effect. Bjorn and Einar stood back to back, completely surrounded by the undead army. The skill was called Call of the Dead, but Bjorn had a plan. He yelled at Einar to take care of the ghouls first. He told her he would handle the Death Fiend alone while she cleared out the smaller enemies. Einar didn't waste a second. She charged straight into the horde of ghouls, ready to fight. With Einar busy, the Death Fiend turned its full attention to Bjorn. It swung its huge arm down, aiming to crush him. Bjorn planted his feet and raised his shield, catching the full force of the blow. The impact was insane, cracking the ground beneath him. But Bjorn held his ground, refusing to be moved. While Bjorn held the main boss, Einar was a storm of steel in the middle of the ghouls. She was completely focused on her task. She swung her greatsword in a massive circle, taking out a huge chunk of the undead army in a single move. It was over in seconds. She yelled out to Bjorn that she had killed all the ghouls. The last of the undead bodies dissolved into dust. With her job done, she announced she was coming to help him. She launched herself at the Death Fiend, aiming for its head again, but her blade just scraped against its tough hide, completely useless. Bjorn's voice cut through the noise. He told her not to get distracted. Done playing defense, Bjorn roared and smashed his mace directly into the side of the Death Fiend's head. The impact was huge. The creature stumbled backward, clearly hurt by the blow. A deep gash had opened up, and dark liquid started to pour out. Bjorn grinned, thinking that one felt good. He was sure it must have taken a lot of damage, since it was bleeding so much. But before he could celebrate, the creature swung its massive arm right back at him. He brought his shield up just in time, but he couldn't believe his eyes. The monster was perfectly fine. His mind raced. That was an attack that could kill a goblin in a single hit. And yet, the Death Fiend's wound had already healed completely, as if it never happened. Bjorn knew he couldn't attack fast enough to beat the monster's healing. He started to wonder if he should just give up and go after weaker monsters instead. But just then, Einar charged in. She wrapped her arms around the Death Fiend's leg, and Bjorn yelled her name in surprise. He watched her, his mind racing to understand her plan. That's when it clicked. She wasn't trying to hurt it. She was trying to throw it off balance. He shouted that it was a great idea, and immediately kicked its other leg with all his might. The plan worked perfectly. The huge creature lost its footing and began to fall backward. It slammed into the ground with a massive crash. The Death Fiend roared in fury, struggling to push itself back up. With the Death Fiend pinned to the ground, Bjorn stood over it and mocked its inability to get back up. A huge grin spread across his face. He raised his mace, ready to finish this. Einar was laughing just as hard. She said it reminded her of pounding rice cakes as a kid. Bjorn yelled that this was way more fun than his childhood trips. Einar shouted back, agreeing completely. Together, they just kept smashing the creature over and over. Einar wondered if this was what real barbarian hunting was like. Finally, the monster stopped moving. A message appeared, confirming they had defeated the Death Fiend. A moment later, Einar called out to Bjorn. She had found a massive, glowing magic crystal in the monster's remains. Bjorn glanced at it and calmly told her it was only worth 100 stones. Einar was floored. She couldn't believe a monster that tough would drop something so cheap. Bjorn pointed out that with the ghouls, the total came to 300 stones. Still, He had to admit it was a low price for risking their lives. Einar tried to put that number into perspective. She asked Bjorn how much the cream pie they ate at the inn cost, thinking it was around 300 stones. Her eyes lit up with a simple, brilliant idea. She realized she could eat a cream pie every single time they killed a death fiend. Bjorn just smirked, asking if that was really her way of counting money. Einar was totally fired up. She yelled that this was no time to relax. It was time to hunt. Bjorn agreed, thinking to himself that hunting with another barbarian wasn't so bad. It made him realize how passive Erwin had been, and for a second, he felt a strange pang of annoyance. And so, they began hunting death fiends all over the area. They perfected their strategy. First, they'd take out the legs to bring the monster down. Then they'd just beat on its head until it stopped moving. They spent the entire day hunting, taking down about 70 death fiends. Bjorn knew that in the early stages of the game, players usually just build their skills around whatever essence they find. After a full day of fighting, he decided they'd done enough, but he was specifically looking for a death fiend essence to work with his immortal seal skill. Even after all that hunting, they hadn't found a single one. He was starting to get worried. The next morning, they got right back to it. On the second day, the death fiends started appearing in pairs, but by now, they had a solid strategy, so it wasn't as bad as it looked. Their plan was simple. Knock one of the monsters down first, then work together to finish the other one. The only problem was speed. If they couldn't kill the death fiends quickly, they'd get surrounded by ghouls. When that happened, Bjorn yelled at Einar to run, explaining that the monsters wouldn't follow them out of their territory. Later that afternoon, things got even worse. Now the monsters were appearing in groups of 3. Bjorn knew that was too much for just the 2 of them. He told Einar it was time to go somewhere else. As the second day came to an end, they stopped hunting. Einar found some old ruins and asked if it looked like a good place to camp. Bjorn thought it was perfect. As they walked through the ruins, they suddenly stopped. They weren't alone. Another group of explorers was right there in front of them. The 3 men froze, their faces tense. They clearly weren't expecting to see anyone else out here. Bjorn just stared back silently. One of the explorers got defensive, demanding to know what he was looking at. But before he could finish, Einar stepped forward. Her voice was cold, as she told them to get lost if they had no business there. The explorers were completely stunned by her sudden threat. The lead explorer quickly stammered an apology. Then all 3 of them turned and ran off into the darkness. Einar turned to Bjorn. She said they had to move now that the others knew their location. She was firm about it, stating that humans can't be trusted. As they walked, Bjorn realized this wasn't the first time she'd said something like that. He started to wonder if something bad had happened to her during a previous exploration. He watched her walk ahead, lost in thought. He decided he'd have to ask her about it later. Bjorn was talking about finding a decent place to set up camp for the night. But as he spoke, Einar's head snapped up. She heard something. Then he heard it too. A faint voice pleading for help. The cries grew louder and more desperate. They both froze, listening to the sounds echoing through the dark woods. Einar looked at Bjorn, her face pale. She told him this wasn't the sound of a monster attack. She knew what it was. Someone was murdering another person. She was about to say they should run, but a bright light suddenly flared up ahead. A voice cut through the darkness, demanding to know who was there. They had stumbled upon a massacre. 4 bodies lay on the ground. Bjorn immediately saw the signs of a campfire and poison. This wasn't a fight. It was an ambush. And standing there, in the middle of it all, was a lone woman. Blood dripped from the dagger in her hand. She was the one who did this. The woman looked them over. Bjorn knew exactly who this was. Plunderers. They're people who professionally hunt other explorers. Instead of hunting monsters for magic crystals, they just loot equipment for profit. Of course, plundering is illegal in Ravdonia. If you're caught, the punishment is death. But Bjorn knew how little that meant out here. He remembered killing 6 explorers himself, even if it was in self-defense. No one ever investigated. As long as there are no witnesses, people outside the labyrinth will never know what really happened. The woman looked at them with a smirk. She asked if this was their first time seeing a plunderer. Her eyes scanned them both, and she recognized their race, barbarians. Bjorn knew this wasn't good. He'd never seen a plunderer that looked so professional. He started taking in the details. She was tall and thin, with red hair down to her shoulders and an injured right ear. He even saw the tattoo underneath her eye. All these traits should have made her famous. The fact that he'd never heard of her meant she was very, very good at her job, because she never left survivors. Einar's voice was tense. She warned Bjorn that the woman was incredibly strong. Bjorn quickly sized up the situation. He saw 4 bodies, all with high-end gear, and one was even a mage. These weren't rookies. They were probably active on the 5th floor at least. He looked closer. 3 of them had no visible injuries, just signs of being sick. They had been poisoned. The 4th one must have had some tolerance and put up a fight. Bjorn looked her straight in the eye and asked if she had been their teammate. She just shrugged, giving a vague answer as she started to pull at the dead man's clothes. He couldn't believe it. She turned her back on them completely and started looting the body. She clearly thought 2 beginner barbarians were no threat at all. Then he saw her put a giant sword into a small bag. It had to be one of those super expensive pocket plane bags. Einar was speechless. She couldn't even guess how much stronger that woman was compared to them. She looked over at Bjorn, completely stunned. Bjorn knew there was only one way they were getting out of this alive. Einar looked at him, ready for a fight, and asked if that was the plan. But Bjorn's answer was simple. No. He told her to run as fast as she could, and just like that, they turned and bolted. Their only option was to run. The plunderer just watched them go, completely unfazed. They were running for their lives. Bjorn knew they'd bought a little time, but he had no idea when she might decide to chase them. He kept his eyes forward, scanning the trees. That's when he started to see them. the marks he'd carved into the trees earlier. His escape route was working. Bjorn's plan was simple. Follow the signs he'd carved earlier and make a run for the first floor portal. But as they were running, they suddenly skidded to a stop. Something was right in front of them. It was another group of explorers, completely blocking their escape route. The leader of the group sized them up, surprised to see two barbarians out here. Einar didn't hesitate. She told them they were being chased by a plunderer and desperately needed their help. The man was suspicious, asking how he could be sure they weren't the plunderers. Playing his part, Bjorn roared back, swearing on his honor as a warrior that he was telling the truth. The leader seemed to consider this. He thought to himself that a warrior's pledge was a pretty good trick to get people on your side. But then he realized something. If they helped take down the plunderer, his group could take all the rewards. With a greedy look, he agreed to help. The leader told them to come closer, explaining he had a gnome ability that could hide them. He knelt down, activating the power. He promised that with this, no one would be able to notice them. He explained it was a powerful stealth skill that blended everyone into the environment. The only catch was that they couldn't move, but it would let them avoid a fight completely. The leader turned to his men with a smirk. He told them they'd gotten very lucky. His expression turned evil. He was thrilled that two barbarians had just walked right into their trap. A system window popped up. Both Bjorn and Einar had been hit with a skill called suppression. They were completely frozen, unable to move. The leader laughed, mocking them for being unable to move or even speak. That's when Bjorn understood. They'd been lied to. These guys were plunderers too. He instantly recognized the skill. It was suppression, an ability from a stone golem. It was exactly the kind of trap another group of explorers would set. Bjorn knew he had to take damage, even just 1 point, to break free from the paralysis. The leader of the plunderers mocked them, saying their 2 days of hard work were about to become his. One of the plunderers looked at Einar with disgust. He complained that it was a shame she was a barbarian, but his friend corrected him, saying it was even better. He reminded him how much barbarian hearts were worth. Einar could feel their disgusting intentions. The leader just laughed, telling her that glaring at him wouldn't do any good. He gave the order to kill them in 1 clean hit. He pulled out his dagger, confident he wouldn't fail. Bjorn stared up at him, a single thought running through his mind. Is this really how we die? With a cruel smile, the plunderer lunged forward to deliver the final blow, but Bjorn wasn't giving up. He knew if he could just do one thing, he might have a chance. He had one last crazy idea. He just needed to take a single point of damage. The plunderer's blade sank right into his neck, and just like that, the paralysis broke. Bjorn could move again, and the plunderer was completely shocked. He had pulled back at the last second, just enough to make sure the wound wasn't deadly. The plan worked perfectly. Before the plunderer could even react, Bjorn's hand was wrapped around his face. The man was terrified, stammering about what kind of monster could take a hit like that and keep going. His men just stared in horror. The leader screamed at them to get it together and attack, but they were too late. Einar was already on them, and her blade went straight through one of the men. As Einar moved on the other men, Bjorn suddenly yelled her name. The plunderer's eyes widened in shock as her blade cut across his neck. At the same time, Bjorn's head was glowing with power, but whatever he was doing, it was draining him fast. He finally fell to his knees, his strength completely gone. He told Einar he was leaving the rest to her. Einar saw him go down. Her shock instantly turned into absolute fury. She turned to the last man standing. He stammered, trying to back away, but there was nowhere to go. She didn't give him a chance to run. 1 clean swing was all it took. The man screamed as he fell. Einar just stood there, her face cold and empty. The fight was over. The last plunderer turned and ran for his life. Einar scoffed, but then she looked back. Something was wrong. She screamed Bjorn's name. She rushed over and saw the deep cut on his neck. He was bleeding everywhere, and she begged him to hold on. He was barely conscious, trying to say her name as his life slipped away. Einar swore she would get revenge for him, but at that exact moment, as his health hit rock bottom, a system message appeared for Bjorn. He'd unlocked a reward that permanently boosted his mentality stat. In her panic, she dropped the potion she was trying to use, but he didn't die. Later, he touched the new scar on his throat. He knew he was lucky. An item he'd bought, the immortal seal, was the only thing that saved him. Einar, on the other hand, was thrilled. She told him the scar was amazing, like a medal. Bjorn just looked at her, totally confused by her reaction. Bjorn thought about his injury. Not many barbarians could survive getting their throat pierced, even with their massive build. Einar was ready to move. She told him to grab his equipment so they could go after the guy who ran away, figuring he couldn't have gotten far. But just as they were about to leave, something flew out of the darkness. Bjorn caught it just in time. It was a poisoned dart. The man they were chasing suddenly collapsed in front of them, and standing in the distance was the other plunderer, the woman. She calmly told the two barbarians that their fight earlier was pretty impressive. They were stunned. She had been watching them fight her own partner this whole time. Bjorn knew they couldn't run anymore. He yelled Einar's name, preparing her for what was coming next. With nowhere to go, they turned to face her. The fight wasn't over yet. The plunderer just stared back, completely unfazed. Bjorn knew there was no talking their way out of this. Without hesitation, both he and Einar charged forward, weapons raised. They knew they had to fight her. There was no other choice. Einar swung first, putting all her strength into a single, massive attack. But the plunderer didn't even flinch. She met Bjorn's attack head on, and the impact sent a shockwave through the air. For the first time, she looked surprised. She couldn't believe how much power was behind his strike. She decided that if she couldn't knock him down, she would just push him back with everything she had. Bjorn held her in place, creating the perfect opening. He yelled for Einar to make her move, but Einar didn't move. She was on the ground, completely frozen. Bjorn was on his knees, his strength completely gone. He couldn't understand how she'd managed to pierce his armor with just a small dagger. Then a terrible thought hit him. If she was an aura user, they had no chance of winning this fight. Turns out, while Bjorn was struggling, the plunderer had already made her move on Einar. The strike was incredibly powerful, sending Einar flying backward. She collapsed to the ground, coughing up blood. Bjorn could only watch in horror, screaming her name. The plunderer just looked down at him. She told him to give up, explaining that a basilisk's paralytic poison was already spreading through his body. He knew it was true. She was stronger, faster, better in every way. He started to think they were really going to die here. He was about to argue, to say anything to change this, but the plunderer suddenly made an offer. She told him if they swore to never speak of what they saw, she'd let them live. Bjorn was completely stunned. She explained that letting them go was her plan from the start. She had no interest in killing barbarians. In fact, she said she owed them a debt. That's when it all clicked for Bjorn. She wasn't just watching them fight her partner earlier. She was hoping they get killed so she wouldn't have to do it herself. Einar, struggling on the ground, tried to warn Bjorn not to trust the woman's words. She was sure the plunderer was just messing with them. Bjorn ignored the warning. He looked her right in the eyes and asked what would happen if he refused. The woman's answer was simple. If he refused, she'd kill him. She said it was part of a promise. When Bjorn asked who she made the promise with, she cut him off, telling him it was none of his business. He had no other choice. He agreed. A small flame appeared on his helmet as he knelt and swore on his honor as a warrior. The plunderer watched him, commenting that he was unique. Then, without a second thought, she pressed a burning torch to her own arm, sealing a wound. With that done, she turned her attention to Einar, who was still on the ground. She asked if the barbarian woman would swear the same oath. Einar refused. She screamed it. The plunderer just calmly accepted her answer, but Bjorn was stunned. The woman said she had no choice then. She raised her dagger, ready to strike Einar down. Bjorn's mind raced. He knew the plunderer wasn't bluffing. At this rate, Einar was going to die. He screamed at Einar, begging her to just swear the oath. The plunderer paused, her blade still raised, looking over at him. Einar looked up at him, completely confused by what he was asking her to do. She tried to argue, explaining that a warrior's pledge was sacred, but Bjorn screamed back, reminding her that she promised to do whatever he said. He begged her to just trust him. He yelled that her ego was pointless. What good was honor if she died for it? Einar fell silent. She looked down, his words hitting her hard. Finally, she gave in. She agreed to swear the oath. The plunderer watched her, then said she had one question for them. As Einar knelt to make her vow, the woman asked them what floor of the labyrinth they were on. The plunderer paused for a moment, considering their question. Then, as she turned and walked away, she gave her answer, the 8th floor. Bjorn's mind raced. The 8th floor. That meant she was an explorer on a level they couldn't even imagine. They had only survived because she let them. He watched her disappear into the darkness, knowing they were completely outmatched for now. But Einar wasn't scared. She yelled after the woman, promising that next time, things would be different. With the plunderer gone, they moved on. A system message appeared, announcing they had entered the 1st floor crystal cave. They dropped down into a massive cavern filled with a strange blue light. Einar hit the ground hard, tumbling onto the crystal floor. Bjorn stood over Einar and asked if she was okay. She was still on the ground, admitting that she was hurt. But it wasn't just the fall. She was furious with herself, feeling like she didn't even have the right to complain about pain. She was ashamed for swearing on her honor just to survive. Bjorn tried to snap her out of it. He told her that the strongest warrior is the one who survives, and now they had a chance to win next time. He kept it simple, reminding her he wouldn't understand if she said too much. His words seemed to get through to her. She looked up, saying she thought she understood what he meant. She figured that having to endure so much shame must be what makes someone a strong warrior, just like him. Bjorn just stood there, sweating. He didn't feel any of that stuff. He wasn't even a real barbarian. He just looked out into the darkness, sure that one day they would get their revenge. They finally sat down to rest. Bjorn had been awake for 20 hours, and after everything they'd been through, he was completely drained. But even so, he couldn't bring himself to sleep. He admitted to himself that he felt awful, not as bad as Einar, but still completely drained. The feeling reminded him of a time he was saved by a group of adventurers, specifically a blonde-haired warrior. He remembered how the priestess refused to heal him. Instead, the swordsman just tossed him a potion, like he was throwing away trash. He had to take that potion like a dog just to survive. He was happy to be alive back then, but he never forgot that feeling. He swore to himself he would never be that weak again. So what went wrong? He thought about it. He had always made the best choices he could in any given situation, and that was the problem. He was only ever focused on surviving the present moment. But what else could he do? In this world, just staying alive took everything he had. He remembered the moment he first arrived in this world. The very first thing he saw was someone getting killed right in front of him. Everything was so insane that he had no choice but to focus on one thing, staying alive. But he finally understood. Just surviving wasn't enough anymore. He looked down at Einar, his mind made up. It was time for a change of plans. He asked her a serious question. What if there was a way for them to get stronger? But it came with great danger. Einar didn't even hesitate. She said they'd probably die anyway if they didn't get stronger, so it didn't matter. This life was full of chaos no matter what. She believed it was better to attempt attack first. Hearing that, Bjorn knew they were on the same page. He told her what they were going to do. They were going to enter the rupture. Instead of running from chaos, they were going to run straight into it. He figured what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The system confirmed they'd taken down a gnome and a wolf. Bjorn was surprised to see 4 different types of monsters in one area on the first floor. Einar explained that's exactly why no one ever came here. She said fighting 4 types of monsters at once in the dark was a huge pain. People only came through here to save time, never to actually explore. But Bjorn saw it differently. An unpopular place was the perfect spot to hide something important. That's when Einar spotted a glowing stone tablet and asked what it was. He told her it was a memorial, built for the very first person to ever discover this labyrinth. The inscription honored someone named Difflin Grondel Gabrielius, calling him the last wise man. Bjorn recognized the words instantly. It was the exact same quote from the game. He realized this meant the secret condition to unlock the rupture was probably the same too. He turned to Einar and told her he was about to open the rupture, but he warned her that everything from this point on had to be a secret. Without hesitation, she swore on her honor as a warrior. She then asked him what a rupture even was. He explained it simply. It was a labyrinth hidden inside another labyrinth. He explained that in a game, this would be called an instance dungeon. It's a special place that only a few chosen people can enter and clear together. He told her that to open the first floor's rupture, they had to place magic crystals from 4 specific monsters on the memorial stone. They needed one from a goblin, a gnome, a ghoul, and a razor-mane wolf. But there was one last piece. The final ingredient was a magic crystal from a powerful 8th rank monster, one that could only be found on the 2nd floor. With all the crystals in place, a massive, dark portal tore open right in front of them. Bjorn yelled for Einar to get ready to go in. He knew that the Death Fiend's crystal opened a dungeon with a capacity of 5 people. The difficulty would change depending on who was in the party. He wondered who else would be pulled in with them. A message from the system appeared, confirming that he had successfully entered the first floor's rupture. This was the rupture. Basically, a rupture is a labyrinth hidden inside another labyrinth. They pop up randomly on each floor and have a cooldown period before they can be entered again. For this one to open naturally, it would have taken at least 3 months. Waiting that long wasn't an option, so people figured out how to force them open with magic crystals. There are 4 different ruptures on the first floor. The one he had just opened was a special one. The sky was blood red, and a massive, dark castle stood before them. This was the blood-tinted castle. Einar was completely overwhelmed by how huge it was, but Bjorn wasn't surprised at all. He knew that using the Death Fiend's magic crystal would lead them straight here. Even though he'd seen it in the game, it was still a lot to take in, but he wasn't worried. The good thing about first floor ruptures is that they're always beatable, no matter how hard they seem. The real question now was who else would be pulled in with them. The party members for a rupture are chosen automatically. That's when Einar yelled out a warning. Someone else was arriving. Einar demanded to know who it was. Bjorn just stared, waiting to see who the rupture had pulled in with them. But the scene shifted completely. Miles away, back in the crystal cave, Erwin was getting scolded. Her little fire spirit floated beside her as someone told her she'd used her magic again. The other elf told Erwin that she couldn't just rely on her bow and spirit. She insisted that Erwin had to learn how to defend herself up close with a dagger. Erwin tried to argue back. She explained that Mr. had told her to focus on what she does best and to trust her teammates to do their part. The other elf admitted that sounded nice in theory, but she said the real world wasn't so kind. She grabbed Erwin and looked her right in the eyes. She told her that a teammate is just a teammate and warned her not to put too much value on them. Erwin just quietly agreed, but she still insisted that Mr. wasn't a bad person. Trying to change the subject, she asked if they could go to the 2nd floor. She figured Mr. was probably up there, making a ton of money without them. The other elf explained her plan. She told Erwin that just hunting on the 2nd floor wasn't going to cut it. To get strong fast, they were going to enter a rupture. Erwin was confused. She thought getting into a rupture was just a matter of luck, and that even a lot of experienced explorers never got the chance. But the other elf had it all figured out. She explained that the last one opened 8 months ago, which meant the first floor's rupture was due to open any day now. Erwin realized Mr. had never told her anything about that. The elf just scoffed. She said that was to be expected, calling the barbarian a beginner who was probably climbing the floors in the slowest way possible. She grabbed Erwin's shoulder and promised that in just a year, she'd be much stronger than him. But halfway through her sentence, a loud, vibrating sound cut her off. Her eyes went wide. She knew exactly what that sound was. It was the rupture. Right in front of them, the air itself seemed to crack open. A huge, dark red portal tore through reality. The elf screamed at Erwin to run. Without hesitating, they both turned and sprinted away from the portal, but they weren't fast enough. The portal's energy reached out for them. The other elf cried out as something grabbed her arm, pulling her back. Before Erwin could do anything, her friend was dragged straight into the swirling darks. In an instant, they were somewhere else entirely. The elf looked around the strange, dark place and wondered if they were too late. Meanwhile, Einar and the other barbarian watched as the first of their new party members started to appear. A tough-looking dwarf stepped out of the light with a grin. He seemed excited to see 2 barbarians on his team. Then, They turned to see who the second person would be. A woman in a mage's robe appeared. She looked around once and immediately knew where they were, identifying the place as the blood-tinted castle. Bjorn couldn't believe it. A mage. He was even more surprised that a mage would be on the first floor. They were usually way too powerful for this level. The dwarf seemed happy with the new team. He thought having a mage was a pretty good start. Einar didn't get it. She turned to Bjorn and asked what the big deal was, reminding him that the librarian was a mage too. Bjorn explained that the librarian was a 9th rank mage. He told her mages are a huge resource for the city, so only the ones who prove their skills are allowed to enter the labyrinth. The mage overheard him and smiled. She was impressed, commenting that he was pretty knowledgeable for a barbarian. She introduced herself as Alua Raven, a 6th rank mage. Bjorn thought she seemed a little full of herself, but he remembered the mages from the game were way worse. Then, the man with the huge backpack bowed. He introduced himself as Tarjan, a professional carrier that Alua had hired. The last person to join them was a dwarf. He introduced himself as Hikarod Marad, an explorer with 3 years of experience. Bjorn figured that explained his nice gear. Bjorn gave his name, and Einar proudly shouted her own right after. With the introductions over, Alua got straight to business. She asked why a group this powerful was messing around on the first floor of the labyrinth. The dwarf admitted he couldn't share the details, but he'd heard a rupture was opening. The mage said she'd heard the same thing. Bjorn understood immediately. They all knew about the rupture, but no one was going to say how they found out. Alua took charge. She announced that the loot would be divided among them, excluding her carrier, Tarjan. She then asked if everyone would follow her orders. The dwarf quickly agreed, saying it was just common sense to follow the mage's lead. Bjorn knew he had to agree. Mages were the ones who pushed the idea of executing evil spirits, so he couldn't risk making one an enemy. But just as he was about to accept, Einar shouted that she disagreed. Everyone froze. Bjorn couldn't believe what he was hearing. Einar pointed right at Bjorn and demanded that he lead the party. She yelled that he was a warrior wiser than anyone, and that he was no normal barbarian. It was the worst possible thing she could have said. Bjorn was panicking, trying to get her to stop talking before she got him killed. But she wasn't done. She added that he reads for 6 hours a day. The dwarf was shocked, muttering that a reading barbarian was definitely unique. Einar completely lost it. She screamed that Bjorn wasn't just unique, he was great. She pointed right at him, yelling that his name was Bjorn, and he was a great warrior. The dwarf and the mage just looked on, completely stunned by the whole thing. I just stood there with my hand over my face. All I could think was, please, just stop. Suddenly, the dwarf started laughing. He said he was jealous, and that it was great to be so respected by one's wife. Einar immediately freaked out, yelling that she was not his wife. The dwarf kept teasing her, but that's when the mage, Alua, stepped in. She told everyone to stop messing around so they could get going. I was so relieved the conversation finally changed. It looks like Alua wasn't really interested in me, which was perfect. I just had to hope she'd never focus her attention on me for the rest of this trip. The dwarf, Tarjan, spoke up, saying they should probably know each other's skills before just leaving. But the mage, Alua, cut him off, asking if that was really necessary. She explained that the monsters in the blood-tinted castle were all 7th rank, or lower. In her mind, she and Tarjan were the only ones strong enough to matter. Einar was clearly furious. You could see it on her face. I just stood there, watching this whole mess unfold. And then she added one more thing. She announced that she'd be taking all the loot from the Guardian for her research. The dwarf looked like he was about to explode. I knew this was coming. Fights over loot happen all the time in Dungeon and Stone. He screamed at the mage, asking if she really thought he was an idiot, and I knew exactly what was at the heart of this argument. It's always about money. He swung his hammer right at her. The Guardian's loot is the main prize here. For a well-off mage like her, it's just an item for research. But for explorers like us, that loot is how we survive. It's our money. The mage tried to calm things down. She offered to give the dwarf all the regular magic crystals that dropped in the rupture, but I knew she'd just made it worse. She just confirmed this was all about money. The dwarf wasn't having it. He screamed that she was just trying to give them leftovers. The mage looked completely shocked by his reaction, asking if her offer wasn't fair. She was clearly shaken. It looked like she really didn't expect anyone to stand up to her. I couldn't believe she was that naive. So they started negotiating, just the two of them. They were splitting up the Guardian's essence and some other item, even deciding to roll a dice for the rupture stone. Just like that, Einar and I were cut out of the deal completely. I wasn't about to let that happen. There was no way I was leaving here with nothing. I stepped up and told them my terms. They could have the essence and the other items, but Einar and I were taking the rupture stone. The mage just scoffed, calling me greedy. She even questioned if they really needed 2 barbarians in the party. The dwarf immediately shot me down, saying the stone was too much. It didn't work. Turns out the mage wasn't so nice, after all. I acted like I was giving in. I told them fine, they could have the rupture stone, but in exchange, Einar and I would take 2 of the other essences instead. The dwarf and the mage finally agreed to my terms. It was settled. The mage confirmed the agreement, telling the dwarf to keep his promise. I could tell she only agreed because she figured the loot here wasn't worth much anyway. Just like that, they were back to acting like everything was fine. With the loot sorted out, they were suddenly all smiles and ready to fight. I just watched fine. With the loot sorted out, they were suddenly all smiles and ready to fight. I just watched them, thinking about how dangerous people like them really were. Watching them, I realized something important. I needed to get a lot stronger. I didn't care about people trying to pull others down. I was going to climb to the top, no matter what it took. A message appeared from the system. We had officially entered the blood-tinted castle. The system explained that the brutal citadel had 4 main parts. The first was the drawbridge leading into the keep. The second part was a large courtyard surrounded by the outer walls. The third was an underground dungeon inside the castle. And the final area was a demon sanctuary deep within the Lord's chamber. As the party walked up the steps toward a massive door, Einar pointed out 2 huge gargoyle statues guarding the entrance. I knew exactly what these were. Gargoyles. They were tier 8 monsters that stayed perfectly still, just like stone statues. But the moment they spotted an enemy, they would wake up and attack without warning. Their most dangerous ability was petrification. They could turn their enemies into solid stone. The only way to beat them was for one person to act as bait, letting themselves get turned to stone. That's when Einar shouted my name, telling me to be the tank. But that whole sacrifice strategy was pointless if you had a mage in the party. Artena just grinned, completely confident. She immediately began casting her spell, her magic lighting up the entire area. It was a spell to reverse petrification. The stone around me cracked and shattered instantly. The gargoyle let out a shriek. Without its ability to turn enemies to stone, it was basically just a big, slow target. The dwarf and Einar immediately moved in for the kill. With the first one down, he roared that there was only one left and charged the second gargoyle. The last gargoyle collapsed to the ground, its stone body crumbling. The dwarf raised his weapon and brought it down hard, finishing the job. The system announced their victory, but for all that work, they only got 1 experience point. With the battle over, the party stood among the glowing remains of the gargoyles. The dwarf was impressed, telling everyone they fought well. Bjorn watched him, thinking the dwarf was a better fighter than he expected. He was smart about it, crippling the monster's leg before going for the head. Suddenly, one of the mana stones lifted into the air. Someone yelled out Bjorn's name, completely shocked. Turns out, it was the mage, Artena. She explained she was using a spell to collect the loot and would hold on to it for now to save time. With that settled, the group moved on, heading through a dark doorway. The dwarf pointed out how dark it was. The mage just smiled and told him to leave it to her. Artena cast a spell, and a bright light filled her hand, pushing back the darkness. The light revealed what was waiting for them. A whole crowd of disgusting, fleshy monsters stood in their way. The system identified them as stout undeads. The problem was, they gave no experience points or mana stones. Killing them was basically a waste of time. Artena figured their attacks were as weak as bug bites, so she decided to save her magic. The dwarf agreed it would be a waste of spells. The undead didn't wait. They let out a growl and rushed forward. But Einar was faster. She let out a war cry and charged straight into them. Her giant sword cut through the monsters like they were nothing. She finished with a huge downward slam that sent a shockwave through the room. While Einar handled the crowd, the dwarf focused on the commander, bringing his hammer down for the final blow. The hammer landed with incredible force, completely crushing the enemy. As the monster fell, he noticed something drop. It was a war horn left behind by the undead commander. Einar was amazed by its size and asked what it was for. The dwarf just laughed, telling her she would find out soon enough. With the undead cleared, they reached a massive steel door. The dwarf admitted his hammer couldn't break it, but Artena said this was her turn. She chanted the words of a spell, unleashing a huge explosion of fire right at the door. The blast was so powerful that everyone had to shield their faces from the heat. The dwarf stared, completely stunned by the power of that spell. The massive steel door was completely gone, reduced to a smoldering archway. Artena just stood there, unfazed. She just smiled, told everyone to get moving, and commented on how overpowered mages can be. With the path clear, they finally reached the entrance to the keep. The system announced it was the first chapter, the drawbridge. But just as I thought, there was a problem. The drawbridge was up, completely cutting off the entrance. That's when Artena turned to Einar and asked her to use the war horn they had picked up. Einar looked surprised, but agreed. Einar took a deep breath and blew into the horn. A deep, powerful sound echoed across the entire area. A message from the system popped up. It said they had just activated some kind of protective magic that had been cast over the keep. Einar's eyes went wide. The sound from the horn had triggered something she didn't expect. With a deep rumble, the massive drawbridge began to lower. As it moved, they got a clear view of the moat below. It wasn't filled with water, but with what looked like a pool of blood. Then she saw something moving in the water. Hands started reaching up from the surface, confirming this place was exactly as dangerous as its name suggested. Artena just smiled, telling her not to worry. She said they were only stout undeads. Einar quickly denied being afraid, but her face told a different story. Just then, the first of the undead pulled itself onto their platform. The objective here was simple. A message from the system appeared, telling them to hold their ground until the drawbridge was all the way down. A whole horde of them began crawling onto the bridge. Holding off this many monsters at once was going to be incredibly difficult, but Artena just grinned. She said that for a party with a mage, this was a completely different story, and she was more than prepared. She called for everyone to gather around her. She explained that one mage with area of effect spells was all they needed to get through this part easily. She raised her staff and unleashed her spell. Storm of Blades. A massive wave of energy exploded from her staff. The magical blades shot forward, tearing through the air. Undead Horde had no chance to react, as the spell tore right through through them. In an instant, it was over. The entire horde of undead was wiped out, their bodies covering the bridge. The dwarf chuckled in amazement. He couldn't believe how easily she'd handled them, saying the undead were no threat at all. I knew she was powerful, but this was on another level. Compared to her, I felt like a little kid who just learned how to walk. Artana smiled, saying all they had to do now was wait for the drawbridge to come down. She was surprised to have any spare time at all. A moment later, a loud rumbling sound echoed through the area. The massive drawbridge was finally lowering. With the path open, the party began to walk towards the castle. Just like that, the first part of the brutal citadel was over. He walked silently, thinking about what just happened. They had cleared the entire stage without breaking a sweat. They crossed the drawbridge and walked right into the outer courtyard. Normally, this place would have been swarming with enemies, but they met no resistance at all. Turns out, another horde was waiting for them inside. So the mage raised her staff and cast her spell again. Storm of blades. A huge wave of magical energy shot forward, tearing right through the crowd of monsters. Bjorn watched the destruction. He knew it was a terrifyingly powerful spell, even if it didn't kill every single monster this time. About 90% of the horde was gone in an instant, but one creature, a huge death fiend, was still standing. It was tough enough to take the hit without flinching. The mage smiled, telling the others that it was their turn now. Bjorn called out to Einar. She grinned back, and the two of them charged straight into the fight. Einar and Bjorn didn't waste a second. They slammed into the death fiend with a powerful double tackle. The force of their attack sent the monster crashing to the ground. Watching from the side, the dwarf muttered about what a strange but effective pair they were. That's when the mage, Yahello, stepped in. She raised her staff and unleashed a powerful curse. Purple energy wrapped around the death fiend. The spell was designed to make any wound it received much, much worse. The thing is, the death fiend's greatest strength was its ability to regenerate from almost any injury. But with that power completely shut down by the curse, it was helpless. The dwarf laughed, saying it was now just a piece of meat waiting to be carved. The monster vanished, leaving behind a glowing item that dropped right into a pouch. Einar turned to Bjorn, completely amazed. She admitted that now she finally understood why everyone respected mages so much. The dwarf laughed, admitting that having a mage in the party completely changed what they were capable of. The mage, Yahello, proudly explained that her power came from countless hours of research, though she admitted she was naturally talented too. Watching her, Bjorn figured her out. She was young, passionate, and loved to brag while trying to seem humble. She then asked if they could help her find some research materials in the courtyard. Both the dwarf and Bjorn immediately agreed, saying it was the least they could do. Bjorn knew exactly how to get on her good side. Thanks to their help, she got what she needed in no time. She asked if they were ready to head to the next location. As they walked, Einar stared at the huge loaf of bread Bjorn was carrying. The mage just told everyone to get going, but something felt weird to Bjorn. He wondered why the other parties had cleared out all the monsters and ingredients, but left one specific thing behind. He couldn't believe it. Did they really not know? The item was just sitting there, right underneath the statue by the fountain. He knew that most gamers, like him, had a habit of checking anything that looked even slightly out of place. It was that curiosity that helped him find countless secrets in Dungeon and Stone over the 9 years he played. He knew he had to be careful. It would look really weird for a simple barbarian to know something a smart mage didn't. He decided to keep his mouth shut and avoid any suspicion. With that decided, the party moved on, walking through the ruined castle. They finally made it inside the inner castle. The mage, Yahello, commented that she'd heard it was in bad shape, but this was way worse than she expected. She looked around, noticing that there wasn't a single monster in sight. She decided they should just keep moving and head to the next part of the dungeon. Bjorn found the way forward and started to open a massive stone door. The mage was practically bouncing with excitement. The heavy door creaked open, revealing a dark path leading down. As they stepped inside, a system message appeared. They had just entered the first floor of the underground dungeon. The dwarf asked the mage, Ms. Raven, what kind of monsters they should expect to find here. She listed off a whole bunch of them, ending with something called an undead golem. The dwarf grinned. He said he'd fought all of those monsters before, except for the undead golem. Turns out, it only shows up in this specific dungeon. He was thrilled at the idea of fighting a new monster. Raven warned him to watch out for its flesh burst attack. The explosion itself wasn't a big deal for them, but its acidic blood could kill you instantly if you were too close. She seemed confident she could prevent that, though. The dwarf laughed, saying how great it was to travel with such a good mage. Raven just complimented him back, but Einar wasn't buying it. She remembered them arguing about how to split the treasure just a few minutes ago. Einar pointed at a small skeleton rat scuttling nearby and asked Bjorn if it was one of the monsters. He confirmed it was a skull rat, just like the mage had mentioned. The mage overheard and chimed in, explaining they were weak monsters they could just step on. Einar shot her a dirty look and snapped that she wasn't asking her. Raven looked a little annoyed by that, but before anyone could say anything else, a terrifying shriek echoed through the dungeon. Einar completely panicked. She grabbed onto Bjorn, screaming that it was a banshee, and there it was, a horrifying ghost floating right in front of them. Raven grinned and warned everyone to be careful not to touch the banshee. She explained that touching it a few times was okay, but too much contact would lead to something horrible. The dwarf was terrified, but Einar just called them childish. The dwarf demanded to know what she meant. Bjorn stepped in, saying he'd heard mages had a special way of dealing with them. Raven looked pretty happy to hear that. He then asked if she learned that from a book, too. She looked genuinely surprised by his question. Deciding she was done playing around, Raven stepped forward. She announced she would take care of them and began casting a spell. One of the monsters let out a furious roar. The banshee's shrieked as they swarmed down towards her, but she was ready. She unleashed a massive wave of fire, engulfing everything in flames. With the monsters gone, Raven calmly asked if they were ready to continue. Bjorn couldn't help but think that mages were just on another level. The party dropped down into the darkness below. A message from the system appeared, announcing they had reached the second floor. This new floor was filled with twisted creatures, like the Chimera Wolf and the Ghoul Lord. It wasn't just the monsters. The whole place felt like a mad scientist's laboratory. The dwarf admitted that the worst was still to come. He turned to Raven, surprised at how well she was handling all the disturbing sights. Raven explained that years of studying anatomy had made her used to things like this. She stopped at a solid brick wall and announced that they had arrived. She told them she had memorized a map that showed a secret door right here. She also warned them to be ready because an undead golem was waiting for them on the other side. Bjorn knew exactly where she would have gotten that map in the game. He was impressed by her preparation. Raven then told everyone to leave their heavy backpacks there before heading inside. She asked Bjorn to light the torch on his helmet. As it flared to life, she told the party to get ready. The door was opening. The secret door opened, and what we saw on the other side was a nightmare. The room was filled with mountains of bodies, all piled on top of each other. The smell of decay was so strong, it felt like a physical wall. I knew right away that if I was still in my old body, I would have passed out the second I stepped inside. But this barbarian body was different. It was strong and tough, and it was the only thing keeping me on my feet. Not everyone was handling it so well. The carrier, Tarzine, was the first to break, getting sick from the awful smell. A moment later, the mage Raven was right behind him. Turns out, all her research on bodies made her used to seeing gruesome things, but it didn't prepare her for the smell. The dwarf looked over at me and Einar. He was glad we were handling it okay, and told us we needed to keep moving. So we pushed on, stepping through the filth on the ground. But as we moved deeper into the darkness, we saw it was just more of the same. We stopped dead in our tracks. In front of us was a mountain of bodies, but then one of them started to move. A hand reached out, and a faint voice whispered from the pile. The entire pile began to rise. It wasn't a pile at all. It was one giant creature made of people. It started talking to us, asking where it was and saying it was hungry. Then its voice changed. It started screaming for help, crying out for its father. The dwarf and Einar were completely frozen in shock, but I wasn't scared. I was just trying to figure out what was going on. A system message popped up, confirming this was the mid-boss, the undead golem. It was screaming that it was in pain, begging for someone to kill it. I remembered this boss from the game, but it was never this loud or this real. There was no time to think. I yelled for everyone to stay on their guard, but when I looked over, the dwarf was just standing there, trembling. He was completely frozen in fear. And it wasn't just him. The mage and the carrier were paralyzed too. After all their talk about being experienced, they were totally useless. I couldn't believe it. It looked like I was going to have to carry them all on my back again. The golem's voice was a mix of pain and pure rage, screaming for us to just die. At least Einar had snapped out of it. She stood beside me, weapon ready. But with the rest of the team still useless, I knew I had to think of something fast, or we were all done for. Even though Dungeon and Stone was a super niche game, it had a few things that were actually pretty popular. One of those things was its black and white in-game art. The drawings just felt so real. In fact, screenshots of that art became famous as memes. More people knew the memes than the actual game. But standing here now, I realized something. It doesn't matter how real those pictures felt. They don't even come close to the real thing. The creature was screaming, begging for someone to end its pain. The mage, who'd studied bodies, the veteran adventurer who'd seen countless monsters, and the swordsman who acted so tough. They were all useless. They all treated me and Einar like we were just replaceable baggage. But the only ones with the insides to actually fight this thing are the two of us. Einar was screaming at the others, but it was already too late. The golem had started throwing things. Her eyes narrowed. She saw the attack coming straight for them. It was launching pieces of itself, aiming right for the others who were still frozen in fear. Einar moved fast, yanking the dwarf out of the way just as the green stuff hit the ground. But she wasn't quite fast enough. The acid splattered right across his face. He screamed in pain, completely blinded. Just like that, the dwarf was out of the fight. I looked over at the mage, who had been so confident. She was still on the ground, getting sick, absolutely useless. I had to take control. I yelled for Einar to pull the dwarf back and protect the mage. It was up to me to get the monster's attention. Otherwise, we were all done for. With the others useless, I had to take charge. I let out a roar and charged straight at the monster. But I wasn't just blindly rushing in. I knew this thing's attack patterns from the game. For enemies at a distance, it throws pieces of itself like bombs. I blocked the first one, but I knew what was coming next. For anyone who got close, it had a different move. It would try to pull them in and just devour them whole. I dug my heels in, fighting the pull. Getting dragged in meant it was over. But there was a bigger problem. If I tried to be clever and hide in its blind spot, the monster would immediately switch targets and go for the mage. Since she was still down, that would be the end for all of us. I had to keep its attention on me. The plan was simple. Maintain the perfect distance and just buy time until the mage was ready to fight again. And just like that, the mage was back on her feet. She took a deep breath and started chanting. A massive wave of fire erupted from her staff, completely swallowing the golem. Einar and I just watched. I couldn't help but be impressed. Every time I saw magic like this, it was just incredible. The heat was intense. The mage's spell did more damage in seconds than I could have done in an hour. With just one attack, she had completely burned away the golem's outer skin, ending the first phase of the fight. But it wasn't over. The flesh melted away, revealing what was underneath. A giant, screaming skeleton. This was the second phase. I yelled at Einar to move. I told her to charge in and aim straight for its ribcage. The undead golem was a tier 7 monster. This wasn't going to be easy. I remembered this from the game. Once its armor of bodies was gone, 2 barbarians could take it down. With a final war cry, we both charged in for the last strike. Our combined attack completely shattered the golem. A system message popped up, confirming we defeated it and gained 3 experience points. I was catching my breath when something started to form where the golem fell. Einar asked if it was what she thought it was, and I confirmed it. It was the essence of the undead golem. We both just stared at it. A find like this was huge. The thing about rifts is that they're basically treasure vaults. They're filled with elite monsters you can't find anywhere else, and they drop loot that most adventurers can only dream of. But the real prize, the reason everyone risks it all, is the monster essence. The drop rate for it in a rift is way higher than normal. I looked at the glowing core. Something felt off. For how deep we were, it was weird that this was the first essence we'd found. The rest of the party just looked up at us, waiting. They wanted to know what we were going to do next. Technically, the essence was ours. Einar and I did all the work, and we'd agreed on the terms beforehand. But this wasn't what I was looking for. I had 2 other essences in mind. I was hoping for the Death Fiend essence for its healing power, or the Chimera Wolf essence for its raw strength. I never even considered finding the undead golem's essence. That tier 7 boss was a one-time thing, only found in the Brutal Citadel. Still, the stat bonuses were perfect for a tank. It gave huge boosts to pain resistance and bone strength, plus some poison resistance and strength. The only downside was a small drop in awareness, but the other gains more than made up for it. The increase to bone strength meant a direct boost to my physical defense, and the extra weight would make me much harder to knock around in a fight. The stats were great, but the skills were the real problem. It granted something called Flesh Burst. It lets you detonate a part of your own body to deal massive damage. Basically, you're trading your own life force for an attack, which is a terrible deal. And then there was the second skill, Acid Fluid. It turns all your bodily fluids into acid. So every time you get hit, your own gear starts melting. The essence was powerful, but it would cost a fortune in repairs and potions just to use it. I let out we could figure out what to do with the essence later. Right now, we needed to heal the dwarf. The loot wasn't going anywhere for at least 30 minutes. The dwarf looked up, his face full of relief. He said he didn't know how to thank us, admitting he would have died for sure if we hadn't been there. I told him it was good to be appreciated, but that he really had Einar to thank. She was the one who jumped in. The dwarf nodded, confessing he was so scared he couldn't even move. He laughed, saying he was a 3-year veteran and never expected to freeze up like that. I knew exactly what he meant. In the game, a party like this would have crushed that golem. But here, fear almost got us all killed. It was a constant reminder that this wasn't a game. Looking over, I saw the mage had finally shaken off her trauma too. She seemed completely drained. With everyone back to their senses, it was time to get back to business. I told the dwarf we needed to renegotiate my pay. After all, we were the ones who took care of the golem. The mage glanced over, clearly annoyed. She muttered that she was aware, but that her fire spell had helped. She couldn't stand adventurers who always talked about their own wins before admitting they were helped. I knew this whole negotiation was about to fall apart. I had to be direct. I reminded her that we saved their lives and contributed more than our share. The mage agreed, but she wanted to know what I was getting at. I stood up and laid out my terms. We would be keeping the rift stone. The mage just stared at me, completely silent. The air was thick with tension. Nobody said a word. That's when the dwarf cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. He laughed and said he was fine with it. He knew he would have died for sure if it wasn't for Einar. But the mage wasn't on board. She grabbed her hat and said she couldn't accept those terms. She offered a compromise instead. We wouldn't get the rift stone for free, but she'd give us the right to bid for it. I figured a chance to get it was better than nothing. With that settled for now, the dwarf spoke up again. He reminded everyone that the undead golem had dropped its essence. He held it up, suggesting a new deal. The mage, Arua, completely lost it. She explained that the undead golem's essence was an incredibly rare item. It was so mysterious that even the Adventurers Guild didn't know all of its effects because so few had ever been found. She mumbled to herself, desperate to get her hands on it for research. I knew I had her. This was the real start of the negotiation. So I made my offer directly to Arua. I told her I'd give her the essence of the undead golem if she really wanted it. But there was a catch. She would only get it if she agreed to let me have the essence from the next boss, the Guardian, if it dropped one. I asked her what she thought of the deal. She just stood there, weighing her options. The mage, Ms. Raven, wanted to be absolutely sure. She asked Bjorn if he was really willing to trade the undead golem's essence for the one from the Guardian. She reminded him that there was no guarantee the Guardian would even drop an essence. Bjorn didn't hesitate. He told her he'd risk it. Her face completely lit up. She said there was no way she could refuse the offer. Turns out, she was far more fascinated by the undead golem's essence anyway. With that, the deal was done. The dwarf then asked Ms. Raven what she planned to do with it, pointing out that mages can't consume essences. She just chuckled and explained she she was taking it back to her lab for research. That's when she pulled out a magic vial, and the dwarf looked completely shocked. A magic vial is a really expensive item. It's designed to perfectly preserve the essence of a powerful monster, like a tier 7. The dwarf was stunned. He admitted that even he only had one of those himself. She was willing to use something that valuable on a tier 7 monster's essence. It showed just how much she wanted it. Bjorn knew this was a risk he had to take to get his hands on the Guardian's essence. With the deal settled, Ms. Raven looked at the rest of the group. It was time to move. Someone in the group couldn't wait any longer and shouted that it was time to get out of there. The dwarf laughed, agreeing completely. He added that he was really hoping the Guardian would drop its essence, putting everyone's thoughts into words. So, the group headed deeper into the ruins. The hallway was lined with creepy statues, and the whole place felt heavy. Ms. Raven stopped to look at one of the statues. She pointed out that they weren't magical at all, just plain old stone decorations. She figured that a huge palace must have been right above them once. It was a shame it had completely crumbled away. As she touched the statue's face, her finger pressed something. A quiet click echoed through the hall. Suddenly, a book dropped from a hidden spot in the ceiling, but before it could hit the floor, the stone hand of the statue moved and snatched it out of the air. Everyone just froze. Turns out, they weren't just decorations after all. The dwarf asked Ms. Raven how she knew about the hidden book. She just smiled and said that books are for passing down knowledge. I knew she was playing dumb. She could have just told him she'd read about it somewhere. I recognized the book immediately. It was the Necronomicon, a grimoire of dark magic that would sell for a fortune. My plan to come back for it later was completely ruined. I had to admit, she was smarter than she looked. It was frustrating watching her just claim the secret loot for herself. Ms. Raven announced she was keeping it since she found it. The dwarf just shrugged, saying it was fine, since they probably couldn't get it out without a special spell to protect it from the light anyway. But then she let out this really awkward laugh. That's when I knew for sure. She was lying. The Necronomicon was a normal item. It wouldn't be destroyed by light, and it didn't need any kind of special magic. But that just made me wonder, if she knew so much, how did she miss the other hidden item under the fountain? I just stared at her, and she started to get stiff. She nervously suggested that we should get moving, so we pushed deeper into the demon sanctuary, fighting our way through packs of monsters. They took down everything that stood in their way, from gargoyle statues to vicious chimera wolves, and that's when they found it. The second mid-boss of the dungeon, the Bone Knight. Ms. Raven was thrilled. She couldn't believe their luck, getting the undead golem's essence, and now facing a lust-type Bone Knight. Her excitement made me a little uneasy. I'd been having a good run myself, and it felt like she was stealing my thunder. I knew exactly what she meant. The Bone Knight is a tier 7 mid-boss that can spawn with one of 3 random properties: hatred, sorrow, or lust. The sorrow type creates a mist that causes confusion, making the fight super annoying. But the hatred type is the one you never want to see. It has an attack that can permanently lower your level. And then there was the lust type, the one standing right in front of us. Ms. Raven explained that while it could heal itself with every hit, her wound exacerbation spell would completely cancel that out. She told everyone to attack without holding back. With her spell active, we charged straight at the Bone Knight. The hits landed hard. She was right. Out of the 3 types, this was definitely the easiest one to deal with, and my luck didn't stop there. The Bone Knight dropped its essence. I couldn't believe it. First, the undead golem's essence, and now the Bone Knight's. This was just unreal. Ms. Raven congratulated us, saying we had the right to consume the dropped essences. I just thanked her. I turned to Einar and told her she should take it. She was shocked and couldn't believe what I was offering. I'd be lying if I said I didn't want it. But thinking like a gamer, it just made more sense for Einar to absorb this one. The essence's main ability, vitality absorption, works way better with a bladed weapon like her greatsword. My expertise was with a shield, so it wouldn't be as effective for me. But the biggest reason was simpler. I knew I could absolutely trust her. Einar was overjoyed. She promised she'd repay me no matter what. I knew she would. She could be stubborn, but she was loyal to the end. I tried to be patient. With this power-up, Einar would be a huge help in finding the right essence for me. But there was one problem. I'd forgotten to tell her about one of the side effects. The red glow faded. Einar wondered if it was over, her clothes suddenly feeling loose around her. At first, she didn't feel any different, but then her heart skipped a beat. Her eyes shot open. She looked up at me in shock, yelling that I'd gotten huge all of a sudden. Then she turned on the others, accusing them of changing size too, and demanding to know what they'd done. I had to break it to her. It wasn't us who changed. She was the one who got smaller. A lot smaller. The mage started explaining what happened. She said that losing height was a basic effect of the Bone Knight's essence. In exchange for getting shorter, Einar's bone density, cutting force, and agility would all be much higher. The system window showed the numbers. Her bone density and agility had shot up, but her height had dropped by 25 points. She also got 2 new skills, one that reduced poison damage, and another that let her absorb life from enemies. And the mage tried to tell her it was okay, since she hadn't lost any strength. But before she could finish, Einar screamed that she was ruined. She cried that no one would ever see her as a great warrior now. All her hard work fighting against people's doubts because she was a woman felt like it was for nothing. The mage tried a different approach, grabbing Einar and telling her she looked absolutely gorgeous now. Einar just stared back, confused. The mage kept going, saying Einar was way more attractive now. She even started wondering if she could sell this effect to rich ladies. That's when Einar understood what she meant. Einar said it out loud. She didn't look like a warrior anymore. I tried to tell her that everyone in our tribe knew she was great, but inside, I knew I had to think of something better before before she lost all hope. The dwarf just laughed, joking that if he took the essence, he'd be invisible. The mage asked if she could study the effects on Einar's body back in the city. Einar just slumped down, completely ruined, realizing they were all just thinking about themselves. I tried to get her to calm down, but she was completely devastated. Just then, a monster appeared. This was my chance. I told her to trust me and put her new abilities to the test. Everyone was on edge. I called out her name, putting all the pressure on her. She finally agreed. She said that even if she wasn't a warrior anymore, she still had a job to do. With that, she charged forward, dragging that massive sword behind her. She swung with everything she had. The others couldn't believe what they were seeing. The mage stammered that she had killed the fiend with a single strike. I made sure she understood. I yelled that this was proof she'd gotten way stronger. She looked just as surprised as everyone else. With tears in her eyes, she asked if this meant she was still the same warrior she used to be. I yelled back that she wasn't the same at all. She was a much stronger warrior now. We celebrated, but the others were already telling us it was time to get going. We finally stood before the Guardian's chamber, a massive door separating us from the final boss. The others started getting sentimental, talking about how much they'd enjoyed the dungeon run. They were all hopeful our luck would hold, and the Guardian would drop its essence. I had to agree. We had been lucky. We'd found the perfect essence for Einar and secured a bigger share of the loot. But something just felt off. In my experience, things never went this smoothly, without a huge problem waiting around the corner. I started running through the possibilities of what could ruin everything. The dwarf didn't share my worries. He grabbed the handle to open the door, but then he just froze. He stared at the door handle, which was now glowing bright red. He realized it wasn't supposed to be that color and screamed for everyone to close the door immediately. The dwarf didn't understand what was happening. Then a system message appeared for all of us to see. The Lord of the Brutal Citadel was waking from a deep slumber. The entire chamber began to shake. It was too late. The mage was in disbelief. This wasn't the death knight they had prepared for at all. A wave of dark energy washed over us from the open doorway. A voice echoed from the darkness, saying it had been a long time since it saw any living thing. The system confirmed our worst fears. The Guardian had changed. The mage stammered in terror, realizing what we were facing was a vampire. She explained that vampires were rare, only appearing on floor 6 or higher. But this was something worse. This was an elite boss, one with a name and the intelligence to match. The creature sat on a throne, looking down on us. He asked where we came from, then introduced himself. This was Cambermere, the vampire duke. My mind started racing, trying to make sense of the situation. I knew there were 4 ranks of uncommon monsters. The first were veterans, basically regular monsters with a special skill, like a goblin archer or swordsman. Next were elites. These were just flat out, stronger versions of monsters on any given floor. The death fiends Einar and I fought were a perfect example of that. Then you had the rare monsters. These only showed up under specific conditions, like an undead golem, or sometimes just randomly, like a mimic. But the last category was the worst, unique monsters. They had names, stories, and were also known as elite bosses. That's exactly what we were running from. The dwarf was screaming, completely freaking out that we were up against a vampire. The others just yelled at him to stop whining and keep moving. I knew exactly who he was. Cambermere, the vampire duke, a tier 5 elite boss who fought alone and was a master of both dark magic and close combat. The mage was in shock, saying that having an elite boss as a guardian was completely unheard of. But the guy carrying her wasn't so sure, claiming he'd seen them inside rifts on the 3rd floor before. He was wrong. Sure, you might find one in a 1st floor rift, but I had played this game more than 10,000 times. I had never, not once, seen a vampire duke in a 1st floor dungeon. Something was seriously wrong here. The thing is, I'd never actually fought this creature myself in the game. I only knew about it because I'd seen a video another player posted online. As we were running, the mage suddenly asked how I knew something was wrong. She pointed out that I'd warned them about the door before anyone even touched it. Her curiosity was getting on my nerves. We needed to focus on escaping, not asking questions that I couldn't answer honestly. I had to give her a simple answer. I just told her it was a gut feeling, and that I noticed the color of the door handle looked off. Of course, it wasn't a gut feeling at all. I remembered watching that video for hours, trying to find the trigger for this boss. The door handle was the only difference I ever found. I wondered if I would have even noticed it if I wasn't already on edge. All that good luck we'd been having made me paranoid, and that paranoia saved us. But the mage wasn't giving up. She argued that we couldn't leave without killing the Guardian anyway, so maybe we should just turn and fight. Someone yelled that we should at least get to the surface where there's sunlight. Before he could finish, a cold voice echoed from the darkness, calling us rude guests. The vampire's body dissolved into pure, dark energy. He was using a skill called Vengeful Spirit. This is why I hate magic users. They're just too unpredictable. I yelled for Arua to cast her spell and for everyone to close their eyes. Arua unleashed her spell, and a blinding flash of light filled the entire chamber. The vampire screamed. The light was so bright, I had to cover my face. When the light died down, the vampire was gone. Arua looked around, totally confused, asking what had just happened. Turns out, Vengeful Spirit lets the vampire's soul travel at high speed, and another skill lets his body teleport to it. Arua's spell didn't stop him, but it did buy us about 3 minutes of time. Someone yelled that the vampire should have reappeared back in his room. Then they screamed my name, telling me he'd gotten the mage. I turned just in time to see Arua collapse into another hunter's arms. She was completely out of it. Arua started coughing up blood. I didn't get it. Vampires don't have skills that can attack someone from the inside. Then I realized it had to be a power from another monster's essence. that the vampire had absorbed. I remembered watching a playthrough video for this fight. The player died so fast that I never got to see what other powers the vampire had. We were going in blind. I pushed those thoughts away. Getting out of here was the only thing that mattered. I told everyone we were heading for the surface, but the dwarf pointed out the obvious problem. Arua was the only one who knew the way, and she was out bold. I told him not to worry. I knew the way too. The dwarf was completely stunned and asked if I'd been to this dungeon before. I lied and said I memorized it on the way in, telling them to follow my lead. I knew this was a huge risk. Acting this smart could get me killed, but it was our only chance to survive. With that, I took off, leading them through the dark corridors. The entire route was mapped out in my head. I'd explored this dungeon hundreds of times in the game, so I knew exactly which path to take. And just like that, we were at the exit. The dwarf stared up at me, completely amazed that I'd actually memorized the way out. But just as we thought we were clear, I felt it. Something was coming up fast from behind. One of the others screamed. It was him again. The vampire was right on our heels, floating behind us in his spirit form. The dwarf yelled that we had to make it to the surface. Now. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me. We all just sprinted for our lives. Everyone was terrified. We were running on pure instinct. We burst out of the darkness and into the light. The vampire's spirit form couldn't handle the sun and just dissolved. The mage gasped that we were lucky it wasn't night yet, since vampires in that form are weak to sunlight. Once he caught his breath, the dwarf stared at me. He couldn't believe I'd actually memorized the route after only seeing it once. The dwarf was still staring at me, amazed. He couldn't believe I was just a newbie barbarian who had only started exploring the labyrinth last month. Einar jumped in, saying of course I was a great warrior. The dwarf nodded, but said he saw potential in me, and maybe I'd become one in the future. But we didn't have time to talk. The sun was already going down, and that meant we were in serious trouble. I knew we had to move. I told the dwarf to carry Arua on his back. He was shocked by the order. He tried to argue that Lady Arua needed a break. I cut him off and explained the plan. We had to get to the outer courtyard, where there were places to hide. There was no time for debate. I yelled at him to get up unless he wanted to die right here. We had to do everything possible to survive. Then I made it clear. I told him it was his job to protect the mage, even if it cost him his own life. He didn't argue anymore. He just nodded, his expression completely serious. He understood what he had to do. We finally had a moment to catch our breath. But looking at the setting sun, I knew this was my only chance to do what I needed to do. I told the others I was going to scout the area while the mage rested. The truth was, I was going back for an item I couldn't get my hands on earlier. I found the statue I was looking for. One quick hit, and I shattered it completely. And there it was, hidden right inside. The item was called Tears of a Goddess. It was a rare consumable that could be used for healing or to fight evil enemies. The system confirmed I'd acquired it. By the time I got back, the mage was already awake. She said it looked like we'd escaped the vampire for now, but she knew he'd be back as soon as the sun set. And she was right. I needed to know how much she remembered. So I asked her what she thought had attacked her. She said she wasn't sure, but she suspected it was a skill called pain sharing. That was actually a relief, since it came from a tier 8 monster's essence. I needed to know how long it would take her to recover. She figured maybe 20 minutes, but even then, she'd only be able to cast a few powerful spells. That wasn't nearly enough. I had an idea, so I asked if she knew any spells that used sunlight. She immediately got defensive, telling me how rude it was to ask a mage about their spellbook. I told her I already knew that because I'd read it in a book. Then I just looked at her and asked something. I grinned, reminding her that I was just a big, dumb barbarian. I told her I was the most uncivilized person she'd ever meet, so rules didn't apply to me. She just sat there, completely speechless and annoyed. My act was working perfectly. Finally, she gave in. With it, she told me to forget it and admitted she could use a spell called Sunspot Sphere. The system explained the spell. It was an attack similar to a fireball, but it drew its power directly from sunlight. Against a vampire, that was exactly what we needed. I asked if she could make the spell even stronger. She said she could, but it would take 10 more minutes to gather the energy, so I gave her 30. I told her to focus only on her spell, while the rest of us held our ground. She started to agree, but then she just paused, looking completely stunned. She demanded to know why I was acting like the leader. I just asked her if there was someone better for the job, because I really didn't care. She couldn't argue with that. The dwarf suddenly started laughing. He told the mage that for some reason, he found me trustworthy. He said he always trusted his gut about people, and it had never failed him. I just muttered a quick thanks. That's when a system message appeared for all of us. Night had fallen. From the darkness, we heard the vampire chuckle. He said that looking at us was making him incredibly thirsty for blood. He licked his lips and said maybe we could give him some answers. Then, in a flash, he was moving. He was coming right for us. We had to hold out. Our only chance was to buy the mage 30 minutes to cast her spell. The entire party took their positions, ready for the fight of their lives. Einar's sword blazed with fire, and the mage began to gather her power. I roared at them that we had to stand our ground, no matter what happened. The vampire let out a monstrous roar, and this dark red energy just exploded from him. The fight was on. He hovered over us, ready to strike. I immediately yelled for Tarzine to grab Arua and get her out of the fight. Tarzine didn't hesitate. He grabbed the mage and pulled her back to safety. I knew this part. It was just like the game. Even bosses that could talk just followed a script. They'd say a few lines, and then the real fight would start. And just like that, the talking was over. The vampire shot towards us like a bullet. Someone screamed a warning. He was right on top of us. He swung with everything he had, but the dwarf was ready for him. He met the attack head on and the impact was huge. The vampire just sneered, mocking the dwarf for getting angry. But he was doing more than just blocking. He was holding his ground against an insane amount of power. I knew exactly why. It had to be from an essence he'd taken, the special ability from a tier 7 monster called Iron Tusk. The skill was called Counterweight. It made him immune to being pushed back as long as he was on his feet. It was a really good essence for a tank. This was our opening. I yelled for Einar to move, telling her I'd flank the vampire from the left. The vampire turned, completely surprised by the sudden movement. She slid in low, bringing her blade around in a wide arc. He didn't have time to defend himself. Einar tightened her grip, ready to put everything into this one swing. Her flaming blade slammed right into him. The force sent him sliding back, but he was still on his feet. But then Einar's hands started to twitch. She could feel the pain from her own strike. The vampire's pain split ability was sending the damage right back at her. She couldn't believe it. Her attack hadn't even scratched him. As the party watched, he was suddenly covered in a dark shroud. Einar shouted a warning. He was shapeshifting into a whole swarm of crows. In seconds, a massive cloud of them filled the air. Then, they all dove straight for the party. Someone screamed for everyone to look out. The dwarf stepped forward, shouting that he would block the attack head on. A massive blue shield appeared around him. I recognized the skill instantly. It was emergency restoration of living armor, the second essence he'd taken. The swarm slammed into the shield. The impact was huge, and blood went everywhere. He did a great job holding them off, but the blood was a serious problem. I knew it would be bad if anyone got touched by it. Einar yelled my name, panicked. A strange mark had appeared on both her and the dwarf. They were covered in the vampire's blood. It was exactly what I was afraid of. They were now under the effect of the vampire's special ability, offering imprint. The system confirmed it. They were now marked as offerings, and the vampire would get stronger for each one of them in the area. The ability also granted the vampire immortality, letting him regenerate at an insane speed. He appeared before us, now with massive wings, looking more powerful than ever. The system explained another one of his skills, blood mastery. Every time he drank someone's blood, he actually stole a piece of their power. All of his abilities were designed to be absolutely deadly up close. The real problem was that he wasn't just a close-range fighter. Cambermere could also cast dark magic. He could turn into mist to avoid physical attacks, or shapeshift into a flock of crows that would just explode on contact. He could even summon undead creatures from the pools of blood on the ground. On top of all that, his stats were just completely overpowered. And then, he struck. The dwarf took a massive hit. Someone screamed my name, yelling that the vampire had gotten Hickarod. We were barely holding on. I yelled at Einar to keep paying attention. This fight was exactly why most people quit the game before the 6th floor. I shouted at the mage, Arua, asking how much more time she needed. She yelled back, telling us to hang on for just 5 more minutes. 5 minutes was way too long. The dwarf was out, and both Einar and I were completely exhausted. I knew I had to change the plan, right now. I yelled at Einar to grab the dwarf and fall back to safety. She paused, completely surprised, and asked if I was sure. I dropped my shield, telling her I would hold the monster off myself. I just needed her to go. She didn't hesitate. She agreed and rushed out of the fight. The vampire lunged, sneering that he didn't even need a weapon for this. But I wasn't trying to have some honorable duel. I just grabbed his arm and let the attack go straight through me. The vampire looked totally confused. I just took a drink from a bottle and told him to keep trying. From a safe distance, the others could only watch. I was completely engulfed in flames, facing the vampire all alone. The mage watched from the side, completely stunned. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She realized his entire plan was to just stand there and chug potions to stay alive. It was insane. She had never seen such a brutal, uncivilized way of fighting in her entire life. The thing is, drinking potions while you're hurt causes terrible pain. The worse the injury, the more it hurts. And he was going through them one after another. His entire body was steaming from the damage and the constant healing. Even the vampire couldn't believe it. Anyone else should have died from the shock alone. But Bjorn wasn't just standing there. He was still fighting back, even managing to block an attack. The vampire couldn't believe it. After taking so much damage, Bjorn shouldn't have been able to move, let alone block an attack. He was taking blows all over his body. The vampire was just too fast to stop every single attack. But every time the vampire aimed for a vital spot, Bjorn anticipated it perfectly and defended himself. Watching from the sidelines, the other warrior remembered something he'd read in an old history book. It said that barbarians are feared not because of their strong bodies, but because of their unbreakable will to fight. Seeing Bjorn refuse to go down, he finally understood what the author meant. He turned to the mage, Arua, saying it was getting too dangerous and they should run. She snapped back, asking if he was out of his mind. There was nowhere to go. She told him there was only one way to leave this place. They had to kill the guardian and clear the rift. The mage, Arua, knelt alone in the darkness. She was completely lost, wondering what she was even doing. She thought about Bjorn. He was just a rookie barbarian, but he was fighting bravely, all because he'd made the smartest call for the entire party. And while he was doing all that, she, the mage, was just standing by. She gripped her staff, knowing that if Bjorn went down, they were all doomed. That's when she finally made a decision. She ordered someone named Tarzine to go and take care of Mr. Murad's injuries. She then told Einar to get back into the fight against the vampire. Einar, who was helping Murad, understood immediately. Arua finally understood. A mage's job wasn't just to hide in the back and cast spells. It was to use all their knowledge to come up with the best plan for the party. She had to make the right call if they were going to survive this. She looked down at the vial in her hand. This was it. This was the best plan she could come up with. She used the item and rose into the air, ready to face the vampire head on. She began layering spells one after another. She added buffs for accuracy, range, and even a homing ability to make sure her attack wouldn't miss. Suddenly, a voice screamed out Bjorn's name. Floating high above, she launched her attack, sending glowing projectiles hurtling toward the ground. Bjorn looked up, his eyes wide. The projectiles were coming straight for him. He raised his shield, but the impact was too much. It shattered instantly. But instead of pain, there was a flash of light. A message appeared, telling him he had just consumed the essence of an undead golem. His stats began to skyrocket. His pain resistance, strength, and even his bone density all shot up at once. He could feel the power surging through his body. He was now level 2, and his overall combat power had jumped massively. The vampire Duke was starting to weaken. His head was spinning, and his vision began to blur. But even in this state, he knew he had to make a tough decision right now. He had to figure out what he was willing to sacrifice, and what he absolutely had to save. He had to force himself to stay strong and see this through. With his mind made up, the vampire lunged forward with everything he had. He knew he couldn't stop every counterattack. His plan was to risk his arms and legs, as long as he could protect his own vital areas, no matter what. But as the hit landed, something else shattered. A system message appeared, telling Bjorn he had just consumed the essence of an undead golem. The vampire's claws still found their mark, but they couldn't pierce his bones anymore. Bjorn realized he'd absorbed the golem essence against his will. The vampire looked shocked by his sudden durability. This messed up his long-term plans for his character build. It was going to be a massive headache to fix later, but in the short term, it was exactly what he needed. He wasn't just a tank who could barely stand his ground anymore. He could actually move, dodging and fighting back. It wasn't a huge change, but his chances of survival had just shot way up. Still, getting hit over and over was taking its toll. It was painful, and he was feeling every blow. Then, one of the attacks smashed a health potion he was carrying. A system message confirmed the potion was working, regenerating his health. That's when he noticed the mage. She had finally recovered. He realized that if his health could keep regenerating this fast, the entire fight was about to change. A new, brutal plan formed in his mind. With renewed hope, he stopped just defending himself and started fighting back with everything he had. He roared, embracing the full power of his barbarian state. He stopped dodging completely, letting the vampire's claws tear right into him. He didn't care about the cuts and bruises. Every hit he took was part of the plan. Turns out, every time the vampire drew blood, Bjorn's own acidic blood was burning the creature. Seeing his plan was working, he grabbed another potion from his belt, but instead of drinking it, he smashed the bottle right into the vampire's face. The vampire was burning from his acidic blood, while Bjorn's own health was regenerating thanks to the potions and the golem essence. He just had to outlast him. The vampire growled in frustration. The burns on its face were getting worse. As Bjorn continued his attack, a voice screamed his name. It was Einar, charging into the fight. She yelled that she was there to help. She moved like a flash, zipping right past the vampire to draw its attention. The plan worked perfectly. The vampire turned its head, completely caught off guard. That was the only opening Bjorn needed. He swung with everything he had. The blow smashed right into the vampire's back. The vampire spit blood, furious from the hit. It lashed out with dark energy, blasting Einar and sending her flying. Just then, a voice from the back yelled out to Bjorn. It was Hikarad. His spell, the sunspot sphere, was finally ready. Bjorn's eyes narrowed. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. But the vampire was faster. It lunged forward and grabbed Bjorn from behind, locking him in a tight hold. He gritted his teeth as the vampire squeezed with all its might. With a powerful roar, the creature threw him across the room, like he weighed nothing. But even as he was flying through the air, Bjorn saw his opening. He screamed for Hikarad to attack now. Hikarad didn't hesitate for a second. Lightning crackled around him as he unleashed the spell. Hikarad gathered his power. The system announced he was activating his lightning. Then, he released it all at once. He took a deep breath, and the energy shot forward. The vampire looked up just in time to see the attack coming straight for him. The lightning hit him hard. A system message popped up, confirming the vampire Duke was now unconscious. This was their chance. Bjorn charged forward without a second's hesitation. He pulled out a small item from his pouch. He'd been saving this trump card for the perfect moment. It was called Tears of a Goddess. He rushed toward the unconscious vampire, ready to end this fight for good. He shoved the item right into the vampire's mouth, forcing it down. He slammed his fist down, and the item exploded with blinding force. A flash of light washed over everything. The system announced that a special grace had fallen on the area. Turns out, the grace completely wiped out all of the Vampire Duke's resistances. He was now taking heavy damage. The vampire collapsed, completely paralyzed from the attack. That's when Arua screamed for Bjorn to get out of there immediately, but it was too late. Arua had already used a tier 6 offensive spell, Sunspot Sphere. She watched in horror, realizing Bjorn was going to get swept away by the spell too. A massive ball of fire came crashing down, engulfing the entire area where the vampire stood. As the spell came crashing down, Bjorn realized he was right in the blast zone. There was absolutely no time to escape. A huge explosion of fire tore through the area. A message from the system appeared, announcing that the Vampire Duke had been knocked unconscious by the blast. But before going down, the vampire used one last skill, pain sharing. The system immediately reported that Hikarad, Einar, and Tarzine were all unconscious. The entire party was down. Well, almost the entire party. Bjorn was on the ground, beaten and brutal, but his eyes were wide open. He struggled to breathe, his mind racing. He had to know if their desperate plan had actually worked, but everything was completely silent. He wondered if the vampire was finally dead, or if something else had happened. He needed to get up and check on the others. He tried to push himself off the ground, but a sudden shudder ran through his entire body. But then he saw it. The Vampire Duke was still standing, his body broken, but his energy surging. Bjorn couldn't understand how the creature was still alive after that massive attack. The system immediately gave him the answer. The vampire had a skill called immortality that let him regenerate based on how hurt he was. He also had a passive ability that kept him from dying as long as his heart was undamaged. As Bjorn watched, the vampire's torn flesh began to knit itself back together. It was an absolutely broken ability. He knew that at this rate, the monster would be back at full strength in no time. He glanced around. The rest of the party was out cold. He didn't have time to figure out why. He pushed himself up. There was one last thing he had to do. He had to kill the vampire for good before it woke up. With the last of his strength, Bjorn slammed his body into the vampire, pinning it to the ground. He collapsed on top of the creature, completely out of breath. He could see that the vampire's entire body was a wreck, but its heart was somehow still fine. He realized the monster must have used its arms to shield its vital spot from that massive spell. Furious at the cheap trick, he raised his fists, ready to smash the creature's heart himself. But then he stopped. He remembered there was another way to do this. An ability he could activate. He used it, and the vampire's body just completely burst from the inside. The power came at a price. He grunted in pain as his own body was torn apart in the process. But he knew it was the only way. The ability activated again and again, causing massive explosions. Bjorn could feel his body giving out. He knew he was reaching his limit. He knew that even if he could kill the vampire with a few more hits, the system sent a critical warning. His health had dropped below 1%. He realized he was going to die right along with the vampire. But he didn't stop. He kept attacking, tearing both of them apart. Then the system announced his health had hit 0. A final countdown had begun. But even with his life ticking away, Bjorn refused to stop. He had to finish this. The system warned him that his spirit was draining away every second. But Bjorn didn't care. He figured he was going to die either way, so there was no point in stopping now. The countdown was relentless. More and more of his life force drained away with every passing moment. With what little he had left, Bjorn poured everything into one final, brutal attack. He was completely out of breath. He looked down and saw that his hands were just gone. But that didn't stop him. He just collapsed forward, ready to use whatever he had left to finish the job. A final burst of energy erupted. Then, a message appeared. He had defeated the Vampire Duke. He looked at the fallen enemy, thinking about the insane price he'd paid. But the countdown was still ticking. He was still dying. The system gave him bonus experience for the kill, and he leveled up. But he knew it didn't matter. In this game, leveling up didn't heal you. But as he stood on the edge of death, it turns out this was all part of his plan. He was actually counting on this one possibility. And there it was. The system explained that the Guardian had a chance to drop its essence, and his gamble had paid off. A dark energy began to flow into him from the ground. A bright light flashed as he absorbed the vampire's power. The system gave him a new skill called Source of Darkness, which meant he couldn't be killed unless his heart was destroyed. His health finally started to come back. And just like that, the death countdown stopped. He even got an achievement for surviving it, which permanently boosted his spirit stat. His new status window showed he was now level 3, and his combat, Bjorn's eyes shot open. The first thing he saw was Einar, holding him and looking incredibly relieved. It seemed he had actually survived. His first thought was about the rest of the party. Einar told him they had all left 3 days ago, but she was more concerned about how he was doing. She explained that he'd been out cold for 3 whole days. The news hit him hard. Bjorn shot up, panicking. 3 days? That meant it was already the 7th day. He quickly checked his body, clenching and unclenching his fists. He was surprised. He didn't feel any pain at all, and there were no wounds on his body. It was like the fight never even happened. But then, he realized something felt off. He looked down and asked Einar the one question that suddenly mattered most. What happened to his pants? Einar explained that his pants were completely destroyed in the fight, so she just threw them away. Bjorn was silent. She tried to cheer him up, telling him there was no need to be embarrassed because he'd been a great warrior. He just grunted, clearly wishing she would stop. He quickly changed the subject. asking what had happened while he was out. Einar explained that the dwarf took a special numbered item, and the mage took the rift stone. That's when it clicked for him. The fact that he was still alive meant he must have absorbed the guardian's essence. So, the boss had dropped all 3 of its rare items. He asked her if they had rolled dice for the rift stone like they were supposed to. Einar told him they didn't, because the mage was being completely unreasonable about it. Einar recalled the moment. The mage had insisted on taking the stone to make up for her losses. The dwarf didn't seem to care, but Einar argued they should roll for it. That's when the mage said something strange. She had argued that since Bjorn already got the best item from the boss, he wouldn't object to her taking the rift stone. Bjorn understood immediately. It looked like the mage was the only one who figured out he had absorbed the essence of the vampire duke, but Bjorn wasn't mad. He remembered that the mage had used the essence of an undead golem and a ton of potions to keep him alive. He figured she had every right to take something to make up for her losses. Einar, on the other hand, was furious. She couldn't believe the mage just picked up items and left through the portal before he even woke up. She ranted about how selfish and greedy all mages were. Privately, Bjorn had to agree with her. Bjorn thanked her for having his back. Einar just laughed and tapped his arm, telling him they were companions, and that's what friends do. She asked if they could finally leave the rift. Bjorn shook his head. He told her there was still one more thing they had to do before they left. He figured the mage probably took most of the items in the area, but he was pretty sure she had no idea about one particular thing he was after. He was determined to get it. Then he paused and awkwardly asked Einar if she had anything he could use to cover himself up. A message from the system appeared, announcing they had entered the crystal cave. Another message followed right after, stating that the first floor of the labyrinth was now closed. The system then announced they were being transported to Rafdonia. Back in the crowded city, Bjorn felt a sense of relief. After everything he'd been through, he couldn't wait to see how much money he'd made. Back in the city, the clerk at the exchange counter held up a bag of money. She told him the total came out to 231,520 stones. Bjorn looked at the bag. He thought it was a pretty small reward for all the trouble he'd gone through, but since he'd gotten 2 essences, he decided it would have to do. But just as he reached for it, the clerk suddenly snatched the bag away. She glared at him, her tone completely different. She told him that was way too much money for a tier 9 adventurer to make in one trip. Then she demanded to know what he was carrying in his backpack. Bjorn was completely thrown off. He couldn't understand why she was asking questions she'd never asked before. That's when she ordered him not to move a muscle. In an instant, armored guards appeared out of nowhere, surrounding him with their spears pointed right at him. He was stunned, demanding to know what the hell was going on. The clerk calmly told him he'd get his chance to talk in the interrogation chamber. Meanwhile, in the busy city square, Erwin stood among the crowd of adventurers. Erwin let out a long of relief. The 3rd floor of the labyrinth had been much tougher than she'd expected. She thought back to the monsters they'd faced. The tier 7s were bad enough, but they'd even stumbled upon a tier 8. Still, it was a great adventure, and she couldn't wait to tell Bjorn everything. She got in line with the other adventurers, looking around for him. She started to worry that he might have already left, but then she remembered the new essence she'd gotten. A smile crept onto her face as she imagined showing it to him. She winced, remembering how painful his last test had been, but even that couldn't kill her excitement. She knew he was going to be amazed. She stood in the busy exchange hall, waiting for her turn at the counter. When it was her turn, the clerk looked at her earnings with suspicion. She said it was an unusually high amount for a tier 9 adventurer. Erwin calmly explained she'd been traveling with her sister. The clerk asked for the sister's name while flipping through a large record book. Erwin gave the name, Daria Wittenberg di Tercia. The clerk bought her story. Since her supposed sister was a well-known adventurer, the large sum of money made sense. With that, Erwin was free to go. She headed back through the city, feeling great about how things turned out. After changing her clothes, she figured Bjorn must be back by now. She decided to use the money she'd earned to treat him to a big dinner. She couldn't stop smiling, wondering what kind of crazy adventure he'd been on this time. But when she asked about him, the person at the desk had bad news. The barbarian from room 302 hadn't come back yet. Her good mood vanished instantly. She tried to tell herself not to panic. She took a breath, forcing herself to believe he was just running late. He had to be back soon. A week passed. Still no sign of Bjorn. Erwin was heading to Bjorn's room when she saw a man dragging his things out into the hall. She immediately confronted him, demanding to know why he was taking Bjorn's belongings without his permission. The man explained they'd already waited a whole week just for her. The labyrinth had closed, and Bjorn still hadn't returned. He asked her what she thought that meant. Erwin couldn't find the words to argue. She was shaking. He told her to just give it up. Bjorn was probably dead. His words hit her hard. She wandered out into the rain, completely lost, and finally collapsed. She was so out of it, she didn't even notice someone walking up to her until they called her name. Erwin flinched, looking up. The woman told Erwin she knew what had happened, but she said it was time to get up, asking how long she planned on just sitting there in despair. Something inside Erwin changed. She looked up at her sister, her eyes burning with a new fire. She said she was done being weak. She wanted to get stronger so she could protect the people she truly cared about. Turns out, while Erwin was worried sick, Bjorn was in a completely different kind of trouble. He'd been locked in a cell for a whole week, accused of being a plunderer. During his first interrogation, they questioned him about a crossbow. The interrogator pointed out that barbarians don't use ranged weapons. Bjorn told them the truth. He took it from the party that tried to kill him, which was just self-defense. The interrogator claimed they couldn't be sure who struck first until the investigation was over. But Bjorn knew something was off. The Adventurers Guild was acting weird, and he suspected this wasn't really really about the crossbow at all. He explained that the guild had changed its rules. They were now doing intense investigations on low-tier adventurers to stop plundering. Bjorn saw right through it. Being a low-tier adventurer was like being at the bottom of a caste system. He knew they were targeting people like him, adventurers with no connections, but valuable items. The interrogator leaned in, demanding the truth one more time. He wanted to know exactly where Bjorn got the crossbow. Bjorn didn't change his story. He repeated that he took it from the party that attacked him, a group of 4 plunderers who had ambushed him in the labyrinth. But he left out one detail, the red-headed woman from that group. He knew that if he mentioned anything about a vow he made, they could accuse him of being possessed by an evil spirit, and that was a death sentence. The interrogator didn't believe Bjorn could have survived getting his throat slit. He demanded to see the scar. Bjorn reached up to his neck, ready to show him, but when he touched the spot, there was nothing there. The scar was completely gone. He realized the vampire essence must have healed it, and that was a huge problem. So Bjorn had no choice but to tell him the truth about what happened in the rift. The interrogator just laughed in his face, saying he'd have to come up with a better lie than that. Bjorn was getting desperate. He yelled at the man to summon a mage and cast a memory reading spell on him if he didn't believe it. But the interrogator just scoffed. He explained that a tier 9 adventurer had no right to make that kind of request from the guild. Bjorn asked if he could pay for it himself. The man laughed, asking why he'd waste money when they were just going to take all his stuff anyway. Still, he said he'd consider asking a mage, and that's how Bjorn's first day in prison ended. 2 days passed. They finally brought in a mage to read his mind, but the spell didn't work. Turns out, Bjorn's magic resistance was so high that even a tier 8 mage couldn't get through his defenses. The interrogator was making excuses. He said it was a waste of time to bring in senior guild members for such a small case. Bjorn had told him about Asura and the dwarf, but the man hadn't even bothered to listen. He leaned in, trying to pressure Bjorn into just giving up and confessing. He wasn't looking for the truth. He was just trying to force an answer. This went on until the 7th interrogation. The man suddenly slammed the table, shouting that they had finally found damning evidence against Bjorn. Bjorn recognized it instantly. It was the message stone from his fight against the Crystal Union. The interrogator explained that they traced the stone's ID number to a dead adventurer and secured testimonies that blamed Bjorn for the crime. The verdict was in. He was going to be executed in just 3 hours. He knew this couldn't be solved peacefully anymore, but breaking out by force would just turn him into an escaped plunderer, which wouldn't help him prove his innocence. He realized there was only one way out of this. He had to prove he was innocent, no matter what it took. He gripped the bars of his cell. His mind was made up. He was going to survive. He activated a skill called Flesh Burst. A blinding flash of light filled his cell. The cell door exploded outwards in a shower of metal and stone. Bjorn stepped out of the smoke and dust. A guard on the floor stared up at him, completely terrified. The guard scrambled backward, unable to believe what he was seeing. The guard tried to scream for help, but Bjorn stomped down hard, silencing him instantly. With the guard taken care of, he took a moment to look at his handiwork. The skill had torn his hand apart, but he didn't care. He was getting out of there. He was done waiting. The prison break had officially begun. He reached down and took the keys from the guard he'd just dealt with. The other prisoners started screaming and cheering from their cells. They were calling him a hero and begging him to let them out too. He knew some of them were probably guilty, but a barbarian wouldn't care about that, would he? He figured it was better to just let them all out. The cell doors swung open and the prisoners flooded out. They were screaming about freedom, ready to tear the place apart. They were calling him their liberator. Meanwhile, at the Adventurers Guild, everything was calm. Suddenly, the main doors slammed open. The guards at the entrance had no idea what was happening. A mob of escaped prisoners stormed into the lobby, screaming that there was a prison break. A guild official panicked and yelled for help, offering a huge reward to any adventurer who would take down the escaped prisoners. The adventurers in the hall didn't need to be told twice. They let out a war cry and charged straight into the fight. While the brawl exploded in the main hall, Bjorn was already moving. He knew the prisoners couldn't last long. They were unarmed and disorganized. He figured he had 5 minutes at most. He had to make every second count. He sprinted up the stairs. His goal wasn't just to get out of the building, but at the top of the landing, a line of guards was waiting. They spotted him and yelled that they couldn't let him pass. Bjorn didn't hesitate. He raised his hand and unleashed a skill called Flesh Burst. A wave of red energy exploded forward, and the guards were completely overwhelmed by the force. One of the survivors screamed in agony. Whatever that power was, it felt like acid burning right through his skin. Suddenly, a new skill activated, offering Imprint. The system explained that his physical power would get a huge boost based on the number of people around him. Red energy started swirling around his body. Bjorn could feel the power surging through him. It was an incredible rush. He didn't waste a second. He lunged straight for one of the guild members, a woman named Yahello. His punch landed with brutal force, slamming her right into the ground. She looked up, absolutely furious, but she was too late to do anything about it. That's when another attacker, a knight in full armor, slashed Bjorn across the back, but the knight could only stare in disbelief. The deep wound on Bjorn's back was healing right before his eyes. The knight was still trying to figure out how he was healing so fast. Before he could even finish his thought, Bjorn grabbed him by the head and smashed him into the ground. He could feel it. His entire body was overflowing with energy. He taunted the other guards, asking how they liked a barbarian with enhanced physicality. Then he moved like a blur, taking them all down before they could even react. The remaining guards backed away in fear. They couldn't understand how a Tier 9 adventurer could be this strong. They had no idea what to do. That's when it clicked for Bjorn. This branch office only held low-tier adventurers. These guards were completely defenseless against him. He didn't give them a chance to regroup. He just tore right through them. With the guards taken care of, he walked up the stairs until he reached the 3rd floor. He stopped in front of a big door. This was the branch manager's office. He threw open the door to the manager's office. It was an ambush. A blade slashed right across his chest, sending blood flying. The attacker grinned, thinking he'd landed a fatal blow. But then his skin started to sizzle. The man screamed as Bjorn's blood burned him like acid. Bjorn just stood over him, asking if he was surprised. From the back of the room, someone screamed. A young woman was hiding behind a desk, completely frozen. The attacker, who was the branch manager, stumbled to his feet and demanded to know who Bjorn was. The manager desperately warned Bjorn not to touch her, yelling that she was the daughter of the guild's district chief. This changed everything. Bjorn realized he'd just hit the jackpot. The manager tried to threaten him again, but Bjorn wasn't listening. He cut him off with a single punch. Bjorn stood over the unconscious manager. He realized his original plan was completely useless now. He had to come up with something new. The district chief's daughter started screaming at him, accusing him of setting this all up. Bjorn knew her presence could either make things much easier for him or completely ruin everything. She kept yelling, so he just grabbed her face to shut her up. He couldn't stand how full of herself she was. Holding her tight, he turned to the guards in the hall. He told them to immediately summon 3 people: the investigator who questioned him, the leader of the Crystal Union, and a mage from the tower. Then he made the threat crystal clear: bring them or the woman dies. The guards froze in terror. With his demands made, Bjorn dragged the woman out onto a balcony, right where everyone in the city could see them. He took a deep breath, getting ready to shout. Then he roared her name for the whole city to hear. He stood on the balcony and roared at the top of his lungs. He was done running. It was time to fight back. He screamed his name for everyone to hear: Bjorn Yandel. Down below, the crowd started to murmur. They recognized him as the prisoner who had escaped. He told them he was a Tier 9 adventurer who had been framed for murder by the Adventurers Guild. He swore in the name of his god that he was innocent. He screamed that the guild was trying to execute him for a crime he never committed and that he had done nothing wrong. This was his plan all along. By making a huge public scene, he knew the guild couldn't just sweep this under the rug anymore. Far away, at the mage's tower, someone wondered why the Adventurers Guild would need their help. An elder mage explained that the branch manager had personally requested their assistance. Apparently, the guild was dealing with a pretty big problem. A young woman looked up from her work, repeating the words. She seemed curious about what kind of trouble was brewing. The elder mage explained the situation. Someone had released all the prisoners, taken the district chief's daughter hostage, and was now demanding to see a mage from the tower. The young woman couldn't believe what she was hearing, but the news just made her more curious. She smiled, deciding she had to see this bold criminal for herself. And this was the scene she was walking into. Bjorn Yandel, holding the terrified daughter of the district chief. When the mage arrived, she was completely stunned. She couldn't believe the person causing all this chaos was Bjorn Yandel. She demanded to know what in the world he was thinking. She called him an idiot, asking if he had a death wish. But Bjorn cut her off. He told her to skip the questions and cast a memory reading spell on him to speed things up. He told her to hurry, saying he didn't have all day. She thought for a moment, then agreed, but she had one condition. He had to promise to return the favor later. Bjorn said that was fine, as long as it was something he could actually do. With the deal made, she stepped forward to begin the spell. The mage placed her hand on Bjorn's forehead and began to cast the spell. A blue light crackled around them as she focused her power. But something was wrong. The spell wasn't working. She asked if he was wearing anything with magic resistance, but Bjorn just gestured to his own body, asking if he looked like he was. Before she could try again, a man's voice shouted from down the hall. 2 men stumbled into the office. One of them, a man in a red uniform, looked completely exhausted. The other, an official in a white coat, rushed to his side to see if he was all right. The official explained that most of the prisoners downstairs had been dealt with. He wondered aloud what could have happened up here. That's when his eyes locked onto something across the room. He stared right at Bjorn, his face filled with shock and anger. He pointed a finger at Bjorn, yelling that he was the one who released all the prisoners. But the man in the red uniform just told him he already knew. The official was stunned, asking why they hadn't done anything yet. The man in red sighed. He explained that the Barbarian was claiming he'd been framed for murder. Then he looked at the official and asked if he was the one who investigated the case. The man in the red uniform pressed him for an answer. He demanded to know what evidence was used to determine Bjorn was a plunderer. The official started to sweat, unable to respond. The official waved his hand dismissively, yelling that Bjorn's claim of being framed was complete nonsense. He started laying out his case. First, he said Bjorn had reported a huge amount of mana stones, far more than any Tier 9 adventurer should have. Because that seemed suspicious, they searched his backpack. Inside, they found a ton of items that were obviously stolen. The final nail in the coffin was a message stone. They traced it back to its owner, who belonged to the Crystal Union. That guild gave a testimony, claiming Bjorn had killed one of their members and stolen everything from the body. But the man in the red uniform wasn't impressed. He pointed out that a testimony from the same group was biased. Without magical verification, it had no legal power. He turned to the official and demanded to know why he hadn't done it. The official shouted back that it was because Bjorn kept lying during the interrogation. He explained that the barbarian told a ridiculous story about surviving a slit throat by consuming the essence of a vampire inside a rift. He couldn't believe it himself. The essence of a vampire? On the first floor, he asked the man in red if he could see just how crazy the story was. He argued that Bjorn obviously made up the story because he was born with a natural resistance to magic. Why would he waste a mage's precious time to disprove a claim that was so clearly false? The official was grinning, thinking he had won. But then the mage in the red hat spoke up. She calmly stated that Bjorn really did consume the essence of the vampire on the first floor. The official stammered, completely caught off guard by her claim. She told him she was there and saw it happen with her own eyes. She then pointed out what a shame it was that he couldn't order a memory reading spell on her. The man in the red uniform couldn't believe it. He asked her if she understood how ridiculous her story sounded. The official suggested that she was only covering for Bjorn because she knew him personally. That's when the mage's expression turned cold. She asked him if he was actually accusing her of making the story up. She became furious. She yelled at the official, asking how he dared to point fingers at a mage. She reminded him that his authority to investigate low-tier adventurers didn't make him her equal. The official immediately dropped to the floor and bowed. He apologized over and over, insisting that's not what he meant at all. Turns out, mages from the tower hold a very high status in this world. They form a single, powerful union and have protected their rights as elite magic users for a long time. The branch manager stepped in. He agreed that the investigator had dug his own grave by questioning a mage from the tower and asked her not to be too harsh. He tried to explain the investigator's side of things, saying the story was so crazy that it was understandable why someone wouldn't believe it without seeing it themselves. The mage seemed to consider this for a moment. She admitted that a vampire appearing on the first floor was definitely something that had never happened before. The manager started to thank her for understanding, but she cut him off with a shout. She pointed right at him, yelling that his attitude was completely wrong for someone in his position as the branch manager. The manager froze, sweating under her intense glare. She reminded him that ever since the labyrinth appeared, it's always been full of unimaginable mysteries. Even veteran adventurers never know what to expect. She got right in his face and demanded to know if he was really sure that a vampire's appearance was impossible. The manager just groaned, unable to answer. Bjorn watched her tear into the branch manager. He was starting to understand just how much power mages from the tower really had. Just then, someone else walked into the room. The man looked down at the scene and demanded to know who the barbarian causing all the trouble was. He introduced himself as Niall Urbans. Flanked by 2 guards, he asked Bjorn if he understood the gravity of what he'd just done. Before Bjorn could answer, the girl he was holding screamed. She called the man father. In that instant, everything clicked for Bjorn. If that man was her father, then he wasn't just some guild official. He was the district chief.